not yet scientific. What is a mode of production? With his discovery, Marx opened up the continent of history to scientific knowledge. He laid the groundwork for a theory constituting the foundation of all the sciences that bear on objects belonging to the continent of history, not just what is known as history, sociology, human geography, economics and demographics, but also psychology, social psychology, psychosociology and, generally, the disciplines known as social sciences, and, still more generally, all the human sciences. The fact that these social and human sciences do not acknowledge that Marx's theory is the foundation for their true existence as sciences, the fact that they persist in upholding ideological notions which make them semi-sciences, pseudo-sciences or mere techniques of social adaptation is due to the dominant influence of bourgeois ideology, which prevents them from recognizing Marx as the founder of their true theory. But let us say no more about that. What matters for present purposes is the fact that Marx, with his discovery, provided us with scientific concepts capable, for the first time, of making intelligible what human societies, and the histories of that is, of making the structure, persistence, development, stagnation and decline of societies intelligible, along with the transformations whose sites they are. This does not mean that nothing important was ever said about the nature of human societies, before Marx, by, for example, philosophers, Spinoza, Hobbes, Montesquieu, Rousseau and others. Historians, feudal or bourgeois, who discovered the reality of the class struggle, or economists such as Smith and Ricardo hail the efforts of Marx's predecessors, however, their most positive aspects included, were dominated by ideological notions and depended in every instance on an, explicit or implicit, idealist philosophy of history, not on a true scientific theory of history. Human societies. Let us note straight away that Marx very early, beginning in 1847 with his polemic against Proudhon, the poverty of philosophy, rejected the notion of society as non-scientific. This term is in fact fraught with moral, religious and legal overtones. In short, it is an ideological notion that must be replaced by a scientific concept, the concept of social formation. Marx, Lenin. It is not simply a matter of substituting one word for another. The concept of social formation is scientific insofar as it belongs to a theoretical system of concepts that has nothing whatsoever to do with the system of ideological notions to which the idealist notion of society must be referred. We cannot now elaborate on this system of concepts, in which the concept of mode of production plays the central role. Let us simply say, so as to be understood by one and all, that social formation designates every concrete society that has historical existence and is individualized, so that it is distinct from other societies contemporaneous with it, and is also distinct from its own past, by virtue of the mode of production dominant in it. Thus we can speak of so-called primitive social formations, 1. The Roman slave-holding social formation, the French social formation based on serfdom, known as feudal, the French capitalist social formation, such and such a socialist social formation, in transition towards socialism, and so on. Marx showed, precisely, that in order to understand how a given social formation functions and what occurs in it, including the revolutionary transformations that shifted from one mode of production to another, we have to bring the central concept of mode of production into play. For classical theses I here recall 4 classical theses in order to show how the central concept of mode of production comes into play. In Marxist theory 1, every concrete social formation is based on dominant mode of production. The immediate implication is that, in every social formation, there exists more than one mode of production, at least 2 and often many more. One of the modes of production in this set is described as dominant, the others as dominated. The dominated modes are those surviving from the old social formations past or the one that may be emerging in its present. The plurality of modes of production in every social formation and the current dominance of one mode of production over those that are disappearing or coming into being make it possible to account for the contradictory complexity of the empirical facts observable in every concrete social formation, but also for the contradictory tendencies that clash within it and find expression as its history, the observable real transformations in the economy, politics and ideology. 2. What constitutes a mode of production? It is the unity between what Marx calls the productive forces and the relations of production. Thus every mode of production, dominant or dominated, has, in its unity, its productive forces and relations of production. How should we conceive of this unity? Marx speaks of the correspondence between the productive forces and relations of production. Correspondence, however, is just a descriptive term. The theory of the very special nature of the unity between the productive forces and the relations of production of a determinate mode of production has yet to be constructed. This first theory commands the theory of an altogether different problem, too often confused with the first, the theory of another unity quite different, because necessarily contradictory between the dominant and dominated mode or modes of production in a given social formation. For example, when we say that the relations of production no longer correspond to the productive forces and that this contradiction is the driving force behind every social revolution, it is no longer a question or no longer just a question of non-correspondence between the productive forces and relations of production of one given mode of production. In the great majority of cases, doubtless, it is also a question of the contradiction, in the social formation under consideration, between the productive forces of the whole set of modes of production in that social formation, on the one hand, and, on the other, the relations of production of the mode of production currently dominant. This distinction is crucial. If we fail to make it, we will talk wildly and inaccurately about correspondence and non-correspondence, confusing 2 very different types of unity. First, the unity, internal to a mode of production, between its productive forces and relations of production, and, second, the, always contradictory, unity between the dominated modes of production and the dominant mode of production. 3. When we consider a mode of production in the unity productive forces relations of production that constitutes it. It appears that this unity has a material basis, the productive forces. But these productive forces are nothing at all if they are not rendered operational, and they can only operate in and under the aegis of their relations of production. This leads to the conclusion that, on the basis of the existing productive forces and within the limits they set, the relations of production play the determinant role. The whole of Capital and all of Lenin's and Mao's work comprise a commentary on this thesis. Marxists have not always acknowledged this. On this decisive thesis, the reader may consult A Index 1.4, this last thesis, which bears on the determinant element in the unity between productive forces/relations of production, and thus in the economic base or infrastructure, should not be conflated with another classic thesis, which affirms that in another very complex unity, that which unites the superstructure, law, state, ideologies, with the base, the unity of the productive forces and the relations of production. The economic infrastructure is determinant in the last instance. The thesis that L just presented, thesis 3, must therefore itself be placed under the present thesis. Thesis 3 can accordingly be stated as follows: in the base, which, in the last instance, determines everything that happens in the superstructure in the base, that is, in the unity productive forces/relations of production. The relations of production are determinant, on the basis of the existing productive forces and within the material limits they set. We have to be very careful here. We need only compare these four theses with each other to see that we are virtually identifying the mode of production with the unity between productive forces relations of production, which is to say that we are classing the mode of production with the base simply in order to evoke an issue that is the subject of still unsettled theoretical debates. We shall say that we are provisionally leaving aside the question as to whether we should ultimately define a mode of production in the narrow sense, as we are doing here, namely, by bringing only its productive forces and relations of production into play, or whether we should, rather, affirm that every mode of production necessarily induces or includes its own superstructure. For some time, we favored the latter hypothesis provisionally. We now prefer to maintain the narrow sense of the concept mode of production unity of the productive forces and the relations of production peculiar to a given mode of production, while affirming, again provisionally, that the question of the superstructure pertains, rather, to the nature of the concrete social formation, in which at least two modes of production are combined under the dominance of one of them. In the present state of our knowledge, it seems to us preferable to retain the present hypothesis, while reserving the right to modify it, should that prove necessary. 11. The productive forces. In what follows, we shall consider what happens in a single mode of production. A mode of production is, as its name indicates, a way or manner, a mode, of producing. Of producing what? The material goods indispensable to the material existence of the men, women and children living in a given social formation. A way of producing is a way of tackling nature, since it is from nature and nature alone that all social formations, which do not live on thin air or the word of God, extract the material goods necessary for their subsistence, food, clothing, shelter, and so on, that is, for their stagnation or development. A way of tackling nature in order to wrest from it the goods required for subsistence, hunting, gathering, fishing, extraction of minerals, and so on, or make it produce them. Agriculture, animal husbandry, is not a state of mind, a behavioral style, or a mood. It is a set of labor processes that together form a system constituting the production process of a particular mode of production. A labor process is a series of systematically regulated operations performed by the agents of that labor process, who work on an object of labor, raw material, unprocessed material, domesticated animals, land, and so on, using, to that end, instruments of labor, more or less sophisticated tools, and then machines, and so on, in such a way as to transform the object of labor into, on the one hand, products capable of satisfying immediate human needs, food, clothing, shelter, and so on, and, on the other hand, instruments of labor for the purpose of ensuring that this labor process can continue to be carried out in future. In every labor process, the agents of that process must be qualified, that is, capable of properly using the instruments of labor in accordance with specific technical rules. Hence they must have technical experience of a kind that is rigorously defined by, because required by, the existing instruments of labor. If they did not have such experience, the instruments of labor would be improperly used or not used at all. Every generation of individuals always finds the existing instruments of labor to hand. It can improve them or not. In any case, the limits on these improvements, or innovations, depend on the state of existing instruments, those that the generation in question has inherited, not invented itself. The technical level of the agents of a labor process is thus always determined by the nature of the instruments of labor and, more generally, see below, by the existing means of production. Hence the following important Marxist thesis: in the productive forces, in which people figure as agents of the labor process, it is not these people but, rather, the means of production which are the determining element. Marx was always categorical on this point. Only for the last 200 years has it been possible to observe, as a consequence of the capitalist mode of production, a constant revolution in the means of production, a consequence of the development of technology, linked, in its turn, to the development of the natural sciences. For millennia, however, modifications of the means of production were either virtually non-existent or all but imperceptible. The constant modernization of technology specific to the capitalist mode of production, including the spectacular developments that we have been witnessing for the past 30 years, above all, atomic energy and electronics, do not alter Marx's thesis by a Throughout the labor process, its agents either work in a non-cooperative mode, isolated fishermen or hunters, small independent producers, or cooperate. The introduction of cooperation and, above all, its different forms also depends, in the final analysis, on the state of the existing means of production. People can fish all alone, angling with hook and line or using a small net. When, however, they possess long-range trawlers and huge nets, the kind of fishing they practice mandates a specific form of cooperation. The existing dominant relations of production and the politics that correspond to them can either impose or allow forms of cooperation which, with the same productive forces, make possible results that the previous relations of production and politics ruled out. For instance, cooperation based on colonial forced labor, on big plantations owned by whites, or for road building and other construction projects, made it possible to achieve using the same instruments of production as in the past, or other almost equally rudimentary instruments, results that had previously been beyond the reach of the colonized social formations. For instance, the very large-scale cooperation practiced in China after the revolution in order to build gigantic earthen dams, especially in the people's communes, to cite just this one example, made it possible, without in any way altering the existing instruments of production, small baskets carried on shoulder poles, hoes and shovels, to achieve results that were impossible and unimaginable in the older forms of familial cooperation, individual peasants, or cooperation based on a single village. Let us also simply note the following: every productive process in a mode of production involves several different labor processes, which must therefore be carefully combined in such a way that the manpower needed to perform the various tasks, seasonal or not, suffices to accomplish the whole of the labor process called for by that one mode of production. By itself, this requirement necessarily implies a division of labor, even if it takes only rudimentary forms. To take an extremely simple example, we can observe, in the surviving primitive African social formations, divisions of labor between different labor processes. The men hunt and build the huts, in regulated forms of cooperation, while the women, for their part, tend the vegetable garden or raise the small barnyard animals, pound the grain, and so on. We can also observe crossover phenomena. The same men switch from one labor process to the other, depending on the season. This simple example provides some idea of the extreme complexity that reigns even in a primitive social formation's productive process. As one can readily imagine, the process of production becomes infinitely more complex in our highly industrialized modern societies. Let us leave it at that and go back to our basic concept. Our contention is that the productive forces of a mode of production are constituted by the unity of a complex, regulated interplay of factors that brings on stage, the object of labor, nature, in various forms, including the natural energy, that must always, under all circumstances, be either harnessed, even if what is involved is simply wind or a flowing stream, or exploited, gravity. But, above all, raw material, whether passive, minerals, or active, animals, land. The instruments of production. The agents of production, or labor power, Marx uses the term means of production for the set encompassing the object of labor plus instruments of labor, or production. Marx uses the term labor power for the set encompassing the various ways in which activity, either physical or of some other kind, is expended by the set of agents of the labor process, that is, individuals who have the technical skills needed to utilize the existing means of production. In the required cooperative or non-cooperative forms, if we recapitulate these terms, we arrive at the famous equation: productive forces, unity, means of production plus labor power. All this holds for a single mode of production. This equation has the theoretical advantage of highlighting the set means of production. That is, it distinguishes this set from the set labor power. This distinction is essential to understanding what happens in every class society, for example, in a capitalist social formation, in which the means of production are held, not by those who dispose of labor power, but by individuals outside the labor process, capitalist exploiters. Before going further, let me bring a theoretical problem with far-reaching implications to my readers' attention, including those of my readers who may have illuminating suggestions as to how to resolve it. It will have been understood that it is, to begin with, crucial to distinguish the productive forces specific to one particular mode of production from the whole set of productive forces in a concrete social formation, in which several modes of production coexist under the dominance of one of them. The set of the latter forces of production is the set of the productive forces of the different modes of production coexisting in a social formation under the dominance of one of them. In this case, the plural productive forces seems to be justified by the plurality of the modes of production, although the set of these productive forces obviously cannot be a simple aggregate, a simple sum, but has to possess, even in its contradictions, a kind of unity, the unity conferred on it by the dominance of the mode of production that dominates the others. This is in itself a problem for which we do not yet have a real theory. The principal difficulty, however, has to do with the plural of the productive forces belonging to one given mode of production. We have, in a word, described the productive forces and presented their unity in the form of a list and a sum, object of labor plus instruments of 10 production plus labor power. Hegel long ago warned us that a sum is just a sum, that is, to be very rigorous, it is the absence of a concept, if not, as Spinoza put it in another context, the sanctuary of ignorance. To be less rigorous, let us say that a sum is the index of a provisional lacuna that clearly has to be filled, for we clearly sense that the productive forces put into operation in the various labor processes in the productive process of a single mode of production are not just added up or added up any which way. Addition is the record of an observation that counts things up. We have to set out from it, of course, but we cannot remain at that level. We suspect that what we are describing in the form of a sum is not a random aggregation, but a specific combination that has, for each mode of production, a specific unity which, precisely, founds the material possibility of this combination or conjunction. We come to terms with it empirically by breaking it down into the form of elements that we then add up. Among the important theoretical questions requiring clarification, then, we must include the question of the type of unity which, for each mode of production, organizes its productive forces in specific forms. However this last difficulty is resolved, we have, by bringing the concept of productive forces into play, begun to form a clearer picture of one of the two elements of the mode of production. In question here, after all, are facts that anyone who keeps his eyes open and is reasonably methodical can, if not discover, then at least recognize. It is not on the subject of the forces of production that we can decently pick a quarrel with Marx. The vast majority of experts, the economists will agree, but will further observe that all that goes without saying. They will even add, we have understood what a mode of production is, productive forces set in motion in certain labor processes by agents with special skills. From the foregoing, a good many experts will conclude, 1. That Marx invented nothing new, since all this is blindingly obvious, without suspecting that it has only been blindingly obvious since Marx. And, above all, 2. That we have to do, in all this, with nothing more than technology pure and simple, material technology, tools, machines, technical training of the workforce, and technical organization of the labor process. The experts will feel reassured, and their spontaneous tendency, which is technicist or technocratic, will be reinforced. Since they find themselves, unfortunately, in certain Marxists' company in this matter, everything will, for them, be for the best in the best of all bourgeois worlds. In fact, we must squarely rebut them. The productive forces do not suffice to account for a mode of production, since they are just one of its elements. The other is represented by the relations of production. Marx effectively shows in Capital, as does Lenin throughout his work, that the mobilization of the productive forces, means of production plus labor power, is incomprehensible unless we understand that it takes place under the aegis of definite relations of production, which play the determinant role in the unity. Productive forces. Relations of production. 111. The relations of production. What are the relations of production? They are relations of a very special kind between, in classless societies, the agents of production, when all the members of a social formation are agents of production, or between, in class societies, the agents of production on the one hand and, on the other, personages who are not agents of production. Although they intervene in production, these personages hold equivalent the means of production and appropriate a share of the products of the labor of the agents of production without providing anything in return. They appropriate a share of surplus labor. Thus they may, so to speak, be found at both ends of the productive process, since they own and appropriately the means of production before the process of production and, after it, appropriate its product, conceding only a share of it to the agents of production so that the latter may live and reproduce. They keep the remainder, in the capitalist regime, surplus value, for themselves of course. They do not consume the whole of this remainder at celebrations or spend it on other personal whims. They must consecrate a share of this remainder, that is, of surplus labor, to renewing the means of production in the requisite proportions, because means of production are gradually depleted, a mine, or wear out, tools, machines. 12. If those who hold the means of production do not take care to renew them, they will end up, one fine day, no longer holding them at all and be unable to avoid falling to the level of individuals of the sort who have nothing to sell but the strength of their two hands, when they do not sell their bodies. 1. Can find, in Balzac or Zola, stories of rich heirs who fritter away the family fortune and end up as wage workers in what was once their own factory, or in the gutter. Thus we can, at the point we have now reached, define the relations of production in class societies as relations of the one-sided distribution of the means of production between those holding them and those without them. We can add that this distribution of the means of production determines the distribution of the goods produced here. However, we have to be very careful. We may be tempted to think, granted, there are people who hold the means of production and others without them. It is all a question of property, so what? What does that change as far as the labor process, for example steel making, is concerned and, generally speaking, as far as the mobilization of the productive forces is concerned? We have been told that the personages who hold the means of production and who appropriate surplus labor are, so to speak, at both ends of the process. Before and after, but then the process of production remains what it is, mobilization of the productive forces, full stop. Our economists will once again conclude, process of production, the reign of technology relegating all that business about the ownership of this or that to the level of secondary considerations. Yes, precisely, we said that these individuals are, so to speak, at both ends of the process of production. If we take things at the level of pure appearances, our economists, there are even Marxists among them, are right. Who holds or does not hold the means of production is simply a matter of legal clauses, a question of property. I'm the one, says the capitalist, who owns the means of production, and the legal consequence, have a look at the civil code, is that I also own its products. I'm free to concede a share of them to my workers in the form of wages, something that is, moreover, quite normal in exchange for their labor. But we said, so to speak, that was a way of suggesting that all this is not true. We can now show why capitalist relations of production are relations of capitalist exploitation. To demonstrate this, we shall, from now on, restrict our analysis to what goes on in the capitalist mode of production, to be very precise, in a social formation, such as the contemporary French social formation, dominated by the capitalist mode of production. The fact that the capitalist mode of production is dominant in this social formation means that there still exist elements of one or more earlier modes of production in France, which is to say, in the case to hand, sectors in which decomposition products of the feudal mode of production, the mode of production 13 based On serfdom, still endure big landed estates, to begin with, the basis for ground rent, followed by the small independent producers, urban or rural craftsmen, referred to as small family farmers, and so on. However, the capitalist mode of production dominates these archaic forms, not just by virtue of the transformation of natural ground rent into capitalist ground rent, but also by virtue of the capitalist market's nearly total domination of the surviving small independent producers. As for buy-sellers, or producers, cooperatives, the last named are extremely rare. They are incontestably part of the capitalist mode of production, constituting a direct anticipation of the socialist mode of production only in the fancy of handful of opportunists or superannuated utopian thinkers. The fact that France 1969 is a social formation dominated by the capitalist mode of production means that production of socially useful goods or use values, marketed in the form of commodities or exchange values, thus the real, effective production of objects of real social utility, takes place under the aegis of capitalist relations of production. But these capitalist relations of production are simultaneously relations of capitalist exploitation. And we shall see in a moment that it is necessary to go further still here. We must beware. The point is not to conflate everything and, as soon as it has been understood that capitalist production is simultaneously capitalist exploitation, to whisk production off stage and consider only exploitation. One of the effects of the capitalist mode of production, among others, is effectively to produce objects of social utility that are 114 consumed either individually, collectively bread, sugar, apartments, automobiles, radios, airplanes and also weapons, or productively as means of production. Every mode of production in every social formation, whether or not there are social classes in that social formation, has, among other effects, this basic material effect. In this regard, and depending on the existing today, international level of Soviet, or Chinese wheat is well and 15-1 technology, truly wheat, identical to capitalist wheat, and an automobile, Soviet or Chinese, is well and truly an automobile, identical to a capitalist automobile, simply because social and political categories, such as socialist or capitalist, do not apply to objects of social utility or even to means of production. To be sure, those wishing to efface all distinctions between social regimes invoke the international, because physical, nature of products of social utility, of the overwhelming majority of such products, and technology in order to justify their theories of industrial societies, or other such drivel. We can even do them the favor of giving them, for free and to all appearances, an additional argument, by saying that all identical labor processes or even all labor processes in general, no matter what the mode of production or regime under which they are carried out, mobilize the invariable elements of a labor process, object of labor, instrument of labor, labor power. Here the imaginations of our utopian thinkers, apologists for neo-capitalism and reformists start churning and promise us the moon, either the disappearance of classes or communism, just as soon as automation becomes universal, because automation will put an end, to all intents and purposes, to nearly every intervention by labor power and, consequently, to the exploitation of labor power. Let us be serious. While the capitalist mode of production does indeed produce objects of social utility, it produces them only under the aegis of very specific relations of production. We have briefly seen which ones, in a very provisional way, that simultaneously make them relations of exploitation. The same thing holds for all class societies, but these relations of exploitation take a specific form in capitalist social formations. Let us now see in what respect capitalist relations of production are relations of capitalist exploitation in principle. This finds very concrete expression in the following way: the means of production, the unprocessed material processed in a factory, the factory buildings, the instruments of production, machines, in them, and so on, are the sole property of a capitalist proprietor, or corporation. That makes no difference here. It likewise makes no difference whether the capitalist proprietor directs the process of production himself, as his orchestra as conductor, Marx, or delegates this task to a factory director. In contrast, labor power, in each of its atomistic subdivisions, belongs to a large number of individuals who possess no means of production, but only their personal labor power, with different degrees of qualification. These individuals sell their use of their labor power for a set length of time to the owner of the means of production. In exchange for wages, they are hired by the day, the week, or, in certain cases, the month. Wage workers always advance their use of their labor power, as Marx shows, inasmuch as they are paid at the end of the day, week or month. Among these wage workers, there are different categories of personnel: common laborers and unskilled workers at the lowest level, then skilled workers, technicians of various levels, supervisors of various kinds, production engineers and various managers. There are also office 16 workers, typists, accountants, and so on. As everyone knows, real production cannot take place unless the means of production, which do not work all by themselves, are set into relation with, and set to work by, labor power, that is, waged workers. But this act of bringing wage workers into relation with means of production belonging not to them, but to the capitalist owner of those means of production, the act thanks to which material production can proceed, takes place, precisely, in a capitalist regime, and only within relations of control of the means of production in the one case and, in the other, non-control of the same means of production. Those who have no means of production at their disposal have nothing but their individual labor power. These relations automatically convert capitalist relations of production into relations of exploitation. We have already seen where this exploitation resides. This is Marx's great discovery, in the value that the capitalist concedes to the free workers in exchange for the purchase of their use of their labor power. The capitalist concedes to his wage workers, contractually, only their wages, that is, only part of the value produced by their labor. by law, all the products remain in the capitalist hands. Their value represents 1. The value of the commodities that are used up in the process of production carried out by the workers, such as raw material, wear and tear on machines, and so on. And 2. A surplus product that is itself divided up, unequally, into two portions, the wage conceded to the workers and the surplus value extorted from them, which is pocketed by the capitalist without further ado, and everyone is happy, says the capitalist, because he has risked his capital. Because he surely must pocket a profit that rewards him for the risk he has run, and because the workers' labor has been paid for at its value. The trouble with this line of reasoning, which Marx took to pieces, is that 1. No category, legal or of any other kind, can register the necessity of giving the person who is lucky enough to hold capital a profit in exchange for the risk he has run, which, moreover, he generally does not run at all. And 2. The value conceded to the individual worker in the form of a wage by no means represents the value of his labor, but only the value required to reproduce his individual labor power, a value that has nothing to do with the value of labor, an expression that, properly speaking, 17 is devoid of all theoretical meaning. This is why the capitalist relations of production that ensure the real production of use values, or products of social utility, simultaneously ensure, inexorably, capitalist ideologues of neo-capitalism and neo-anarchists are sweeping exploitation under the carpet, the former by way of defense of the notion that the capitalist economy no longer exists, that we have a service economy, the latter by declaring that the essence of exploitation is repression. We need to recall this truth that Marx brought to light. Everything that happens in a capitalist social formation, including the forms of state repression that accompany it, we shall see which forms and why, is rooted in the material base of capitalist relations of production, which are relations of capitalist exploitation, and in a system of production in which production is itself subordinated to exploitation and thus to the production of capital on an extended scale. Before we come to these notorious forms of state repression, however, we must examine more closely, even if only by adducing a few limited examples, the manner in which this primacy of the relations of capitalist exploitation is expressed and exercised in the forms of capitalist production itself, its technical forms included. For the social division of labor is the reality behind the technical division of labor, production, exploitation and the class struggle in production. The thesis that we shall be defending is a perfectly classical thesis. We find the basis for it everywhere in Marx's Capital, Lenin's work, and the work of their intellectual heirs. It runs as follows: 1. The relations of production radically determine all the seemingly technical relations of the division and organization of labor. 2. By virtue of what we have said so far, since the relations of production are relations of capitalist exploitation, the relations of capitalist exploitation radically determine, not in general and indistinctly, but in specific forms, all the apparently technical relations that come into play in material production itself. In other words, the relations of exploitation are not just expressed in terms of the extortion of surplus value, which is consecrated by wages and all the effects of the market economy. Exploitation has its primary effect in wages, but it has other specific effects in the practice of production itself. In the guise of the division of labor, to bring out the existence of some of these effects, we introduced the concept of the social division of 19 labor some time ago, in a sense different from the one in which Marx uses the term, opposing the social to the technical division of labor. Marx employs the expression social division of labor, in capital, to designate what we propose to call the division of social labor, that is, the division of social production into different branches, agriculture and industry, to begin with, but also different branches of industry. Because the term is convenient and seems to us to be very apt, we propose to retain the terminological innovation that we introduced then. Thus we shall use the term social division of labor to designate the effect that the relations of production, qua relations of exploitation, have at the heart of the production process itself. Our adversary is, here too, the same as before, namely, the technocratic technicist ideology that we may describe as economistic. As we have already seen, every mode of production mobilizes a combination of labor processes which require that certain defined operations be carried out by qualified agents in a strictly defined order and in strictly defined forms. For each labor process, this entails a technical division into defined posts of various kinds, as well as organization of the labor process and thus management of the organization resulting from the defined division of labor. This holds for every labor process. It holds a fortiori when a process of production subsumes, as it always does, a large number of labor processes. From all this, our stalwart economists promptly draw the very simple conclusion that only purely technical phenomena occur in the production process, a purely technical division of labor, a purely technical organization of labor, and a purely technical management of labor. Invoking the requirements of production itself, they will argue that division, organization and management of labor are surely needed to ensure production. That there must therefore be manual workers, and intellectual workers, and thus workers and diversely qualified technicians on the one hand, and, on the other, the whole hierarchy of managers, administrators, engineers, upper-level technicians, supervisors, and so on. These are all blindingly self-evident truths. Did Marx himself not acknowledge the fact? There has to be someone to supervise each department on the shop floor, and the whole orchestra needs a conductor to organize the division of labor and lead the resulting organization, to which our worthy economists add that all one has to do is to humanize relations in the enterprise between supervisors, engineers and managers on the one hand and workers on the other. This provides workaday proof of the fact that economistic ideology and humanist ideology are two faces of one and the same ideology. We need only read Louis Armand or François Bloch Lane. But all Marx's work is a commentary on the fact, and all the workers' practical experience their grinding, pitiless daily experience of the real relations that dominate and regulate the technical division and organization of labor is proof of the fact that these self-evident truths, about the division, organization and purely technical management of labor are pure and simple illusions or, worse, pure and simple impostures, milked for all they are worth in the capitalist class struggle against the workers, class struggle for the purpose of maintaining workers in the condition of the exploited. 20 It is indeed in production itself that the implacable class struggle between exploiters and exploited is rooted, for it is present there at every moment. The primary argument of the capitalist class struggle consists, at this level, in the ideological imposture about the purely technical division, organization and management of labor. Squarely taking our stand, with Marx, against this mystification, we affirm that all the forms in which the putatively technical functions of the division of labor are carried out are direct or indirect effects of the dominant relations of production, in our country, capitalist relations of production. Consequently, we maintain that every technical division of labor is in fact a social division of labor. As Marxists, we must take the view that all arguments to the effect that the currently existing forms of the division of labor are purely technical, and all such presentations of them should be rejected and denounced as pure and simple arguments of the capitalist class struggle. I will restrict myself to developing 3 points to prove it. 1. Every process of production entails the existence of several labor processes and thus of a set number of posts for qualified labor, including the posts required to organize, coordinate and manage that process of production. In the final analysis, the state of development of the means of production, first and foremost the technological unity object of labor/21 instruments of labor, commands the way these posts are defined in our capitalist class society. These posts are filled on the basis of an implacable, insuperable class division: posts requiring manual labor, of the kind performed by workers, as well as certain posts for technicians and low-level supervisors, foremen and, at the limit, the heads of the various departments on the shop floor, are held for life by members of the working class. The other posts, involving somewhat more elevated organizational tasks and, higher up, planning and partial management of the labor process, are monopolized by members of other social strata, engineers and technicians, as well as middle-level and upper-level supervisory personnel. Finally, the most important posts are held by the capitalists themselves or their direct representatives. The division into social classes is thus present in the division, organization and management of the process of production, by virtue of the distribution of posts on the basis of the class affiliation of the individuals who hold them, and, correspondingly, the number of years they have spent in school, getting an education, whether truncated or complete. The fact that a majority of these individuals, engineers, upper-level supervisory personnel, even directors, are 22 increasingly simple wage earners makes no difference here. There are class differences among those who work for wages, for source of revenue does not determine 23 class affiliation. That this division into classes has inexorable effects on the division of labor is strikingly revealed by the circumstance that only a rare handful of workers ever succeed in climbing up a few rungs and, thanks to grueling efforts, acquiring somewhat better qualifications. As for the worker who becomes an engineer or even a manager, he is, in our society, a museum piece exhibited to encourage belief in the possibility of the impossible and the idea that there are no social classes or that someone born a worker can rise above his class. Plain, unvarnished reality cries out against these disgraceful exhibitions. The immense majority of workers are workers for life. The opposite is still more indubitably true. An engineer or upper-level supervisor never falls to the level of a worker, except in the case, an exceedingly rare limit case, and even that is understated, of disastrous economic crises. A pitiless line of class demarcation unmistakably separates two categories of human beings. The technical division of labor is quite simply a mask hiding the fact that some people are permanently penned in the situation of the working class while others can have either high-level posts that are immediately attributed to them, or fairly or, very, 124 broadly open-ended careers too. This line of demarcation exactly coincides with another, the one that justifies the first. Some people, engineers, upper-level supervisors and technicians, factory directors and all their assistants, hold a monopoly on certain contents and forms of knowledge, and thus on a form of know-how, while others, common laborers, unskilled and skilled workers, are penned in other contents and forms of know-how. The monopoly of the managers, engineers and upper-level supervisors and technicians has its counterpart in what is in practice a prohibition for the great majority of workers, exhausted by the production rate. The myth about all imaginable evening courses, notwithstanding, this prohibition prevents them from breaking out of the contents and forms of knowledge in which exploitation pens them. This segregation, internal to all productive processes, throws the social nature of every putatively technical division of labor into sharp relief. It is not always to the advantage of the supposedly knowledgeable engineers and other upper-level technicians, who are ignorant of very many things that the workers learn in their practice or through personal effort. This does not go unnoticed by the workers, who often resolve problems that baffle certain engineers. The workers judge them accordingly, a circumstance which, combined with the experience of being penned in one's position, contributes to class consciousness and the working class struggle. As far as the great mass of its effects goes, however, the official monopoly on certain kinds of knowledge and the practical prohibition that keeps workers from acquiring such knowledge maintain the omnipotence of the social division of the relations of production in the relations of a supposedly purely technical division of labor. They do so by virtue of the authority that monopoly and prohibition exercise over the relations of production. There is never organization, management and division of labor without hierarchical relations of authority. But authority is always on the same side, it is always the same people who wield it and the same who are subjected to it, for all intents and purposes their whole lives long. 3. The proof is that no organization of the labor process in any factory can ever do without sanctions enforcing this class domination, without a form of repression in no way beholden to policemen, since it is exercised in the division of labor itself and by its agents. Nothing, unless a factory has an ultra-modern staff trained in the pseudo-scientific techniques of human resources social psychology, and perhaps not even then, can eliminate the need for functions of surveillance and repression, which may or may not be performed by the same agents who are responsible for the organization of labor, supervisors, engineers, and so on. Fines, demotions, the attribution or withholding of bonuses, and dismissals of workers, daily lot. An unspoken class struggle plays itself out at this level. In limit cases, it involves hiring procedures accompanied by more or less political checks, if not police-like inquiries, as well as constant surveillance of trade union representatives and activists, and even dismissals, illegal dismissals included. In fact, many employers would rather be fined by a labor court they lump the fines in with overheads than tolerate the presence of an undesirable element, whose activity, they rightly fear, may end up costing them more than a court condemnation. Most labor inspectors, as everyone knows, have no power to stop abuses. When they do not collude with those who commit them, internal repression is brought to bear on wage workers by wage workers taking their orders from the management of an enterprise, which is always a class management implementing a policy of exploitation or super-exploitation. This completes the practical demonstration that the purely technical division of labor is just a facade for a very different kind of division, the social division of labor, which is an effect of the division between classes. It is no accident that the workers call engineers, very aptly, little bosses. The fact that a certain evolution is underway among some engineers makes no real difference as far as the overall problem is concerned. That is why the class distinction between manual labor and intellectual labor, to which Marx refers from the German ideology on, is indeed a reality. 25. Despite the crude, crass nature of the formula, it is produced by all class societies. It is still produced, and increasingly produced, by modern capitalist class society, despite the spectacular progress of science and technology, and the growing numbers of intellectual workers, in new categories, such as researchers, whom we shall discuss when the time comes. That is why Marx was on the mark when he said that socialism should abolish the distinction between manual and intellectual labor. That is why Lenin's desperate insistence on the need to establish a new polytechnic school education. It unfortunately had small success, which would, moreover, combine manual labor in real production 26 with intellectual labor, was, and is, so important. That is why it seems to us that the news reaching us through what we can gather about certain experiments of the Cultural Revolution, mandatory training periods in basic production units for intellectuals of all orders, controlled shake-ups in the distribution of different manual and intellectual jobs among the producers, a real upgrading of jobs involving only implementation to posts of great authority and responsibility, has something to do with the class struggle against the radical determination, in our country, of the technical division of labor, by the social division of labor. There is no further need, in my view, to demonstrate that it is a question of class struggle in all this, and that this class struggle is directly rooted in the effects of the relations of production in the process of production itself. Recapitulating the results of our analysis, we may say the following. 1. Capitalist relations of production are relations of capitalist exploitation. This exploitation is accomplished by way of an extortion of surplus value consecrated by the limits of the wage relation. Wages are paid in exchange for work performed in productive enterprises too. Within this production, the relations of production find expression in effects which, overlapping with and reinforcing the effects of class and class struggle, culminate in the following overriding result: the irreducible dominance exercised by the social division of labor over the purely technical, pseudo-division of labor. That social division of labor, an effect of the distribution of individuals in classes, culminates in double, joint line of demarcation, in the enterprise itself, between a monopoly on certain jobs, associated with certain kinds of knowledge reserved for one part of the personnel, and the penning of another part of the personnel, the workers, in subaltern jobs. Plus a prohibition on knowing. 3. We can, then, put all of an enterprise's employees in three major categories. A. The category of those who perform only functions of production. It includes all the workers, common laborers, unskilled laborers, skilled laborers, and, sometimes, a handful of technicians. These are the proletarians, in the strict sense. B. The category of those who perform functions of exploitation that are always simultaneously functions of production, engineers, upper-level technicians, production managers, and so on. C. The category of those who perform functions of repression that may be combined with function of exploitation, supervisors, from foremen to certain engineers. Demonstration that the purely technical division of labor is just a facade for a very different kind of division, the social division of labor, which is an effect of the division between classes. It is no accident that the workers call engineers, very aptly, little bosses. The fact that a certain evolution is underway among some engineers makes no real difference as far as the overall problem is concerned. That is why the class distinction between manual labor and intellectual labor, to which Marx refers from the German ideology on, is indeed a reality. 25. Despite the crude, crass nature of the formula, it is produced by all class societies. It is still produced, and increasingly produced, by modern capitalist class society, despite the spectacular progress of science and technology, and the growing numbers of intellectual workers, in new categories, such as researchers, whom we shall discuss when the time comes. That is why Marx was on the mark when he said that socialism should abolish the distinction between manual and intellectual labor. That is why Lenin's desperate insistence on the need to establish a new polytechnic school education. It unfortunately had small success, which would, moreover, combine manual labor in real production 26 with intellectual labor, was, and is, so important. That is why it seems to us that the news reaching us through what we can gather about certain experiments of the Cultural Revolution, mandatory training periods in basic production units for intellectuals of all orders, controlled shake-ups in the distribution of different manual and intellectual jobs among the producers, a real upgrading of jobs involving only implementation to posts of great authority and responsibility, has something to do with the class struggle against the radical determination, in our country, of the technical division of labor, by the social division of labor. There is no further need, in my view, to demonstrate that it is a question of class struggle in all this, and that this class struggle is directly rooted in the effects of the relations of production in the process of production itself. Recapitulating the results of our analysis, we may say the following. 1. Capitalist relations of production are relations of capitalist exploitation. This exploitation is accomplished by way of an extortion of surplus value consecrated by the limits of the wage relation. Wages are paid in exchange for work performed in productive enterprises too. Within this production, the relations of production find expression in effects which, overlapping with and reinforcing the effects of class and class struggle, culminate in the following overriding result: the irreducible dominance exercised by the social division of labor over the purely technical, pseudo-division of labor. That social division of labor, an effect of the distribution of individuals in classes, culminates in double, joint line of demarcation, in the enterprise itself, between a monopoly on certain jobs, associated with certain kinds of knowledge reserved for one part of the personnel, and the penning of another part of the personnel, the workers, in subaltern jobs. Plus a prohibition on knowing. 3. We can, then, put all of an enterprise's employees in three major categories. A. The category of those who perform only functions of production. It includes all the workers, common laborers, unskilled laborers, skilled laborers and, sometimes, a handful of technicians. These are the proletarians, in the strict sense. B. The category of those who perform functions of exploitation that are always simultaneously functions of production, engineers, upper-level technicians, production managers, and so on. C. The category of those who perform functions of repression that may be combined with function of exploitation, supervisors, from foremen to certain engineers, or may not be, the goons expressly recruited in a number of factories to serve as informers and execute, among other tasks, all the police maneuvers of the gutter-level anti-union struggle. All these employees are waged and must therefore be counted, on one ground or another, among the exploited. There are, however, major disparities in their wages and working conditions. Workers are subjected to exhausting work rhythms, while engineers work under completely different conditions, to say nothing of the basic distinction between functions of pure production on the one hand and the highly varied combination of functions of exploitation, production and repression on the other. When all this is taken into account, it will be agreed that the forms of class struggle, unconscious and conscious, that obtain within the process of production alone are complex in the extreme. 4. It must in any case be understood that the sole basis and purpose of all the elements, including the three functions just analyzed, is exploitation of wage workers, especially those who are the most exploited, always more harshly exploited, pure agents of production or proletarians. It must be understood that the whole system of monopoly and penning in, and all the differences in function, including the repressive function, just one of the system's internal elements, converge to the sole end of accomplishing this exploitation or super-exploitation. It is an anarchist mistake to claim that production runs on repression. To do so is to foreground just one of the component elements of the process of production, exploitation, and the subordinate one at that, repression. How does production exploitation work? First and foremost, it works because proletarians and other wage workers must, just to survive, take jobs in the production that exploits them, since none of the means of production are in their hands. That is why they show up all by themselves, at the personnel office, and, after they have been given work, set out all by themselves, to take their jobs on the day shift or night shift. That is the absolutely determinant cause, but not the only one. Production exploitation also works thanks to the currently existing dispositive of the means of production, the assembly line, chain that pulls the workers in and inexorably forces them to adapt to its pace. As Marx long ago compellingly pointed out, workers have ceased to be working hands, and have become mere automatic extensions of their machines. Production exploitation also works thanks to the bourgeois ideology of work. The workers are the first to be subjected to its effects, because it is an ideology of the capitalist class struggle. This ideology that 127 makes the workers go comprises the following basic elements, which are so many illusions and impostures, yet are successful, as long as the workers' class struggle does not combat them. 1. The bourgeois legal illusion according to which labor is paid for at its value. 2. The corresponding legal moral ideology which has it that one must respect one's labor contract, and, through it, the enterprise's house rules and regulations. 3. The technicist economistic ideology which has it that there must, after all, be different jobs within the division of labor, and such individuals to fill them. This ideology does a great deal more to make workers go than repression does. Production exploitation works, finally, with the help of certain repressive measures, some spontaneous, others very carefully thought out, by the bosses on the front line, goons plus house unions, consider Simca and Citron. It will readily be understood that, under these conditions, the workers' class struggle in production does not unfold all by itself. It is rooted in, and takes shape in, exceedingly harsh day-to-day realities of exploitation, of the experience of exploitation. In the experience of the class line between manual and non-manual workers, a line that is not blurred by one or another technicians' or engineers' liberal or even progressive behavior, often just a mask for paternalism. And in the experience of the actual behavior of supervisors, engineers and agents of repression. This class struggle, however, runs squarely up against the powerful weapons of the capitalist class struggle, which are the more redoubtable in that they do not always resemble weapons. Above all, after control of the means of production and extortion of surplus value, the illusions and impostures of the bourgeois ideology of work just discussed. Trade union activists waging the class struggle are well aware of this. They have to fight this ideology step by step, taking up the same combat day after day to root this mystification out of their own consciousness, no easy task, and their comrades. Struggle against exploitation, wages, production rates, unemployment, struggle against the impostures of the bourgeois ideology of work, struggle against repression. Such are the three always interlinked forms of the economic class struggle in production. If this is right, then we can understand 1. Why the class struggle is basically conducted in the forms of the division of labor and the working conditions prevailing in enterprises, and why the political class struggle is rooted in the economic class struggle. 2. Why the economic class struggle is a struggle against incessantly intensified exploitation, not only against the brutal material form of exploitation, capitalism's tendency to reduce wages, and against the class techniques for increasing productivity, speed up, and so on, but also around the question of the technical social division of labor that prevails in enterprises, and against bourgeois ideology and repression. The working class's class consciousness is built up thanks not only to its experience of its material exploitation, wages, production rates, but also to its experience of the forms in which it is penned in the division of labor. It can be built up only in an ongoing ideological struggle against the bourgeois ideology of work. It will be understood, then, why the capitalist class and its ideologues have so powerful an interest in presenting the technical social division of labor, which is, in the final analysis, a class division of labor, as a purely technical division. It will be understood why overt struggle against this mystification and imposture of the capitalist class struggle can acquire such importance for the proletariat's revolutionary class struggle. Economism, in whatever form it appears, including that of self-evident truths about technology and technicity, is the primary danger threatening the very foundations of working class consciousness. At the point where capitalist exploitation is carried out in production, it will further be understood why those who have an interest in disguising the class relations of the social division of labor as the neutral relations of a supposedly technical division of labor, denounced by Marxist theory in its entirety, also have so deep an interest in treating capitalist relations of production as mere property relations, mere legal relations. We are beginning to understand that, between a technicist economistic interpretation of the division of labor and legalistic conception of the relations of production, one and the same unity obtains, the unity of the bourgeois ideology of the capitalist class struggle. We shall see in a moment the practical consequences that this can have for the workers' movement itself. The conclusion: the relations of production must not be mistaken for purely technical relations or legal relations. If what we have just said is on the mark, it is clear that the relations of production no longer have anything to do with mere property titles, legal titles, and, consequently, legal relations are merely a form that sanctions a real content altogether different from that form, namely, the relations of production and their effects. We have just seen at how deep a level the relations of production and class relations and, therefore, the class struggle deriving from them, operate in the real relations prevailing in the production process itself. The description with which we began our exposition for the sake of convenience is clearly untenable. The relations of production do not come into play, in the form of property titles, before and after the process of production, simply in order to justify and lend legal sanction to control of the means of production and its products, and, thus, extortion of surplus value. The relations of production are not a legal umbrella under the protection of which a perfectly and purely technical productive process is realized. Hence a two-fold ideological confusion that must be avoided at all costs. 1. The technical confusion. As we have seen, the relations of production are not purely technical relations, but, rather, relations of capitalist exploitation, inscribed as such in the concrete life of production as a whole. 2. The legal confusion. The relations of production are not legal relations. They are something quite different. They affirm class relations in production itself. If that is right, we begin to glimpse what is covered by the scientific Marxist concept of the mode of production. We have defined it as a way of tackling nature. We have seen that tackling here means mobilizing productive forces under the aegis of relations of production. In class societies, these relations of production are relations of exploitation. The mode of production of a class society, of a social formation divided into classes, is quite the opposite of a mere technical process of production. At the same time as it is the locus of production, it is the locus of class exploitation and of class struggle as well. It is in the productive process of the mode of production itself that the knot of class relations and the class struggle bound up with exploitation is tied. This class struggle pits the proletarian class struggle against the capitalist class struggle. It is an economic class struggle, but also, from the outset and simultaneously, an ideological class struggle, and thus a class struggle that has, consciously or not, political import. Every other form of class struggle is rooted in this basic class struggle, including the political class struggle properly speaking, in which all forms of class struggle are tied together in a knot of critical importance. It is easy to understand the capitalists' interest in depicting the process of production as the opposite of what it is, as a purely technical rather than an exploitative process. It is also easy to understand their interest in depicting the relations of production as something quite different from what they are, as legal relations, not relations included in class relations and the class struggle. It is also easy to understand that the destiny of every class struggle, the victorious revolutionary class struggle included, ultimately depends on an accurate conception of the relations of production. To build socialism, it will be necessary to establish new relations of production that abolish, concretely, the exploitative effects of the previous relations of production, together with all their class effects. The construction of socialism can therefore not be settled with purely legal formulas, ownership of the means of production plus better technical organization of the labor process. At the limit, these are formulas which, if they are not seriously criticized and corrected, and very soon at that, may end up trapped in the economistic technicist legal humanist bourgeois ideology of work. Every misunderstanding of these formulas and their inexorable logic does an objective disservice to the revolutionary cause and the construction of socialism. 1. See Emmanuel Terray, Marxism and Primitive Societies. 2. Studies, trans. Mary Klopper, New York, Monthly Review Press, 1972. Analyzing the late 19th century Russian social formation, Lenin distinguished four modes of production. 3. See the famous preface to Karl Marx's 1859 A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, trans. S. W. Ryazornskaya, in Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Collected Works, London, Lawrence and Ashart, 1975-2002, Volume 29, pp 261-51.4. An inkling of these debates may be found in Poulantzas and Terray 5 for an analysis of the labor process. See Karl Marx, Capital, Vol. 1, trans. Samuel Moore and Edward Aveling, in Marx and Engels, Collected Works, Volume 35, pp 187-95.6. In this connection, one is quite simply stupefied to read, in a recent official work by Soviet Marxist theorists, Fundamental Principles of Historical Materialism, the following phrase, which revises the classical thesis, TN. The phrase is missing from Althusser's manuscript. Marx points out time and again that one of the essential characteristics of the capitalist mode of production, one distinguishing it from previous productive modes, is that it incessantly revolutionizes the existing means of production. Thus what is occurring today comes under a classical Marxian thesis. 8.1. Note the incontestable topicality of this thesis of Marx's, at a time when the conjunction between the vogue of the Marxist humanist interpretation, on the one hand, and, on the other, the unbridled technocratic lyricism that the impetuous development of the sciences and technology inspires in certain Marxists, leads them to formulate theses tending to affirm man's primacy over the means of production. These theses are converted into hazy formulas about, say, the increasingly determinant role, in production, of intellectuals as elements of the collective worker, or the revisionist thesis that science has become a direct productive force. We shall return at our leisure to these seemingly theoretical questions. 9. Livestock and the land have a double status. They are objects of labor, livestock must be raised and land must be cultivated, but, at the same time, machines of a sort, since they themselves work on an object of labor, with which they are provided, pasturage or animal fodder and, in the case of the land, seed. This twofold character of livestock and land is of decisive importance when it comes to understanding the very special nature of agricultural labor, as well as the role played by the concept of the differential fertility of land in the theory of ground rent. 10. We find this sum in the form of a list in Joseph V. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism, New York, International Publishers, 1970. 11. In Reading Capital, Etienne Balibar has undertaken this investigation for the transition from manufacturing to big industry. I would like to point out to those who have read or will read Balibar's discussion that what he has given us, albeit in keeping with the spirit of Capital, is not in Capital, it is an original, fruitful contribution. This is worth noting, in order to distinguish those who make the risky attempt to discover something from those who content themselves with repeating things they owe to others so as not to have to think for themselves. 12. Machines wear out not only materially but also historically. They are made obsolete by new, improved machines, the results of technological progress. 13. Let us recall one effect of this survival, equals the class of big landowners, that has nothing to do with the capitalist mode of production. It is well known that Lenin defended the thesis, which is imaginary, but interesting from a theoretical standpoint, that, in a purely capitalist, social formation, one without residues of the feudal mode of production, the land could or even should nationalized, that is, the property of the state, which would rent it to capitalist farmer entrepreneurs, and charge a purely capitalist rent, that is, a differential rent shorn of absolute rent. 14. Be it recalled that capital contains neither a theory of the basic unit of production nor a theory of the basic unit of consumption. We need to elaborate both theories. 15. Technology has not always been international. It became international with the constitution of the global market, or universal history, which really only dates from the period in which the capitalist mode of production came into existence. 16. Leave aside two questions that are today on the agenda, and for good reason, that of the difference between productive and non-productive workers and that of the collective worker. Ink is being spilled on the latter concept in the same proportions as it is fueling hopes. Let me point out that the concept of the collective worker, if it is to be brought into play from the opposite theoretical standpoint, has to be paired off with an unprecedented concept that I submit to the reflection of collective theoreticist tendency that marked some of the arguments in that essay. 20. The fact that engineers, even young engineers, who are stuffed with a heavy dose of it as a whole, and thus an effect that can in certain cases be literally undecipherable, long as the foundations of capitalist exploitation remain in place. 27. The reproduction of the conditions of production. We have not yet finished with the mode of production. We must now bring out something that we glimpsed in the course of our analysis when we discussed the necessity of renewing the means of production to make production possible. That was a passing hint. We shall now consider the matter in full. As Marx said, even a child knows that if a social formation did not reproduce the conditions of production while producing, it would not last a year. Thus the ultimate condition for production is the reproduction of the conditions of production. It can be simple, only just reproducing the conditions of previous production, or on an extended scale, expanding them. We shall leave this crucial distinction aside in Volume 1 and return to it in Volume what, then, is the reproduction of the conditions of production? The reader should be warned that we are here entering a domain that is both very familiar and singularly misunderstood. The tenaciously self-evident truths, the empiricist kind of ideological self-evident truths, of the point of view of production alone, or even of simple productive practice, which is itself abstract with respect to the process of production, are so much a part of our everyday consciousness that it is extremely difficult, not to say practically impossible, to rise to the standpoint of reproduction. Yet, outside this standpoint, everything remains abstract, not just one-sided, but distorted, that holds even at the level of production and, a fortiori, at the level of simple practice. Let us try to examine matters methodically and clear RLY to simplify our discussion, and bearing in mind that every social formation is characterized by a dominant mode of production, we may say that the process of production puts the existing productive forces to work under determinate relations of production. It follows that, in order to exist, every social formation must, while it produces, and in order to be able to produce, reproduce the conditions of its production. It must therefore reproduce 1. The productive forces. 2. The existing relations of production. Reproduction of the means of production. Everyone now admits, including both the bourgeois economists who work in national accounting and modern macroeconomic theorists, because Marx compellingly proved it in Capital Volume 2, that no production is possible unless it ensures reproduction of the material conditions of production in strictly regulated proportions, reproduction of the means of production. The average economist is, in this respect, no different from the average capitalist. He will tell you that, every year, it is necessary to make provisions to replace what is used up or wears out in production, raw materials, fixed facilities, buildings, instruments of production, machines, and so on. We say the average economist, the average capitalist, because both express the viewpoint of the enterprise. They content themselves with simply commenting on the terms of its financial accounting practice. We know, however, thanks to the genius of Quesnay, the first person to pose this problem that was staring everyone in the face, and the genius of Marx, who solved it, that the reproduction of the material conditions of production cannot be thought of at the level of the enterprise, because it does not exist in its real conditions at that level. What happens at the level of the enterprise is an effect that only gives some idea of the necessity of reproduction, but does not at all enable us to think its mechanisms. A moment's reflection will convince us of this. Mr. X, a capitalist who produces woolens in his mill, has to reproduce his raw material, machines, and so on. However, he does not produce them for his own production. Other capitalists do. Mr. Y, a big Australian sheep breeder, Mr. Z, a big machine tool manufacturer, and so on. They too, in order to produce these products necessary for the reproduction of Mr. X's conditions of production, have to reproduce the conditions of their own production, and so on to infinity. And everything has to happen in proportions such that, on the national and even world market, the demand for means of production, for reproduction, is satisfied by the supply. To envisage this mechanism, which entails a sort of endless spiral, we have to take Marx's global approach. That is, we have to study the relations of the circulation of capital between Department L, production of means of production, and Department 11, production of means of consumption, as well as the realization of surplus value, in Capital Volumes 2 and 3. We shall not go into an analysis of this question here. It is enough to have evoked the necessity of reproducing the material conditions of production. 11. Reproduction of labor power. Yet something will surely have struck the reader. We have discussed the reproduction of the means of production, but not that of the productive forces. Thus we have ignored the reproduction of that which distinguishes the productive forces from the means of production, the reproduction of labor power. Observing what goes on in the enterprise, especially the financial accounting practice of anticipating investment and depreciation, gave us a rough idea of the existence of the material process of reproduction. Now, however, we are entering a domain in which observing what goes on in the enterprise is, if not totally blind, then very nearly so, and for good reason. The reproduction of labor power takes place essentially outside the enterprise. How is the reproduction of labor power ensured? It is ensured by giving labor power the material means of reproducing itself, wages. Wages appear in every firm's account books, but as wage capital E3, not at all as a condition of the material reproduction of labor power. Yet that is clearly how wages work, since they represent only that portion of the value produced by the expenditure of labor power that is indispensable for its reproduction, that is, indispensable for reconstituting the wage worker's labor power, what he needs to procure food, clothing, and shelter. In short, what he needs to present himself at the factory gate again the next day, and every further day God grants him. Let us add, what is indispensable for raising and educating his children as well, in whom the proletarian reproduces himself as labor power, in n copies, where n equals 0, 1, 2, and so on. Let us recall that the quantity of value, wages, required to reproduce labor power is not determined by the needs of a biological minimum wage alone, but by those of a historical minimum. English workers need beer, Marx says, while French proletarians need wine. Thus it is a historically variable minimum. Let us also recall that this minimum is historical in a twofold sense, in that it is defined not by the historic needs recognized by the capitalist class, but by those imposed by the proletarian class struggle, a twofold class struggle, against lengthening the working day and against wage cuts. We can, however, leave this crucially important point aside, since it does not directly bear on what we are trying to show here, for it is not enough to guarantee labor power the material conditions of its reproduction if it is to be reproduced as labor power. We have said that the available labor power must be competent. That is, it must be such that it can be put to work in the complex system of the productive process, in specific posts and specific forms of cooperation. as a result of the development of the productive forces and the type of unity historically constitutive of the productive forces at a given moment, for labor power must be diversely skilled. Diversely, that is, as required by the social technical division of labor, its different jobs and posts. How is this reproduction of diversely qualified labor power ensured in a capitalist regime? It is ensured differently from social formations based on slavery or serfdom. The reproduction of the qualification of labor power no longer tends, it is a question of a tendential law, to be ensured on the job, instruction during production itself, but, increasingly, outside production, by the capitalist school system. And other instances and institutions that we shall discuss at greater length in a moment. But what do people learn at school? Everybody knows the answer. They stay in school for longer or shorter periods, but, at all events, they learn reading, writing and arithmetic. That is, they learn a handful of techniques, and quite a few other things besides, including elements, rudimentary or, on the contrary, advanced, of scientific culture, or literary culture, that are of direct use in different jobs in production. One curriculum for workers, a third to engineers, still another for technicians, a final one for senior managers, and so on. Thus they acquire know-how. What everybody also knows, however, that is, what nobody cares to know, is that, alongside these techniques, reading, writing and arithmetic, and this learning, elements of scientific and literary culture, that function as know-how, alongside, but also in the process of acquiring these techniques and this learning, people also learn, at school, the rules of good behavior, that is, the proprieties to be observed by every agent in the division of labor, depending on the post he is destined to hold in it. These are rules of professional ethics and professional conscience, that is, to put it plainly, rules of respect for the social and technical division of labor, and, in the final analysis, the rules of the order established by class domination. People also learn to speak proper French, at school, to write properly, which in fact means, for the future capitalists and their underlings, to order workers around properly, which in fact means, the ideal case, talk properly, to them so as to intimidate or cajole them, in short, to con them. The literary curricula in secondary and higher education serve that end. Among others, to put this in more scientific terms, we shall say that the reproduction of labor power requires not only that its qualifications be reproduced, but that its submission to the rules of respect for the established order be reproduced at the same time. This means, for the workers, reproduction of labor power's submission to the dominant ideology, and, for the agents of exploitation and repression, reproduction of its capacity to handle the dominant ideology properly, so as to ensure the domination of the dominant class verbally, in other words, the school, but also other state institutions such as the church or other apparatuses such as the army, which is as free and mandatory as school, to say nothing of the political parties, whose existence is bound up with the states, teaches know-how but in forms that ensure subjection to the dominant ideology, or else the practice of it. Every agent of production, exploitation, or repression, to say nothing of professional ideologues, Marx, has to be steeped in that ideology in one way or another in order conscientiously, and with no need to have his own personal gendarme breathing down his neck, to carry out his or her task. The task of the exploited, the proletarians, the exploiters, the capitalists, the auxiliaries of exploitation, supervisory personnel, or the high priests of the dominant ideology, its functionaries, and so on. Thus we see that the sine qua non for the reproduction of labor power is the reproduction not only of its qualification, but also of its subjection to the dominant ideology or of the practice of this ideology. Let us clearly spell out that one has to say not only, but also, for it is in the forms and under the forms of ideological subjection that the reproduction of the qualification of labor power is ensured. With that, however, we discover a new reality, ideology. A long analysis is required to broach this question. We shall introduce it with two remarks. The first remark will round off our analysis of reproduction. We have just rapidly examined the forms of the reproduction of the productive forces, that is, the means of production and labor power. But we have not yet broached the question of the reproduction of the relations of production. This question is the number one question, the crucial question for the Marxist theory of the mode of production. To neglect it would be a theoretical omission, worse, a serious political mistake. We shall therefore discuss it. To acquire the means we need to discuss it, however, we have to make another long detour. We ask the reader to follow us patiently and attentively. The second remark is that, to make this detour, we have to ask our old question again: what is a society? 1 Karl Marx, letter of July 11th. Social formation. That is why we once wrote, completely detached from their real life. That is why we can range all of the following under a single rubric: know-how, elementary techniques, and elements, even if they are relatively advanced, of scientific learning. Base and superstructure. We have already had occasion to insist on the revolutionary nature of the Marxist conception of the social whole. With regard to what distinguishes it from the Hegelian totality, we say that this thesis simply restates well-known propositions of historical materialism, that Marx conceives the structure of every society as constituted by levels or instances articulated by a specific determination, the infrastructure or economic base, the unity of the productive forces and the relations of production, and the superstructure, which itself comprises two levels or instances: the political legal level, law and the state, and the ideological level. The various ideologies, religious, moral, legal, political, and so on, are advantages of a topographical representation. This conception is of theoretical and didactic interest. It makes us see the difference between Marx and Hegel. It has a crucial theoretical advantage as well. It allows us to inscribe in the theoretical dispositive of its essential concepts what we have called the index of effectivity of each one. What does this mean? It will be readily agreed that this representation of the structure of every society as an edifice comprising a base, or infrastructure, on which the two floors of the superstructure are erected is a metaphor. To be quite precise, it is a spatial metaphor, the metaphor of a topography, to peak. Like all metaphors, this one too, suggests or makes us see something. What? Precisely the fact that the upper floors could not stay up, in the air, all by themselves if they did not rest, precisely, on their base, and its foundations. Thus the object of the metaphor of the edifice is, above all, to represent determination in the last instance, by the economic base. The effect of this spatial metaphor is accordingly to assign the base an index of effectivity known by the famous terms, determination in the last instance of what happens in the upper floors of the superstructure by what happens in the economic base setting out from this index of effectivity. In the last instance the floors of the superstructure are obviously endowed with different indices of effectivity. What kind of indices? We can say straight away, with no risk of error, that the upper floors of the superstructure are not determinant in the last instance, but are, rather, determined by the effectivity of the base. And that if they are determinant in their own way, which we have not yet defined, they are such insofar as they are determined by the base. Their index of effectivity, or determination, as determined by the determination in the last instance of the base, is thought in two forms. In the Marxist tradition, 1. The superstructure is relatively autonomous, with respect to the base. And 2. The superstructure reacts back on the base. We can therefore say that the big theoretical advantage of the Marxist topography, that is, of the spatial metaphor of the edifice, base and superstructure, is that it simultaneously makes us see that questions of determination, or of index of effectivity, are crucial. That it makes us see that it is the base which determines the whole edifice in the last instance. And, consequently, that it requires us to pose the theoretical problem of the type of derivative effectivity that is specific to the superstructure, or, in other words, that it compels us to think what the Marxist tradition designates with the linked terms of the relative autonomy of the superstructure and the action of the superstructure back on the base. On the other hand, the major disadvantage of this representation of the structure of all societies by the spatial metaphor of the edifice is, obviously, that it is metaphorical. In other words, that it remains descriptive. It now seems to us imperative to represent things differently. Let there be no mistake, we are in no sense rejecting the classic metaphor, since it is this metaphor itself which requires that we go beyond it. And we are not going beyond it in order to reject it as obsolete. We would simply like to try to think what it gives us in the form of a description. 11 Limits of a topographical representation. Let us lay our cards on the table. We think that it is by setting out from reproduction that it becomes possible and necessary to envisage the existence and nature of the superstructure. Simply adopting the standpoint of reproduction sheds light on several questions whose existence the spatial metaphor of the edifice indicated, but to which it could not furnish a conceptual response. We have to make a new stipulation here. In the texts we referred to a moment ago, we tended, taking up certain indications made by Marx and his successors, to emphasize the distinction, within the superstructure, between what we called, on the one hand, the legal political superstructure, law and the state, and, on the other, the ideological superstructure, the various ideologies. To emphasize this distinction was itself a way of making the reader see that there are differences in indices of effectivity between these two levels of the superstructure as well. Here, the spatial metaphor of the edifice also helped us to show that the legal political superstructure is, as a rule, more effective than the ideological superstructure, although the ideological superstructure too is endowed with relative autonomy in its relations with the legal political superstructure and is capable of reacting back on it. However, in emphasizing this distinction between the two forms of the superstructure, we remained within the logic of our metaphor and, accordingly, within its limits, those of a description. Here too, it has become imperative to represent things differently. That is, we should represent the relations between, first, the law state and, second, the ideologies in a way different from that dictated by the logic of the descriptive metaphor of the edifice. Let us take our idea to its logical conclusion. We should also represent differently from how we have so far what is involved in the singular dyad designated by our expression legal political superstructure. We should account for the hyphen that unites law and the state in the expression legal political, asking exactly what we can and should think to justify, or question, this hyphen. Finally, we should also ask why we use, and whether it is legitimate to use, an expression that puts law before the state, and whether it would not, rather, be preferable to put law after the state, or whether these questions of before and after, for representing a solution, are merely the index of a problem that should therefore be posed in completely different terms. All these questions, which we are raising in summary fashion, but, we think, correctly, can be summed up in the form of the following problems. What is law? What is the state? What is ideology? What are the relations between law, the state and ideology? In what kinds of groupings, law state or state law, and so on, can we represent these relations in order to think them? Our basic thesis is that it is only possible to pose these problems, and therefore to resolve them, from the viewpoint of reproduction. We will briefly analyze law, the state and ideology from that viewpoint. And we will try to bring out what happens from the viewpoint of practice and production on the one hand and, at the same time, of reproduction on the other. Only by taking this difference between reproduction and production into consideration can we provide the solution to the problems that we are here posing. One final remark before we enter into this analysis: since we are looking for answers to complex questions that bear on the very order that they imply, and since we are, for the time being, ignorant of that order, we shall adopt a provisionally arbitrary order, which we shall of course have to rectify once we have made these analyses. We propose, then, to proceed in the following arbitrary order: law, state, ideology. We shall see that, as we proceed, we shall have to modify that order for an unexpected reason. We are going to discover a new reality. 1 info Marx and Read in capital, Paris, Mars Beau, 1965, Louis Althusser, 4 Marx, trans. Ben Brewster, London, Verso, 2010. Louis Althusser and Etienne Balibar, Read in capital, trans. Ben Brewster, abridged English version, London, Verso, 20091. Topography, from the Greek word topo, place. A topography represents, in a defined space, the respective places occupied by various realities. Thus the economic is at the bottom, the base, and the superstructure is on top. In this way, the topography makes visible what is at the foundations, the base, and what is determined by the base, the superstructure. TN, the following sentence in the footnote has been crossed out. Everyone knows, and sees that the upper floors of a house do not stay up in the air all by themselves, but rest on a base and its foundations. 3 for Marx and Read in capital. Law. We shall here examine what is given the name law in the social formations that fall under the capitalist mode of production. It should be made clear in advance that we shall be making, for the moment, a purely descriptive analysis. We shall take up the same question in more theoretical form once we have acquired the means to do so. Carter 11 Law is a system of codified rules, consider the civil code, the penal code, public law, commercial law, and so on, which are applied, that is to say, both respected and circumvented, in day-to-day practice. To simplify our discussion, we shall focus on private law, contained in the civil code. Private law is, moreover, the legal base from which the other sectors of law set out to systematize and harmonize their own notions and rules. We can say, very schematically, the following. Private law states, in systematic form, rules governing commodity exchange, that is, purchases and sales, based, in the last instance, on property rights. Those rights, in turn, are derived, sexplicite from the following general legal principles: legal personality, civil personality, which defines individuals as legal persons endowed with defined legal capacities, the legal freedom to use and abuse the goods one owns, and equality before the law, for all individuals endowed with a legal personality in our present law. This means all human beings with the exception of a certain number of rejects, excluded from equality before the. That said, what shall we say about law? We should note 3 characteristics, on which, moreover, Marx and Engels, following Kant and, to some extent, Hegel, put the accent. The systematicity of law necessarily takes the form of a system which, by its nature, aspires to internal consistency and comprehensiveness. We beg the reader's pardon for introducing these 2 apparently technical concepts here. They are easy to understand insofar as law is a system of rules that are applied, that is, both respected and circumvented. There has to be consistency among all the rules of the system, such that one cannot invoke one rule against another. If that were possible, the effect of the first rule would be cancelled by the effect of the second. That is why law tends to eliminate all possibility of internal contradiction, and why jurists engage in the extraordinary activity of systematization that has, from time immemorial, elicited the admiration of ordinary mortals. That is what makes jurists jurists, with a maniacal concern for rules and the cases to which they apply at the same time. However, law must be comprehensive, satchel. In other words, it must represent a system of rules which, tendentially, cover every case that could possibly present itself in reality, so that one is not brought up short by something that is not juridically covered and could allow non-juridical practices to make their way into the law itself, undermining the integrity of the system. Hence another admirable aspect of the activity of jurists, who have from time immemorial striven to absorb the disparities of customary law, and the gaps and deviations of case law, application of the existing rules to concrete cases that, often, go beyond them, in the law itself. This activity of systematization is accordingly to be understood not only as elimination of the contradictions that can arise among the rules of existing law, but also, and above all, as elimination of the eventual contradictions that may arise between the rules already defined in the internal system of law and the paralegal limit practices of case law, the essential role of which is to identify cases that the law has not yet really integrated and systematized. In this regard, case law must obviously be brought into relation with laws outside, the existence of which the history of law recognizes in the form of what is known as customary as opposed to written legislation. Every system of legal rules gives rise to a written codification. Let us, however, leave this point aside. It interests us only insofar as it indicates, from the standpoint of the security of the law itself, the existence of a more or less threatening outside of the law. 11 Formalism of law is necessarily formal, in that it bears not on the content of what is exchanged between legal persons in of purchase and contracts of purchase and sale, but on the form of these contracts regulating exchange, a form defined by the formal acts of legal persons who are formally free and equal before the law. It is to the extent that law is formal that it can be systematized as tendentially non-contradictory and comprehensive. Law's formalism and its correlative systematicity constitute its formal universality. The law applies to and may be invoked by every person legally defined and recognized as a legal person. The formalism of law is usually regarded as, and criticized for being, formalistic. Thus it is judged and criticized from a moral standpoint. A moral standpoint is a moral standpoint, it produces approval or condemnation. But law is indifferent to whether it is approved or condemned. Law exists and functions, and can only exist and function. Formally, the obvious effect of law's formalism is to bracket, in law itself, the different contents to which the form of law is applied. But it by no means makes these contents disappear by enchantment. Quite the contrary, the formalism of law makes sense only to the extent that it is applied to define contents that are necessarily absent from law itself. These contents are the relations of production and their effects. Hence we can begin to see that 1. Law only exists as a function of the existing relations of production. 2. Law has the form of law, that is, formal systematicity, only on condition that the relations of production as a function of which it exists are completely absent from law itself. This singular situation of law, which exists only as a function of a content from which it abstracts completely, the relations of production, explains the classical Marxist formula: law expresses the relations of production while making no mention at all, in the system of its rules, of those relations of production. On the contrary, it makes them disappear. The distinction between the relations of production on the one hand and law on the other is fundamental in Marxist theory. Confusing them gives rise not only to very serious theoretical mistakes, but also to the very serious political errors that follow from those theoretical mistakes. It is in fact imperative that we make this distinction not only in order to analyze what happens in the capitalist mode of production, but also in order to anticipate what will happen in the socialist mode of production. It is perfectly obvious, to take just this one example, that it is wrong to define the socialist mode of production in terms of collective or socialist ownership of the means of production. It is wrong to define the socialist revolution as the transition from one kind of ownership to another. From ownership of the means of production by individuals or monopolistic groups, reduced to a handful, to ownership of the same means of production by their collectivity, that is, the state on the one hand and cooperatives on the other. For talk about collective ownership of the means of production is talk about, not socialist relations of production, but, let us say, socialist law, and to mistake so-called socialist law for socialist relations of production. If we stick to this purely legal definition of the socialist mode of production, we risk very serious disillusions. Experience is there to prove it. We know that Marx always defined the relations of production constitutive of the socialist mode of production not in terms of collective, socialist, ownership of the means of production, but in terms of their collective or common appropriation by freely associated men and women. Thus he refused to define in terms of law that which cannot be defined in terms of law, even if it is called socialist law. This refusal goes very far in Marx, for in his view all law, since it is in the last instance the law of commodity relations, is marked by this indelibly bourgeois defect. Thus all law is by essence, in the last instance, inegalitarian and bourgeois. See on this question the admirable, but too brief, comment to be found in the Critique of the Gotha program. What, then, are we to understand by collective, common appropriation of the means of production by freely associated men and women? Clearly, while the problem is posed by this programmatic formula, which eschews all reference to law and all legal domination, the solution is not provided. The debates that this problem has occasioned and continues to occasion in the history of the Marxist workers' movement are well known, and far from over. Some do not go beyond state and cooperative ownership of the means of production. Socialism then becomes a matter of economic planning. They claim that good socialist law and good planning realize, spontaneously and concretely, the appropriation of the means of production of which Marx spoke. Others wish to move immediately to direct appropriation by the agents of production by establishing self-management, which, for them, is this appropriation. Slogans such as workers' power, or economic democracy issue or have issued from this tendency. Things are not simple. They are not simple because we must not confuse the socialist relations of production enabling common appropriation of the means of production, and, later, communist relations of production, with the relations to be established in the phase of the transition to socialism. For if socialism must not be confused with communism, the phase of the transition to socialism, of the construction of socialism, must a fortiori not be mistaken for socialism in the transitional phase in question, the phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat. One does not yet have to do, as Lenin repeated 1,000 times, with socialist relations of production, but with transitional relations in which so-called socialist law remains, by its form, inegalitarian and therefore bourgeois law, and in which state ownership and cooperative ownership are merely transitional forms that the dictatorship of the proletariat must utilize as such in order to prepare in them, patiently, tenaciously, over a long period, the constitution of the future socialist relations of production. Lenin repeated this incessantly, against all those who, ignoring the need to proceed step by step and, to boot, proposing petty bourgeois solutions already quite classic in utopian socialism, wanted to establish workers' power self-management and economic democracy, or the democracy of production if, however, we can agree to leave the problems of the transitional phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat to that phase. The first of them consists in knowing whether or not one has gone beyond the phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and not confuse them with the problems of already constructed socialism. We can pose the question of the nature of collective, socialist, appropriation of the means of production in its own right. We can ask, to begin with, what Marx meant by this programmatic term. Marx obviously meant something like the withering away of law, a correlative of the withering away of the state. The withering away of law can only mean the withering away of commodity exchange, exchanges of goods in the form of commodities, naturally including, first and foremost, the commodity that labor power becomes in capitalist commodity relations, and their replacement by non-commodity exchange. We are thus inevitably led to the question as to how such non-commodity exchange is to be realized. The classic response runs through socialist planning. But what is socialist planning? It is plain that this is a burning question today, but it is one that bears the terrible mark of the very particular form that Stalin's politics impressed on Soviet planning from the 1930s on. We shall call it state, etetic planning rather than bureaucratic planning, since the bureaucracy effect is a secondary effect of a more general politics, although trying, in the USSR, Czechoslovakia, Hungary and other countries, to make planning more flexible by introducing liberal measures are, even today, thrashing about within the limits established by this very particular form. The effect of such measures is to acknowledge and extend commodity relations at the very heart of these countries. Economies likewise posed within the limits established by this very particular form are the theoretical problems over which theorists in these countries are agonizing and arguing, and also proposing methods for resolving key questions. For example, the question of how prices should be determined. 9. The labor theory of value, placed at the heart of these theoretical questions, as proper Marxist doctrine requires, is, if I may say so, put to a hard test in these debates. At the limit, an appeal is made to the double myth of automation and electronics, which are together supposed to make it possible, thanks to a hyper-centralization facilitated by gigantic computers, to resolve all these problems by magic mathematical planning, with a little help, which just happens to be indispensable, from the profitability criterion. In the enterprises I doubt that this technocratic solution, tempered with a dose of economic liberalism, which is uncontrollable in the long run, and the requisite sort of right-thinking humanist ideology, the necessary counterpoint, will provide us with the kind of socialist planning capable of materializing relations of appropriation of the means of production by freely associated men and women. We would do well to take a big step back from the form of planning imposed by Stalin's politics, which still commands these problems, in order to put things into historical, political and theoretical perspective and re-examine them from a more correct point of view. That, at any rate, is my personal opinion. I'll offer it as such, but this step back and its effects presuppose political and theoretical conditions which, if the present course of events is any indication, are not likely to prevail any time soon and will not come about without serious transformations that it will be painful to carry out. For very serious questions lurk behind these problems, even in the socialist countries, questions of us and the class struggle, a circumstance that should not surprise Marxists. However that may be, it is clear that by way of the various experiments in progress, the Yugoslav experiment, from which we may already draw the certain conclusion that it is only a stage in a transition regression towards capitalism. Soviet planning, marked by Stalin's conception. Chinese planning, the form and spirit of which are considerably different. In these various experiments, I say, it is well and truly a question of a search for unprecedented forms in which these much discussed relations of socialist production may one day exist as relations of real appropriation. It is also clear that the search for such forms is not just a theoretical question, even if theory has a very important part to play in it, the theory of Marx and Lenin, of course, but an eminently political question that can be settled only after the conclusion of political struggles. At bottom, economic, political and ideological class struggles, of which we are now experiencing just the beginnings. Those are some of the reasons for which the Marxist distinction between the relations of production and legal relations is of the first importance. 111. The repressive nature of law is necessarily repressive. Kant sees and states this very clearly in his Metaphysics of Morals, a work that has very little of the metaphysical about it, its title notwithstanding. In this regard, the Hegelian conception of law, with its delirious idealism, trails far behind Kant's. Law is repressive in that it could not exist in the absence of a corresponding system of sanction. In other words, there can be no civil code without a penal code, which is the realization of the former at the level of the law itself. This is easy to grasp. A legal contract can exist only on condition that it is applied. In other words, on condition that the law is respected or circumvented. Hence there must be a law of the application, or non-application, of law, that is, of the observance, or non-observance, of the rules of the legal contract. In a contract, two legal persons promise to make certain defined exchanges. At the same time, they promise to submit to sanctions if they fail to observe the terms of the contract. By way of the essential legal complement to law comprised by the system of legal rules for the sanction of non-observance of the terms of a contract, by way of the legal complement of the civil code comprised by the penal code, law recognizes, internally, that it could not exist. That is, be practiced by legal persons, without rules of repressive constraint. This is what Kant very clearly sees in his Metaphysics of Law. Law entails constraint. Naturally, however, he sees it from the standpoint of morality, hence as a difference between law, a formal, non-contradictory comprehensive repressive system, and morality, a formal, non-contradictory comprehensive system that includes an obligation duty which is without sanction and thus without repression. No one will be surprised to learn that our viewpoint on law is not Kant's, the viewpoint of its difference from morality, but an altogether different viewpoint, that of its difference from the relations of production. Things are now simple. Constraint implies sanction. Sanction implies repression, and therefore, necessarily, an apparatus of repression. This apparatus exists in the repressive state apparatus. In the narrow sense it is called courts, fines, prisons, and the various detachments, corps of the police. It is by virtue of this that law is inseparably bound up with the state, fet cor avocat. At the same time, however, it is clear that the practice of law is not exclusively based on repression in act. Most of the time, repression is, as the expression goes, preventive. It intervenes in legal state forms in a very small number of cases, over against the infinite number of contracts that are respected without the intervention in propria persona of the repressive apparatus or the initiation of a repressive process. In the vast majority of cases, things go without a hitch. The terms of the contract are observed. We must, however, pay close attention here. For LAW, legal ideology, and the supplement of moral ideology 12 common sense, that almanac not of public asininities, will burst out laughing, with its coarse laugh. It is fear of the gendarme, which makes the parties to a contract respect the promises they make in the articles of a contract. For, as everyone knows, fear of the gendarme is the beginning of wisdom. 113. To which decent people will respond, to all appearances with good reason, that if the gendarme is plainly on the horizon of legal obligations, he is by no means present on the horizon of the consciousness/conscience of the contracting parties. Better. He is absent in person. The decent people are right. Indeed, they are always right. But one must understand the reasons for which they are right. In the present case, we need only listen to what they say. If we observe the terms of the contract we sign, it is not, God forbid, out of fear of the gendarme, but out of simple decency. There do in fact exist honest people who sign contracts, people who do not at all need the fear of the gendarme to be honest. They are honest for reasons of simple professional conscience, or simple moral conscience, and they sometimes derive a certain pride from this, when they do not derive, more or less discreetly, commercial advantages from it, for everyone in the national or international market knows that such and such a company is perfectly law-abiding and punctual, or even that such and such a people is, Germans, Japanese, and so on, whereas other companies or peoples do not know how, properly, to behave in business matters, that is, how to honor their promises. Honor. We had better take the decent people at their word, for, in spite of all the sarcastic remarks of a latent poujadism and the petty bourgeois bitterness that does not imagine that it, the petty bourgeoisie, could ever have gone to ruin if it had not been swindled, the decent people are fundamentally in the right, for good reason. Let us call that right reason by its name, since, a moment ago, we gave the repressive apparatus, part of the state apparatus, required by bourgeois law, its name. Let us give its name to this right reason as well. It is legal ideology, and also moral ideology, which serves legal ideology as a supplement. The vast majority of legal persons observe the terms of the contracts they sign, and they do indeed do so without the intervention of, and even without preventive threats from, the specialized repressive state apparatus. They do so because they are steeped in the decency of legal ideology, which inscribes itself in their behavior of respect for law and, in the proper sense, enables law to function, enables, that is, legal practice to go all by itself without the help of repression or threats. But we must pay close attention here to legal ideology is obviously required by the practice of law, and therefore by law. Law that is not practiced is not law at all, but it is not the same thing as law. Law says, right in its codes, for example, every individual, except for the rejects comprising the exceptions we mentioned earlier, is legally free to sign contracts or not, to use and abuse his or her property, and so on. This is a legal definition of freedom, that is, a definition of freedom by law, by the system of its rules, a perfectly precise definition of freedom that holds only within the limits of law and has nothing to do with moral or philosophical freedom, or even, as we shall see, with the freedom of legal ideology. Law says, for example, all individuals, except for the rejects, and so on, are legally equal before every contractual act and its consequences, especially its penal consequences. This is a legal definition of equality, that is, a definition of equality by law, by the system of its rules, a perfectly precise definition of equality that holds only within the limits of law and has nothing to do with moral, political or metaphysical equality, or even, as we shall see, with the equality of legal ideology. Law says, for example, that we must respect the obligations we have signed. This is a legal definition of obligation, that is, a definition of obligation by law, by the system of its penal rules, a perfectly precise definition of obligation that holds only within the limits of law and has nothing to do with moral obligation or metaphysical obligation, or even, as we shall see, with the obligation of legal ideology. If we wish to talk about legal ideology with a modicum of respect for the facts and with some rigor in our terminology, we must say that, while it does indeed take up the notions of freedom, equality and obligation, it inscribes them outside the law, and thus outside the system of the rules of law and their limits, in an ideological discourse that is structured by completely different notions. To sum up the essence of these basic notions of legal ideology, we must pay attention to the following little difference. Law says, individuals are legal persons, legally free, equal and bound to honor their obligations as legal persons. In other words, law does not leave the domain of law, it brings everything back to law, honestly. It should not be reproached for this, it honestly plies its trade as law. Legal ideology, for its part, utters a discourse that is apparently similar, but in fact altogether different. It says, men are free and equal by nature. Thus, in legal ideology, it is nature, not law, which founds the freedom and equality of men, not of legal persons. That is a little different. There remains, obviously, obligation. Legal ideology does not say that men are bound to honor their obligations by nature. It needs a little supplement on this point, very precisely, a little moral supplement. This means that legal ideology can stand upright only if it leans on the moral ideology of conscience and duty. For support, the reader will have understood what we wanted to show. Law is a formal, systematized, non-contradictory, tendentially, comprehensive system that cannot exist all by itself. On the one hand, it rests on part of the state repressive apparatus for support. On the other hand, it rests on legal ideology and a little supplement of moral ideology for support. On the horizon of every legal practice there is, doubtless, a gendarme who keeps an eye on things and intervenes, part of the state apparatus, when he must most of the time. However, he does not intervene and is even completely absent from the horizon of legal practice. What, then, is present, not on the horizon of this space, but in this space itself? Legal ideology plus the little supplement of moral ideology. It is quite as if legal and moral ideology played the role of the absent gendarme and were his representative in the space of the legal practice of contracts. Someone who is absent is someone who is absent. The representative of the one who is absent is not the one who is absent, but his representative. Our diplomats know well, and thank God, for they would otherwise be crushed under the weight of France that, unlike de Gaulle, they are not France, but only its representatives. This allows them to have a little life of their own, a family, holidays and prospects, career prospects included. legal moral ideology thus stands in for the gendarme. But insofar as it stands in for the gendarme, it is not the gendarme. This is not nitpicking or an idle distinction. This distinction is manifest in fact, very precisely, in the circumstance that the gendarme is a repressive force of physical intervention. He is accredited after taking an oath empowering him to arrest a delinquent and bring her, handcuffed, if necessary, before the proper legal authority, a qui de droit who will require that she give an account of herself, with detention, jail, a trial and condemnations, at the end of the process. The gendarme is the violence of the state cloaked by an inoffensive, or not so inoffensive, uniform. Operators are composed about him precisely so as to forget that he exists only by violence. We shall say that, in the guise of the gendarme, legal practice function on the violence, the regulated violence, of the state apparatus. However, as a general rule, in the vast majority of cases, there is no need for state violence to intervene for legal practice to function. Legal moral ideology is sufficient, and things go all by themselves since legal persons are steeped in the glaringly obvious self-evident truths that men are free and equal by nature, and must respect their promises by virtue of simple legal moral conscience baptized professional conscience, to mask its ideological grounds. We shall therefore say that the practice of law functions in the vast majority of cases on legal moral ideology. Of course, the consequence of the way law thus functions on state violence and, at the same time, on non-violent ideology are incalculable, as far as both the relations of production and the forms of existence of the relations of production in the division and organization of labor are concerned. We shall obviously have to come back to this. But for the moment we shall leave this crucial question in suspense in order to focus our attention on the following remark. Our analysis of the nature and functioning of law has brought us face to face with two realities, although we have made no special effort to seek them out, in whose absence the existence and functioning of law are literally unintelligible. These realities are the state on the one hand and ideology on the other. It is time to discuss them, one because of pathologies, mentally ill individuals who have been involuntarily detained as a penal measure, or in accordance with non-statutory rules applying to children, minors, foreigners, women to a certain extent, and so on. The law recognizes that all people, as equal legal subjects, have a right to own property. No article of the law code, however, recognizes the fact that certain subjects, the capitalists, own the means of production, while others, the proletarians, have no means of production at all. This element, the relations of production, is accordingly absent from the law which, at the same time, guarantees it. See Chapter 11.3, EN. The manuscript includes the following crossed-out passage, for example, a formula seeking to define socialism as founded on collective ownership, as opposed to individual capitalist ownership, of the means of production remains caught up in legal relations, collective ownership, in that it maintains the basic principle of bourgeois law, legal personality, collective legal personality, the state or collective such as the Cocos is instead of individual legal personality. This definition can be of some rough use when, starting from bourgeois law, we try to anticipate what will happen in the socialist mode of production. However, precisely because it confounds the relations of production with bourgeois legal relations, it completely misses its object, socialist relations of production. It is easy to understand the kind of theoretical and practical aberrations such a formulation can induce among those who are building socialism, since if the capitalist relations of production themselves can under no circumstances be confused with bourgeois law, it is a fortiori scandalous to define socialist relations of production not only in terms of law, but, to boot, in terms of bourgeois law. One should beware of a potential trap for the imagination of readers who may be tempted to say, granted, we must abandon the standpoint of bourgeois law and adopt that of socialist law. This comes down to repeating the same mistake in different terms, for if law must necessarily subsist in the period of transition from capitalism to socialism, the law that subsists, even if it is called socialist, because legal persons are collective, is still bourgeois law, for law as such is the law of commodity relations and thus bourgeois. The socialist mode of production will abolish all law. Marx understood this perfectly. He states it in his own terms in a passage of his critique of the Gotha program that is often quoted, but rarely understood, for, tn, as in many other passages of the reproduction of the relations. 6. The law that puts them beyond the reach of any appeal whatever. The state. The Marxist tradition is categorical, from the Manifesto and the 18th Brumaire on, and in all the later classic texts, above all Marx on the Paris Commune and Lenin in State and Revolution. The state is explicitly conceived as a repressive apparatus. The state is a repressive machine that enables the dominant classes, in the 19th century, the bourgeois class and the class of big landowners, to ensure their domination over the working class in order to subject it to the process of extorting surplus value, that is, to capitalist exploitation. The state is thus, above all, what the Marxist classics have called the state apparatus. This term covers not only the specialized apparatus, in the narrow sense, whose existence and necessity follows, as we have seen, from the requirements of legal practice, that is, the police, courts and prisons, army, which, apart from its national defense role, the proletariat has paid for this experience with its blood, intervenes directly as the auxiliary repressive force of last resort when the police, and its specialized corps, the riot police, and others, are overwhelmed by events. Presiding over this ensemble are the chief of state, the government, and the administration presented in this form. The Marxist-Leninist theory of the state touches on the essential point, and there can be no question at all of not recognizing that this is indeed the essential point. the state apparatus, which defines the state as a repressive force of execution and intervention at the service of the dominant classes, in but also the class struggle waged by the bourgeoisie and its allies against the proletariat, is well and truly the state, and this well and truly defines its basic function. From a descriptive theory of the state to theory in the full sense. Nevertheless, here too this presentation of the nature of the state remains descriptive, as we have already noted about the metaphor of the edifice, base and superstructure, since we shall often have occasion to use this adjective descriptive. A word of explanation is in order to eliminate all ambiguity. When, in discussing the metaphor of the edifice or the Marxist theory of the state, we say that these are descriptive conceptions or representations of their object, we have no negative ulterior motives. On the contrary, there is every reason to believe that great scientific discoveries cannot avoid going through a first phase of what we shall call descriptive theory. This would be the first phase of every theory, at least in the domain that concerns us, that of the science of social formations. Accordingly, one could, and, in our view, one must regard this phase as a transitional phase necessary for the development of the theory. We inscribe the fact that it is transitional in our expression descriptive theory, bringing out, by way of the conjunction of the two terms employed, the equivalent of a kind of contradiction. For the term theory is partially at odds with the adjective descriptive attached to it. This means, to be very precise, 1. That the descriptive theory really is, beyond the shadow of a doubt, the irreversible commencement of the theory. But 2. That the descriptive form in which the theory is presented requires, precisely as an effect of this contradiction, a development of the theory that goes beyond the form of description. Let us clarify this idea by returning to the subject to hand, the state. To say that the Marxist theory of the state at our disposal remains largely descriptive means, first and foremost, that this descriptive theory is, beyond the shadow of a doubt, the real commencement of a Marxist theory of the state, and that this commencement provides us with the essential point, that is, the decisive principle, of every later development of the theory. But that is not enough. We shall say that a theory is descriptive when we can perfectly well bring the vast majority of observable facts in the domain on which it bears into correspondence with its definition of its object. Thus the definition of the state as a class state that exists in the repressive state apparatus sheds a very revealing light on all the facts observable in the various orders of repression in whatever domain, from the massacres of June 1848 and the Paris Commune, of Bloody Sunday and May 1905 in Petrograd, of the resistance, of Caron, and so on, through the simple, and relatively harmless, interventions of a censorship that banned Gatti's play on Franco or the translation of Daguerreau's La Religieuse into the cinematographer's moving pictures, to all the direct or indirect forms of the slaughter of the popular masses, imperialist wars, their exploitation, and the subtle everyday domination in which is revealed, in the forms of political democracy, for example, what Lenin called, after Marx, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. That is the first aspect of the definition of a descriptive theory. In its second aspect, it is, obviously, a stage in the constitution of a theory which itself demands that we go beyond that stage. For it is clear that, while the definition in question really does provide us with the means of identifying and recognizing the facts of oppression by linking them to the state conceived as repressive state apparatus, this linkage gives rise to a very special kind of obviousness, about which we shall soon have occasion to say a word. Yes, that's really how it is, that's really true. 13. And although accumulating facts under the definition of the state multiplies examples, it fails to advance the definition of the state, the scientific theory of it, by a jot. If this definition were to remain at the first stage, in which it functions as a descriptive theory, it would risk finding itself in unstable equilibrium, as if it were poised on a narrow mountain ridge, on the point, that is, of falling to one side or the other. This instability and the attendant risk of a fall have been very well analyzed in a recent book, for here we shall note only the book's reminder that, precisely because of the instability of the descriptive theory of the state, certain Marxists, and by no means the least of them, have fallen to the wrong side of the path on the ridge by presenting the state as a mere instrument of domination and repression in the service of objectives, that is, of the dominant class's conscious will. This is a bourgeois, instrumentalist idealist conception of the state, reinforced by a bourgeois idealist, humanist, conception of social classes as subjects. Such a conception has nothing to do with Marxism, because it perverts what is ultimately the most valuable thing the descriptive theory gives us. Hence the need to fall to the right side of the mountain path, or, to drop the metaphor, the need to develop the descriptive theory into a theory in the full sense. Here too, we have to be careful to develop this descriptive theory into a theory in the full sense, that is, in order to grasp the mechanisms of the state in its functioning, rather than merely identifying and ranging the facts of repression under the concept of state apparatus. We think it is imperative to add something to the classic definition of the state as state apparatus. 11. The essentials of the Marxist theory of the state, what must be, if not added, then at least made very precise, is, to begin with, the fact that the state, and its existence in its apparatus, is intelligible only as a function of state power. The whole political class struggle revolves around the state, around the possession, that is, the seizure or conservation of state power by a certain class or power block, in other words, an alliance between classes or class fractions. This first stipulation accordingly requires us to distinguish between, on the one hand, state power, conservation of state power or seizure of state power, the objective of the political class struggle, and, on the other hand, the state apparatus. We know that the state apparatus can remain in place even after political events which affect the possession of state power without affecting or modifying the state apparatus. This is proved by the 19th century bourgeois revolutions or coups d'état in France, the collapse of regimes, the political rise of the petty bourgeoisie, 1890-5 in France, like and so on. Even after a social revolution, like that of 1917, a large part of the state apparatus remained in place after an alliance of the proletariat and poor peasantry seized state power. Lenin repeated that often enough. It was an anguishing preoccupation of his to the day he died. The book we have cited offers an illuminating, detailed discussion of this point. It may be added that this distinction between state power and the state apparatus has been an explicit part of the Marxist theory of the state from Marx's 18th Brumaire on. To summarize the Marxist theory of the state, on this point, let us recall that the classics of Marxism have always maintained that 1. The state is the repressive state apparatus. 2. State power and state apparatus must be distinguished. 3. The objective of the class struggle has to do with the possession of state power and, consequently, use of the state apparatus holding state power as a function of their class objectives by the classes, or alliances of classes or class fractions. And 4. The proletariat must seize state power in order to destroy the existing bourgeois state apparatus. In a first phase, the phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat, it must replace it with an utterly different, proletarian state apparatus, before going on, in later phases, to set a radical process in motion, the destruction of the state, the end of state power and all state apparatuses. From this standpoint, consequently, what we just proposed to add to the Marxist theory of the state is already there, black on white. It seems to me, however, that this theory, even completed in this way, remains partly descriptive, although it now contains complex, differential elements whose play and functioning cannot be grasped without the help of a decisive theoretical enrichment. 111 The ideological state apparatus is what has to be added to the Marxist theory of the state is therefore something else. Here we shall be advancing cautiously on a terrain on which Marx, Lenin, Stalin and Mao have long since preceded us, but without systematizing, in theoretical form, the decisive progress that their experiences and procedures implied. Why? Because these experiences and procedures were restricted in the main to the terrain of political practice. By that, we mean to suggest that the classics of Marxism in fact treated the state, in their political practice, as a reality that is more complex than the definition of it given in the Marxist theory of the state, even when that definition is completed as we have just completed it. Thus they acknowledged this complexity in their practice without expressing it in a corresponding theory. We would like to try to sketch that corresponding theory. We know very well the sort of objection we will be opening ourselves up to, since we cannot put forward a single proposition that is not already contained in the records of the political practice of the proletarian class struggle. Thus it can be objected at every turn that we are not adding anything new at all. And in a sense, that is perfectly true. We nevertheless believe that we are adding something new, doubtless very little, since we are merely giving theoretical form to something that has already been recognized in the practice of the proletarian class struggle. Yet we know, thanks to the same Marxist classics, that this very little, casting the practical experience of the class struggle in theoretical form, is, or can be, very important for the class struggle itself. Without revolutionary theory of the state, no revolutionary movement. We shall lay our cards on the table. We are going to advance and defend the following thesis to produce a theory of the state. It is imperative to take into account not only the distinction between state power, and those who hold it, and state apparatus, but also another reality that must clearly be ranged alongside the repressive state apparatus, but is not conflated with it. We shall take the theoretical risk of calling it the ideological state apparatuses. The precise point on which our theoretical intervention bears is thus these ideological state apparatuses in their distinction from the state apparatus in the sense of repressive state apparatus. Be it recalled that the state apparatus comprises, in Marxist theory, the government, administration, army, police, courts and prisons, which together constitute what we shall henceforth call the repressive state apparatus. Repressive should be understood, at the limit, for there exist many, very varied and even very subtly occulted forms of non-physical repression, in the strong, precise sense of using physical violence, direct or indirect, legal or illegal. What, then, are the ideological state apparatuses, ISAS? The following provisional list will give us a rough idea of them. 1. The scholastic apparatus. 2. The familial apparatus. 3. The religious apparatus. 4. The political apparatus. 5. The associative apparatus. 6. The information and news apparatus. 7. The publishing and distribution apparatus. 8. The cultural apparatus. This list is provisional because, first, it is not exhaustive. See Carter 12. And, second, because it may be that apparatuses 7 and 8 are just one apparatus. The reader will perhaps bear with this last hesitation, for I have not yet made up my mind on this point, which calls for further research. This list, in which, for example, the family figures, and these terms will not fail to cause surprise. Let us be patient and proceed in orderly fashion in order to arrive at a provisional but clear definition. First remark, one can observe, empirically, that there exist institutions or organizations, as they are called, corresponding to each ISA. For the scholastic ISA, the various schools and their various levels, from the primary to the tertiary, the various institutes, and so on. For the religious ISA, the various churches and their specialized organizations, for example, youth organizations. For the political ISA, the parliament, the political parties, and so on. For the information and news ISA, the press, the various newspapers or newspaper groups, the RTF, and a large number of publications and organizations. For the familial ISA, all the institutions that have to do with the family, including the famous associations of parents of school children, and so on. For the cultural ISA, all kinds of entertainment, sport included, as well as a series of institutions that may dovetail with what we have called the publishing ISA. Second remark, for each ISA, the various institutions and organizations comprising it form a system. That, at any rate, is the thesis we are putting forward. We shall see what constitutes the unity of the system in each case. If this is right, we cannot discuss any one component part of an ISA without relating it to the system of which it is a part. For example, we cannot discuss a political party, a component part of the political ISA, without relating it to the complex 10 system of the political ISA. The same holds for a trade union, which is a component part of the system constituted by the associative ISA, and so on. Third remark, it can be seen that the institutions existing in each ISA, the system they form, and, consequently, each ISA, although defined as ideological, is not reducible to the existence of ideas, without a concrete, material support. I mean by this not only that the ideology of each ISA is realized in material institutions and material practices. That is clear. I mean something else, that these material practices are anchored in non-ideological realities. Take the family, it is an ISA, but the ideology that it realizes is anchored in a reality that is not purely ideological, for the family is the site of the biological reproduction of representatives of the human race, of their rearing and training, and so on. Let us say that it reproduces the existence of labor power. But the family is clearly also something else. Even in our capitalist societies, in which it is now disappearing, it preserves, at least in certain now disintegrating sectors, the role of a production unit, for example, in the countryside, family farms. In the mode of production based on serfdom, the family was the dominant production unit. In our mode of production, this is a survival. On the other hand, the family still is a unit of consumption in our societies. It is not the only kind of unit of consumption there is, but, of those in existence, it is a kind that still plays an extremely important part, and it is not about to disappear. It subsists in the socialist regimes with which we are familiar, albeit in transformed or waning forms. For example, the cultural ISA, the ideology that it realizes is anchored in practices either aesthetic, the theatre, film, literature, or physical, sport, that are not reducible to the ideology for which they serve as a support. The same holds for the political and associative ISAs, the ideology they realize is anchored in a reality irreducible to that ideology, here, the class struggle. The same holds for the ISA we are calling the scholastic apparatus, the ideology it realizes is anchored in practices that make it possible to acquire and use objective know-how irreducible to that ideology. An ISA such as the religious apparatus, in contrast, does in fact seem to exist up in the air, as a function of the pure and simple ideology that it realizes, but this is by no means certain. Later, we shall attempt to say why these three remarks will allow us to state a provisional definition. It foregrounds the reality, namely, ideology, which unifies, in systems, the various institutions or organizations and the various practices present in each ISA. We shall say that, an ideological state apparatus is a system of defined institutions, organizations, and the corresponding practices realized in the institutions, organizations, and practices of this system is or part, generally speaking, a typical combination of certain elements of the state ideology. The ideology realized in an ISA ensures its systemic unity on the basis of an anchoring in material functions specific to each ISA. These functions are not reducible to that ideology, but serve it as a support. When the time comes, we will explain what we mean by the state ideology, the existence of which accounts for the fact that the ISAs are ideological apparatuses and state apparatuses, and also for the unity that makes each ISA a specific system distinct from the other ISAs we can. Now come back to the concept that we are proposing ideological state apparatus in order to examine each of its three terms and justify the fact that we have associated them in our concept. Readers will doubtless be surprised at seeing these realities diverse institutions or activities designated as apparatuses. A concept that obviously brings the expression state apparatus to mind. And they will be intrigued at seeing us attach the adjective ideological to the term apparatuses, only to discover, finally, at the tail end of this expression, the state itself, ideological state apparatuses. It is as if we wanted to bring out that the ideological is, as it were, stuck in 11 with the middle, of the expression apparail. D'etat, the small difference that the term state apparatus court is in the singular, whereas our ideological state apparatuses are in the plural. All this obviously calls for explanation. In presenting our explanation, we shall set out from this singular situation in which ideology is stuck between apparail and d'etat, precipitating the passage from the singular, state apparatus, to the plural, ideological state apparatuses. We shall go straight to essentials. In our capitalist societies, what distinguishes the ideological state apparatuses from the repressive state apparatus is the following difference. Whereas the repressive state apparatus is by definition a repressive apparatus that makes direct or indirect use of physical violence, the ideological state apparatuses cannot be called repressive in the same sense as the state apparatus because they do not, by definition, use physical violence. Neither the church nor the school nor political parties nor the press nor radio and television nor publishing nor entertainment nor sport have recourse to physical violence in order to function with their clientele. At any rate, the use of physical violence is not manifest or dominant in them. It is of our own free will that we go to church 12 or school, although school is mandatory, join a political party and obey it, buy a newspaper, switch on the TV, go to a cinema or a stadium, buy and consume records, paintings or posters, and literary, historical, political, religious, or scientific works. This is to say that ideological state apparatuses are distinguished from the state apparatus in that they function, not on violence but on ideology. We have already uttered this sentence in discussing the way law functions on legal moral ideology. We know what that means. These apparatuses apparently function all by themselves without recourse to violence. In fact, they function thanks to means other than violence, namely, on ideology or, rather, ideologization. With that, we have very clearly marked the distinction that sets the state apparatus apart from the ideological state apparatuses. It remains to explain why we consider it imperative to use the apparently enigmatic term state apparatuses to designate these institutions and activities: churches, schools, the political system, radio and TV, the theatre, the press, publications, and so on. Why state apparatus? And why this plural, state apparatuses? Our affirmation becomes still more enigmatic when we take the trouble to note, and it is in our interest, to note this ourselves, for, if we do not, others will not fail to take issue with us, that if some of these institutions are now state institutions, in our country, the school, certain theatres, radio and television, not all of them are. The church, in our country, is officially separate from the state, as are some schools, and so on the press, political parties, trade unions and other associations. The vast majority of cultural institutions and activities, entertainment, sport, publications, the arts, are free, that is, part of the private sector, not the state sector. Better, in certain capitalist countries, a large proportion of the schools, for example, 2/3 of higher education in the USA, and even radio and television, in the USA and Great Britain, belong, or can belong, to the private sector. By what right, then, do we say that these institutions or activities fall into the category of ideological state apparatuses? For public and private institutions, we have to clear away the following objection: by what right do we list private institutions such as those that belong to the religious apparatus, political apparatus, cultural apparatus, and so on, among ideological state apparatuses? This objection is in fact based on a distinction drawn in bourgeois law, the distinction between public and private. This distinction concerns only the status, that is, the definition, of the legal persons who hold formal title to this or that institution. Such persons can be individual private legal persons, Mr. Gallimard, or collective private legal persons, the Dominican Order. Collective state legal persons, our state educational system, and so on. The legal grounds for personhood are legal grounds. Since law is universal and formal, we already know that it abstracts, by its nature, from the content of which it is the form. But since it is precisely that content that matters to us here, the objection based on the private/public distinction is trivial. Our point is that the legal objection that might be raised against us is not germane. Our subject is not law, but something quite different at the limit of the class struggle and class relations. Law is perfectly incapable of encompassing, even if it sanctions certain of its formal aspects, since that is its function, which, that to put this in a way Marxists will understand. Even certain non-Marxists know this, since they sometimes find themselves saying it. Marxists are well aware that the state itself, despite all the articles of constitutional law defining it, it is exempt from the civil code, and that is no accident. Is always the state of the dominant class. It is not that the state is the dominant class's property in the legal sense, inasmuch as class does not yet figure, as far as I know, among the legal personalities recognized by law, although they are numerous. It is quite simply because the state is its state, the bourgeoisie's state, in the sense that the bourgeoisie holds state power and exercises it by way of the repressive state apparatus and ideological state apparatuses. Let us take another example which, this time, will not admit the least objection. The papers that are legally owned by Mr. Provost, 14, like the peripheral radio and television channels that are owned by Mr. Sylvan Floret and others and come under 15, the private sector, and are therefore part of the civil code, have a right to exercise their imaginations a bit. This credits the notion that they are free and independent. But everyone is aware that they know perfectly well how to owe the bourgeois state's political line when they have to, that is to say, day in, day out, and with great fanfare on the big days, and to disseminate, in variants suited to their respective audiences, the grand themes of the bourgeois state's never-ending ideological litany, the grand themes of the state ideology. Thus the private/public distinction cannot call our thesis about the ideological state apparatuses into question. All the private institutions we have mentioned, whether owned by this or that individual or the state, function willy-nilly as component parts of determinate ideological state apparatuses, under the state ideology, in the service of the state's politics, the politics of the dominant class. They do so in the form specific to them, that of apparatuses that function primarily on ideology, not on repression, like the repressive state apparatus. That ideology is, as I have said, the state ideology itself. I mention, for good measure, one last argument, which completely invalidates the legalistic objection that might be raised against our concept of ideological state apparatuses. The legalistic argument applies, at best, to institutions. But as we have said, and repeat here, an institution is not an ideological state apparatus. What constitutes an ideological state apparatus is a complex system that encompasses and combines several institutions and organizations, as well as their practices. Whether they are all public or all private, or whether some are public and others private, is a secondary detail, because what interests us here is the system they form. This system, its existence, and its nature owe nothing to law. They are indebted to the altogether different reality that we have called the state ideology, the ideological state apparatuses and the ideological byproducts of their practices. Precisely because we are foregrounding ideology, we have to draw a distinction of great importance. May we make a personal confession here? For years, we were baffled by a very brief hint of Stalin's that practically came down to saying, ideology and the institutions corresponding to it. What in the world did that mean? Was it not an astonishing slip and, what is more, an idealist slip, to grant that institutions could, in a list, follow their ideology? 16. That ideology could, in some sense, produce institutions, when a right-thinking materialist should, putting the horse before the cart, have talked first about the institutions, and then, only afterwards, because determined in the sense of derived, about the ideology corresponding to them? For do we not in fact daily see the institutions we know? The church, the schools, the political parties, and so on, producing, precisely, the ideology that corresponds to them, because they need it? Does a Sunday gardener not produce on his little fenced-off plot of land the vegetables and flowers that his wife needs? I'm afraid that, on this point at least, I will have to show a little personal gratitude to Stalin for his hint, 17, which I cite from memory. For, in order to grasp the new concept that we are proposing, ideological state apparatuses, it is necessary to grant the paradoxical fact that institutions do not produce the ideologies corresponding to them. Rather, certain elements of an ideology, the state ideology, are realized in, or exist in, the corresponding institutions and their practices. Let there be no mistake. We do not deny that the institutions in question produce, internally and in their practices, certain forms of ideology that would be inexplicable without references to those practices. Thus we shall say that religious practice produces, inside the church, certain forms of ideology, ecclesiastical ideology, for example. But there are other ideologies in the church, to stick with that example, these days, it 18 the letter is teeming with them. Consider Isolotto, 19 by the 360 French priests, Father Cardinal's Lenten 2021 sermon, Frères du Monde and, lest we forget, 22 Esprit, which long ago had its avant-garde moment. Consider all the extraordinary developments in the religious ideology of certain groups among the lower clergy and even a few members of the high clergy in some Latin American countries, to say nothing of Father 23 who died fighting with the guerrillas Torres. Thus we shall say that scholastic practice produces particular forms that may be termed scholastic ideology, the ideology of elementary school teachers, realize 24 in the publications and initiatives of the SNI, or of teachers in secondary schools and higher education, and so on, and many other forms that we cannot, for material reasons, discuss here. We shall do so 25 elsewhere. For example, political parties too, produce forms of internal ideology. There is no need to draw the reader a picture, since we have already mentioned Stalin. Let us simply note that the ideology of a certain practice of the USSR's political leadership became manifest, at a certain point in the country's history, in what is called the personality cult, a purely, discretely, descriptive term, as if a personality could by itself produce the ideology of its cult, and so on. We could go on indefinitely, discussing entertainment, sport, news, publishing, and so on. That would be fascinating. The examples already adduced, however, are enough to make our thesis clear. We must now state it, not negatively, but positively. We shall therefore say that a distinction must be made here. We must distinguish between, on the one hand, the determinate elements of the state ideology that are realized in, and exist in, a determinate apparatus and its practices, and, on the other, the ideology that is produced in this apparatus by its practices. To mark this distinction terminologically, we shall call the former ideology the primary ideology and the latter, a byproduct of the practice in which the primary ideology is realized, the secondary, subordinate ideology. Let us note another important point. We shall say that this secondary ideology is produced by the practice of the apparatus that realizes the primary ideology. But that is just a convenient way of putting it, for no practice in the world produces its ideology all by itself. There is no spontaneous ideology, although it can be useful, in other words, terminologically convenient when making a specific point, to use the expression spontaneous ideology. In the case to hand, these secondary ideologies are produced by a conjunction of complex causes. Among them are, alongside the practice in question, the effect of other, external ideologies, other external practices and, in the final instance, the effects however veiled, of the class struggle, even its remote effects, which are in fact very close. No one will presume to deny it if he pays a little attention to what has been going on for a while now in the ideology of certain religious circles, in and around schools, from May on, and in families, since May. Thus, institutions, the church, the schools, and so on, are, and, on top of that, what the secondary ideological subformations secreted by the practices of these institutions are, we have to set out from the ideological formations deriving from the state ideology and realized in those institutions and their practices. For it is these ideological formations which provide us with the key to both the institutions in question and their practices, and also some of the causes that produce the ideological subformations that we see emerging in those practices. Doubtless none of this is very easy to envisage in the immediate notions offered us by the self-evident 26 truths, in which we live, since we live in ideology, even if we also have a few scientific concepts in our heads. But we have to think it. We want to understand what the initial form of the thought that occurs to us will of course be couched in terms of the famous common sense schemes that Hegel already dismissed as drivel, the interaction schemes. Someone will say, straining to make a big concession in the first part of his statement, true, the primary ideological formations, religious ideological formations, and so on, are realized in institutions. But he will add, since there is action and reaction everywhere in the world, institutions produce the secondary ideology that we observe in them by reacting back on the primary formations. It is with fustian of this sort that we make our peace with the dialectical. The reader will not be surprised to learn that, inasmuch as action and reaction are the night in which all cows are grey because they effectively mean that everything is in everything and the other way around, we shall be sending our grey cows back into their night, we think. On the contrary, that it is necessary to keep a firm grip on the first part of the statement. Primary ideological formations are realized in institutions while temporarily leaving aside an element, that is, while abstracting from an element, as Marx does in order to carry out his scientific analyses. In capital, that can only confuse everything, since it is secondary, subordinate, and derivative, namely, the internal ideological formations that we have identified as byproducts. We shall say that a church is, qua institution, a realization of religious ideology. We shall say that a school, or educational system, is a realization of ideology. What kind of ideology? Let us leave the question in abeyance. We shall say that a political party is a realization of a political ideology, and so on. The same goes for all the institutions we have listed, but beware, a church, a school, a party do not each constitute one ideological state apparatus. Rather, each forms a component part of different systems, which we term ideological state apparatuses, the religious system, scholastic system, political system, and so on. We shall add, at the risk of repeating ourselves, the ideological formations that we can correlate with the practices at work in these institutions are not the product of the primary ideologies realized in these institutions, but byproducts of that ideology, insofar as they are the products of practices at work in those institutions. It is perfectly plain that there also exist direct relations between the primary ideological formations, which are external to the institutions, and the secondary ideological subformations internal to them. However, these relations cannot be conceived in terms of action and reaction for the good reason that these relations do not always exist, and, when they do, are realized in accordance with laws altogether different from the so-called dialectical laws of interaction. To put it very precisely, they are realized as a result of the intervention of another reality that we have not yet been able to discuss, because it is unfortunately impossible to say everything at once. We can, anticipating, call this reality by its name, the class struggle and its ideological effects provisionally, then, we shall content ourselves with our thesis, because we want to proceed in proper order, the ideological state apparatuses of the realization, the existence, of the ideological formations dominating them. 6. The double functioning of the state apparatuses and concerted action. Since I'll just introduced the clarification functioning primarily on a word of explanation is in order. It will account for the use of the common term apparatus in two different expressions, repressive state apparatus, ideological state apparatus. Think can claim that all state apparatuses, repressive and ideological alike, function simultaneously on repression and on ideology, but with one very important distinction that precludes confusing the repressive apparatus with the ideological state apparatuses. The repressive state apparatus, for its part, functions in overwhelmingly preponderant fashion on repression, at the limit, direct physical repression, while functioning secondarily on ideology. The army and police, for instance, internally, they train their own recruits both by repression and ideological inculcation. Externally, they act by violent repression, but also by discussion and persuasion. The latter watchwords appear black on white in the circulars issued by police chiefs and army generals possessed of a modicum of good sense. In May 1968, Mr. Grimaud, the Paris police chief, conducted discussions, in person with the wild ones, during the battles in the Place Morbid. The army and police also operate with the help of their own ideological aura, in the army and learn a Trudel, and the prestige of their uniforms, join the riot police and you'll stand guard over the Beachesel, and so on. Similarly, we may say, but the other way around, that the ideological state apparatuses, for their part, function in overwhelmingly preponderant fashion on ideology, while functioning secondarily on repression. Even if it is, at the limit but only at the limit, quite attenuated and more or less symbolic. Let us give a few examples of this secondary repressive functioning of apparatuses that function in overwhelmingly preponderant fashion on ideology: the school and the church, to take only those two examples. Train not just their officiants, teachers and priests, but also their wards, school children, the faithful, and so on, with the appropriate methods of punishment, once exclusively and often still physical, and also, of course, moral expulsion, selection, and so on. News and information, publishing, and entertainment carry out, with or, much more subtly, without the backing of the law, daily censorship, which is unremitting and extremely vigilant, since this censorship lodges itself in advance in the heads of authors who take the precaution of censoring themselves, in the name, of course, of their professional conscience, and decency, or the proper behavior, that one owes the fatherland, the dead, and families living aside virtue, which has lost a bit of its luster these days, since intellectual freedom has to be lodged somewhere. For instance, in 2-bit eroticism. I do not think I need to multiply illustrations for the reader to understand, from the ones just adduced, that very subtle combinations of repression and ideologization, explicit or tacit, are forged in and among all the state apparatuses, whether they are primarily repressive or primarily ideological, and that these very subtle combinations would allow us, if we succeeded in analyzing their mechanisms, to account for the manifest pacts and unambiguous, or even ambiguous, objective forms of complicity that are forged among the various state apparatuses, not only on major occasions, when the bourgeois state is threatened by open working class struggle, but every single day of our humdrum lives a little police or a little army on the move here, a little UNR or CDR 27 there, a little Paulville or Archbishop Marty in their sector, a little François in its, a little or a lot of de Gaulle, Kauv, Far, 28 Cardinal Danila on the radio, a little Grand Rabbi on Israel, a little Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber on the American Challenge, a little Louis Armand on Tilhood 29 Bacharlin, a little sign for the Club Met on the back of the bus, publicist posters of naked young mothers or tomato juice on all the walls, inspired articles or works by our great ideologues, living or dead, in Le Figaro and 30 the obligatory sermons on literature, the bookshops, humanism, and our Lord in the universities and the churches alike in the domain of ideologization. All this constitutes the multiform arsenal of a power whose center is and remains the state, that is to say, the bourgeois, holders of state power, who exercise their class power through the various specialized apparatuses with which the state is endowed. 7. Fragility and solidity of the ideological state apparatuses. Let us take the example of contemporary France. The state, under the class leadership of the representatives of French imperialism. France is great, France is beautiful, France is generous. 131 who hold state power in France and are in command of its apparatuses, executes their class politics by means of those apparatuses, repressive and ideological. The apparatuses conscientiously do their daily duty. They constantly lend one another a hand, in an overtly and tacitly concerted operation, and in the forms required by the ticklishness or brutality of the situation. That this does not take place without contradictions, and that, in particular, the ideological subformations produced in the apparatuses by their own practice should sometimes make the gears grate and grind. 52 is inevitable. It would even appear that the police hesitated at a certain point in May, and that people in high places did not have much confidence in how the troops would have acted had it become necessary to call on their services. Everyone knows that, because protest is infectious, some priests and even some teachers are balking, now that their pupils, those little devils, who, my God, but why, no longer have any respect for authority and are no longer inclined to take the moon for green cheese, to the utter dismay of the most respectable associations of parents of 33 school children, a component part of a redoubtable ideological state apparatus. But, somehow or other, when an ideological state apparatus such as the school or family is ailing, the others, thank the Lord, manage to hold out for a while, and, with de Gaulle's help, and if the dominant ideology is still functioning properly among broad sectors of the population, the bourgeois state manages to hold up, and its various apparatuses do too. For how long, that is another story, until state power and the state apparatus themselves are taken by storm in what is known as a revolution. But, precisely, since we have just invoked revolution, we can spell out what we meant by grating in the ISAS. We may say that the stuff of which the ISAS are made is such, and that they function in such a way, that we must consider them to be relatively fragile apparatuses, given the shocks of the class struggle which affect them through the ideological subformations anchored in certain aspects of their practices. In this they differ from the repressive apparatus, made of completely different stuff that is much harder to put a dent in. Rather, we should say that the ISAS are apparently fragile apparatuses. For we have to say, at the same time, that they are extraordinarily strong and tough. It is enough to read the texts that Lenin wrote in the last years of his life in order to see how profoundly he was haunted by this problem after the victory of the revolution. The repressive apparatus of the feudal capitalist state, army, police, had basically been destroyed. This did not hold for the administration, yet that was not Lenin's essential concern. His essential, anguished concern was, above all, with the proletarian state ideological state apparatuses, its political apparatus, the party, the Soviets, the number one problem being their connections to the masses, their capacity to control the state administrative apparatus and root out its bureaucratic tendency. Its trade union apparatus, here too, the number one problem was, what should a trade union be? A non-coercive apparatus, a school of communism, that could reliably ensure, via a series of transmission belts, the right connection to the masses. Finally, its scholastic apparatus, which was, for Lenin, the problem of problems, for he knew that the scholastic ISA is determinant, since it has the future in its power, the younger generations. What conclusion should we draw from this tragic concern of Lenin's after the seizure of state power and the destruction of the better part of the bourgeois repressive state apparatus? The conclusion that follows: it is not enough to destroy the repressive apparatus. It is also necessary to destroy and replace the ideological state apparatuses. New ones have to be put in place, urgently. Otherwise, Lenin was right, the very future of the revolution will be jeopardized. For it is extremely hard to replace the old ISAS, in this case, the Russian bourgeois ISAS, and it takes a long time. A long time is needed, for example, truly to establish a whole new proletarian political, trade union, and school system. One must first know exactly what to put in 34 place, what new systems to invent, and how to put them in place. The right line must be found for each of these systems, down to the details. Finally, competent personnel loyal to the revolution have to be trained to apply the new, revolutionary politics in each new ISA, in short, to imbue the practice and consciousness of all Soviet citizens with a new state ideology, proletarian ideology. If one does not succeed in this, and, a fortiori, if one does not make a serious, thoroughgoing attempt, with no concessions, to come to grips with this crucial problem, what happen? The old bourgeois ISAS remain in place, wholly or partially, or they are hardly undermined. If the old personnel remains in place, whatever one does and whatever one claims, the old model ISAS, either intact or half reformed, pursue their old work in new institutional forms. The proletarian ideology of the proletarian state is not realized. That is, the masses are not imbued with proletarian ideology, and the gigantic school of communism that the new ISAS should represent does not go into operation. Instead, what remains of the old ISAS in fact continues to imbue the masses with the old bourgeois or petty bourgeois ideology, even alongside new elements that clash with that ideology, elements that it is their mission to include in this matter. Lenin, who abhorred decrees, was perfectly well aware that things could not be settled by decree or from on high. He also knew that there existed no prefabricated, ready-made, a priori plan or line for establishing these new ISAS. He knew that it was a task that had to be worked on every minute. Better, that it was a long experimentation involving huge risks, to which all available resources of intelligence, imagination and political dedication had to be committed, a long struggle that would brook no weakness or failure, a struggle that could not be waged simply by dint of coercive administrative measures, but that called for detailed knowledge, for education and persuasion, as well as explanation, constant explanation, a struggle that could not be carried out by a handful of militants, however lucid and courageous, but that depended on appeals to the masses, to their judgment and their reactions, their initiatives and inventions. If this struggle is not won, it can certainly not be won in the space of a few months or even a few years, and, fortiori, if it is not truly, seriously begun, on the right political mass basis, the future of the construction of socialism may encounter forbidding obstacles and may even be compromised if, instead of functioning ever more clearly on proletarian state ideology, the new proletarian ideological state apparatuses continue to function, by some mischance, on the old bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideology or a questionable mix of the old and new ideologies. If the old ideology is not rooted out, who can prove to us that the old ideology will not, even under the official facade of socialist state institutions, formally and officially socialist, survive, reproduce itself, and spawn a terribly dangerous effect, insinuating itself for good and or into one or another weak spot in the relations of production or the political relations of the socialist state? What becomes of the Soviets in that event? What becomes of the trade union? What becomes of the proletarian school system? When Lenin made such frequent reference, couched in the terms of a dramatic, solemn warning, to the danger of capitalist survivals in a socialist regime, to the terrible onus of tradition and, in particular, of petty bourgeois ideology, he plainly had in mind the reproduction of capitalist relations of production, owing to the survival and re-emergence of petty production, but he was surely also thinking of these questions, which haunted him, and which he hoped would find a temporary solution in the proper functioning of the workers' and peasants' inspectorate, the questions of ideology, whose fate in the new proletarian state's new ideological state apparatuses was still far from settled. Lenin died before he could see to settling these decisive questions. He handed them down to his successor, Stalin. Did Stalin settle them? Where are the Soviets, the trade unions, and the proletarian school system today, after Stalin, in the USSR? If Stalin neglected these questions, as a number of effects give us reason to believe he did, precisely the effects of the personality cult, have they been seriously and thoroughly re-examined since? To spell out our preoccupation, is it not, to a great extent, the fact that these questions were not settled or were only half settled which explains the principles now commanding Soviet politics, its difficulties, the problems it is having with the reform of planning and even some of its otherwise incomprehensible impasses and initiatives, such as the military intervention in Czechoslovakia? 8. Summary. To close this long analysis, let us try to summarize our results. We can now put the essential elements of the state in place. The number one question when it comes to the state is the question of the possession of state power. The whole political class struggle revolves around this question in a class social formation. Possession of state power is always possession of state power by a social class or an alliance of social classes, the exploiting class or classes, the proletarian class in the transitional phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat that should lead to socialism. A social formation dominated by a mode of production without classes. With possession of state power comes power over the state apparatuses, which constitute the very nature of the state. The state apparatus comprises two types of apparatuses. 1. The repressive state apparatus, the government, administration, army, police, and specialized repressive corps, gendarmerie, courts, judiciary, prisons, and so on. This apparatus is a single, centralized core. Point 2. The ideological state apparatuses, in our social formations, scholastic, religious, familial, political, associative, cultural, the news and information apparatus, and so on. These apparatuses are multiple, relatively independent, and unified as a distinct system by all or part of the state ideology. The repressive state apparatus functions primarily on repression, physical or not. The ideological state apparatuses function primarily on ideology. The overall unity of the system formed by all the state apparatuses is ensured by the unity of the class politics of the class holding state power and by the state ideology corresponding to the fundamental interests of the class, or classes, in power. The object of the politics of the class in power and of the state ideology, dominant ideology of the dominant class, is to guarantee the conditions for the exploitation of the exploited classes by the dominant classes, above all the reproduction of the relations of production in which this exploitation takes place, since these relations of production are the relations of exploitation of the class social formation under consideration. Thus everything is clearly based on the infrastructure of the relations of production, that is, the relations of class exploitation. The base or infrastructure of the class state is thus well and truly, as Lenin said, exploitation. The effect produced by the superstructure is simultaneously to ensure the conditions under which this exploitation is carried out, repressive state apparatus, and the reproduction of the relations of production, that is, of exploitation, ideological state apparatuses. There can be no question of examining the functioning of the individual ideological state apparatuses in an essay whose sole aim is to establish that they exist and to indicate their function. Indeed, each ideological state apparatus, if its mechanisms are to be fully clarified, merits detailed, thoroughgoing analysis. We shall soon provide a first example with an analysis of the capitalist scholastic apparatus. What matters to us here is, first of all, to understand how ideology brings off the feat of making things and people go all by themselves. However, before we can get to that point, that is, before we can sketch a theory of the functioning of ideology in general, it is imperative, to avoid all misunderstanding, that we make a few remarks about what we call, using a term that may surprise readers, especially Marxist readers, the political and associative ideological state apparatuses. 1. TN, a Paris underground station. 12. Let us therefore say that we, apparently, pursue our educations, beyond the mandatory period of our own free will. 13. 19. TN, a 1960s Republic, created by an alliance of Gaullists and the mother. Not every father and mother considers themselves, thank God, the parent of a business is settled in the privacy of the family. Brief remarks on the political and associative ideological state apparatuses of the French capitalist social formation. 1. It is indeed imperative that we insert a few remarks here to enable readers to understand our concepts and perceive their theoretical and political utility, which is possible only if all misunderstanding is avoided. 2. Misunderstandings complicate, from the outset, the extension of the concept ISA to the world of politics and the world of the unions. Indeed, as the present remarks will show us, they complicate any utilization of the concept of the ISA. Our aim here is to eliminate these two misunderstandings from the very beginning of our discussion. I shall go straight to the heart of what will inevitably pose an apparent problem for all readers, classifying organizations of the proletarian political class struggle, the party, or economic class struggle, the trade union, under the rubric of ISAS of the bourgeois state. To make this only apparent problem disappear, we have to spell out 2.1. A proletarian political party and a proletarian trade union have indeed figured among the ISAS of the French social formation since the 1920s, although they were outlawed for a certain period, under Pétain, and have managed to survive only at the price of constant repressive measures, the condemnation and imprisonment of communist leaders at various times between 1921 and 1939. The Rif War. And again in 1929, for example. They are officially registered as organizations, have been recognized, and enjoy the corresponding legal rights. They are component parts of the corresponding French ISAS. Their ideology, however, insofar as it is the proletarian ideology of class struggle, cannot be considered to be a realization of the bourgeois state ideology that is realized in the ISAS of which the party and trade union are component parts. It is, in its very principle, radically opposed to the bourgeois state ideology. Hence the paradox: how can a component part of the system of an ISA figure in the system of a bourgeois ISA, while being the realization of an ideology of proletarian class struggle? The answer is simple. It has to do, not with the logic of the system of the corresponding ISAS, but, rather, with the logic of the long class struggle that imposed legal recognition of the party and the proletarian class struggle trade union as well as their inscription in the ISAS in question. It was as organizations of proletarian class struggle that these organizations, by dint of their struggle in the history of the French social formation, imposed this recognition and this inscription, hence by force. It is by dint of class struggle that they are able to preserve their proletarian class ideology in the ISAS in question. Thus the proletarian party and trade union have a place in these ISAS. Legally, they are part of them, and legally, they should enjoy all the rights that accrue to them as a result of their recognition and inscription in them. In actual fact, they are constantly treated as the object of special measures in them. In the parliament, communist votes are not taken into account. The Communist Party is declared to be the party of a foreign country or a separatist party and is walled off in a political class ghetto, in the apparatus itself. The same tactic is applied to the proletarian trade union, except when there is no other choice, it is refused. Advantages granted to the others, and negotiations are conducted with the others. There is an antagonistic contradiction here that the bourgeoisie is in principle incapable of assimilating. If it has consented to the compromise, it is because it could not do otherwise. There we have an effect of the development of the class struggle. Formally speaking, there is no contradiction in saying that one of the component parts of a system, while figuring in the system, does not radically compromise the nature of the system. Proletarian ideology has not conquered the system of the political or the associative ISA. On the contrary, bourgeois state ideology continues to dominate them. It is clear that this creates, under certain circumstances, problems for the functioning of the bourgeois political and associative ISAS. The bourgeoisie disposes, however, of a whole series of tried and tested techniques for meeting this danger. We shall see which ones point to the products of a class struggle external to the ISAS under consideration. The proletarian party and trade union waged their class struggle within the limits of the ISAS and, obviously, their legal forms. Great dangers obviously threaten this delicate practice of the class struggle by proletarian organizations in bourgeois ISAS. They can be collectively summed up as the danger of lapsing into class collaboration, parliamentary cretinism, for the party and economism for the trade union, both of which are forms of reformism. We shall come back to this. However that may be, the class struggle that has imposed the presence of the proletarian party and trade union in the corresponding ISAS infinitely exceeds the very limited struggle that they can conduct in these ISAS. Created by a class struggle external to the ISAS, sustained by it, charged with furthering and sustaining it by all available legal means, the proletarian organizations that figure in the ISAS concerned would betray their mission if they reduce the external class struggle, which merely finds a reflection in very limited forms in the class struggle carried out in the ISAS, to this class struggle internal to the ISAS. The Social Democratic Workers' parties are perfect examples of component parts of the bourgeois ISAS which allow themselves to be assimilated by both bourgeois state ideology and the rules of the political and associative game of these ISAS. These parties' ideology is merely a subproduct, for workers' consumption, of bourgeois ideology, petty bourgeois reformist ideology. Their politics is, at the price of the right to get worked up now and again or work their jaws, a politics of class collaboration. We can, then, understand Lenin's categorical warnings against the social democratic parties, or trade unions, reformist ideology and politics of class collaboration. Component parts of the ISAS in question. They let themselves be wholly integrated into them and assimilated by them. When their leaders are in power, that is, at the head of the government, bringing down a government must not be confused with taking state power. They conduct themselves, in Leon Blum's lovely phrase, as loyal managers of their capitalist regime which they have no desire really to overthrow, at least not in deeds, whatever their declarations. I am well aware that, in certain conjunctures, they can let themselves be dragged into doing more than they would really like, but, when that happens, they really cannot be blamed for it. It is no accident that the social democratic organizations are included with full rights in the bourgeois ISAS. From the bourgeoisie's standpoint, they take their places as full-fledged members of them, and are not confined to any political or trade union ghetto. More, they are the essential component part of the corresponding ISAS, and the bourgeoisie makes very able use of them to counter the very troublesome component part, represented by a proletarian party or trade union. The whole history of bourgeois politics for the last 80 years is based on this tactic of dividing the working class forces, at the level of politics and trade union organization alike. Thanks to this technique, the bourgeoisie effectively annuls the presence of proletarian organizations in its ISAS. 11. A few historical facts to bring out the full significance of the 2 points I have just very schematically developed. I propose to recall a few empirical facts that will help us grasp how and why proletarian class struggle organizations figure in bourgeois ISAS. To begin with, it is enough to consider what happens in social formations other than the French or Italian formation in order to understand that this result is unintelligible if the history of the class struggle specific to these countries is not taken into account. Let us first adduce 2 examples that simple comparison makes instructive. The bourgeois fascist regimes, whether in Europe or Latin America, to take only those 2 cases, created working class organizations that were wholly in their service, fully integrated component parts of the ISAS of the fascist state. In fascist Germany and fascist Italy as well as in Perón's Argentina, there existed labor fronts, or state trade union. Perón even came up with the following admirable phrase: the bourgeoisie should organize the working class, that is the best way to protect it against Marxism. The Franco regime's state trade unions exemplify this even today. The fact that, in these unions, things are not going for the best for Franco's politics is assuredly not the fault of the state ideology or the minister in charge of the state workers, or students' unions. Another example, in a number of capitalist countries, proletarian class struggle organizations are quite simply banned. The balance of power in the class struggle, especially in certain Asian, African and Latin American countries directly or indirectly controlled by US imperialism, has not been able to impose recognition of these organizations. One final example, in a number of capitalist countries, workers' organizations are very well integrated into the system of the capitalist ISAS. For instance, in the Scandinavian countries, ruled by socialists, or in England. The course of the class struggle in England has culminated in the victory of a reformist line, trade unionist in the unions, labourite in the Labour Party. There is, of course, unrest among the rank and file, but, for the moment, the trade union and Labour Party 3 leadership still basically work hand in hand. The result is that the trade unions and the Labour Party are indeed perfectly integrated component parts of the system of the political and associative ISAS of the capitalist imperialist English state. Is there any need to make the demonstration for the American trade unions or the German trade unions and German Social Democratic Party? It is sometimes even the case that reformist political and trade union organizations are capitalist economic powers, as in England, the USA and Germany. How does it happen, then, that the situation is different in France? How does it happen that the French bourgeoisie has had to resign itself to recognizing, without being able to neutralize, organizations that the bourgeoisie in other countries and other circumstances has either succeeded in organizing by taking over their leadership itself, or in banning, or in purely and simply subordinating to itself and assimilating? The answer lies in the history of the French class struggle. The history of the French bourgeoisie is dominated by a great event that it botched the French Revolution from the bourgeois point of view. This was truly a dirty revolution. In a clean revolution, as in England, for example, things would have been the object of a gentleman's agreement between the leading classes, feudal aristocratic and bourgeois industrial mercantile. Unfortunately, thanks to the stupidity of a bankrupt rural petty aristocracy which, in the 1780s, had the bad taste to demand its feudal rights, at all costs in a day and age in which, consider Turgot, they were being quietly abolished land for other reasons as well. Of course, things took a nasty turn. The people made their entrance onto the scene and did not pull their punches. There were peasant uprisings in the countryside, where castles started going up in flames, and journeys revolutionaires, in the cities, especially Paris, where, very quickly, despite the night of August 4 and the Girondists, reformist politics, the most uncontrollable of the plebeians poured onto the streets of Paris, imposed their revolutionary committees, and brought Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety to power, among other things. The counter-revolutionary war, the fraternal feudal states rushed to the rescue of the king and queen who had, together with the émigrés, requested that they intervene, made the class war even harsher and more radical. For a time, the popular masses, patriotism and the revolution, reinforced by the measures of public safety that the bourgeoisie has labelled the terror, confronted that bourgeoisie with the threat of something altogether different from its revolution, sinister prospect in which a certain fourth estate, of sans-culottes poverty-stricken plebs, demanded a social, egalitarian republic from which mercantile and industrial capitalism had everything to fear. On the horizon were the pamphlets and speeches of Marat and other agitators and propagandists for equality. There was something in the air that found expression in the communism of a Babeuf and a Buonarroti, in forms that were still primitive, yet unmistakable. The French bourgeoisie has not forgotten the terror, the Commune filled it with the same terror, and it reacted with the same white terror. In both cases, it had to take emergency measures to put the popular masses back in their place, not in power, but at work, under its exploitation and domination. The stages in this process were Mida, then the Consulate, then Bonaparte and Napoleon. Bonapartism is a typically French solution to the problem represented by the style of the class struggles unleashed in France by this unfortunate revolution of 1789. It is the standard bourgeois solution for putting the popular masses back in their place when conflicts between the dominant classes have not been able to prevent their direct, armed intervention on the stage of the overt class struggle, or, worse, have made it necessary. It is no accident that the bourgeoisie has entrusted power to a providential Bonapartist figure whenever the division between the dominant classes and the intervention of the popular masses has put the bourgeois class's domination in jeopardy, after the 1789 revolution, to put the people in their place and establish the apparatuses of the bourgeois state, its superstructure, law, the civil code, and ideological state apparatuses, its universities no less than its chambers of commerce and so on, as well as the Comédie Française, to say nothing of the Concordat. After the terribly frightening alert constituted by the proletariat's June 1848 intervention on the barricades, in the wake of the two-fold crisis that divided the French bourgeoisie, the 1940 defeat and then the Algerian insurrection, Napoleon I, Napoleon 111 and de Gaulle are the price that the French bourgeoisie had or still has to pay for the history of its own class struggles, during which it has had to resign itself to the outpouring of plebs and then the proletariat into the streets, in order to achieve its own objectives. It was not enough that the bourgeoisie diverted the results of popular struggles to its own exclusive advantage. It also made the popular masses pay a very high price in blood, the White Terror, the 1848 massacres, and in the mass arrests, condemnations and deportations of December 2nd, for contributing to its own class struggles. Bonapartism and ferocious repression have been its solutions. It is the French bourgeoisie's misfortune that the plebeians and, very soon, the proletariat were steeled in the struggles of the journey's revolutionaires, learning the art of building barricades and fighting the army on them, and that the bourgeoisie was in some sense forced by its own history to educate the popular masses. And the proletariat, which saw that it could one day take up arms and fight on its own behalf, as a famous phrase has it, the emancipation of the working class must be the work of the working class itself. These words were inscribed in history by Marx and Engels. The manifesto was published in 1848. In 1864, the International was founded. The lesson was not lost on the French proletariat. There followed what is known as the Paris Commune. One of the disadvantages, for the bourgeoisie itself, of the Bonapartist solution is its instability. It always comes to a bad end. The reasons vary, the arbitrariness of personal power which ultimately becomes an encumbrance. The providential man really takes himself for France and, in the long run, can maintain his position only by staging military expeditions which, since they meet with the resistance of the peoples occupied as a result, ultimately take a bad turn, culminating in adventurous military operations, Spain, Mexico, and so on. Things took a very bad turn at Sedan. Against Prussia there occurred, after Sedan, an unprecedented event, one that left its stamp on human history, the history of socialism, but also the history of the class struggle as a whole, the Commune. While Mr. Thiers' big bourgeoisie was colluding with the Prussian occupiers in Versailles, the Parisian proletariat assumed the leadership of the patriotic resistance, resting, for the first time in history, the cause of the defense of the nation away from the bourgeoisie. For class reasons, this sudden turnabout led to the first attempt to make a socialist revolution in human history, that reckless, unheard of, desperate, but formidable experiment in which the working class and popular masses invented what theory had only had a presentiment of, the destruction of the state and its apparatuses. That experiment that left its mark on Marx and Lenin, and is still being invoked at the other end of the world. In China everyone knows how the French bourgeoisie, relying on the Prussian occupier, put the people back in their place, up against the walls, where tens of thousands of men and women were killed in broad daylight, before the people were sent back their posts in production, in exploitation. I shall cut this short in order to say that the lesson of all these class struggles, which were exemplary, Engels, not for the bourgeoisie, but for the proletariat and the French people, was such that the bourgeoisie had to recognize the political and trade union organizations of the proletarian class struggle, once they had succeeded, despite tremendous difficulties and unheard of sacrifices, in imposing themselves. The bourgeoisie, taken at its word, not only the one it had uttered in the course of the struggles of its 18th century ideologues and writers, but also that of its democratic tradition, liberty, equality, fraternity, tripped up the fact that the working masses had offered it support that it had not disdained in 1830, nor in February 1848, nor in the ultimate paroxysms of its class struggle against the aristocracy, for instance, its late 19th century struggle against the church, in short, taken by the throat by the power of the popular and then proletarian class struggle. The bourgeoisie opted to recognize the political and trade union organizations of proletarian class struggle in its ISAS. It did so in the hope of defeating them there, getting the better of them, perverting them, if need be, or neutralizing them by pitting the social democratic organizations against them, that is certain. But, reason or ruse, impotence or finesse, the facts are the facts that the same does not hold for other countries is, in the final analysis, a question of the balance of power in a historical class struggle. What I have just said about this question in France shows, at any rate, the true nature of the class struggle. It can unfold, in the forms prescribed by the law prevailing in the ISAS under consideration, only as a simple effect, a simple relay of an altogether different class struggle, which infinitely exceeds all the legal forms in which it may also manage to find expression. 1. Tn, the French. Noun syndicate and the corresponding adjective syndical are used of both trade unions and a wide variety of organized interest groups, including professional and employers' associations, a key point in the argument of the present and the following chapter. However, as Althusser points out in Chapter 8, the word syndicate makes everyone think first of trade unions. Accordingly, syndical is here translated as associative or trade union, depending on the context. Tn, the specific reference of the party, and the trade union, are the French Communist Party. The political and associative ideological state apparatus is one unnecessary preliminary remark. We here take up a question which is as important as it is hard to present properly, that is to say, without giving rise to the least misunderstanding. That is why we wish to repeat here, in the same terms, a solemn statement that we included in our preliminary remark to my readers. It is a question, in the political and associative ideological state apparatuses, of the class struggle. But beware, it is not a question of the whole class struggle, nor even of the terrain in which the class struggle has its roots. It is a question of a domain in which the class struggle assumes legal forms, the conquest of which was itself the result of a history of class struggle that was necessarily external to those legal forms. Once they are conquered, the class struggle is pursued in them within the more or less narrow limits that they impose and, in any case, within rigorously defined limits. At the same time, the class struggle unfolds, massively, outside these forms that the system of political and trade union forms which the dominant class has either taken control of in its class struggle, or has been forced reluctantly to concede as an effect of the conquests of the proletarian and popular class struggle, or, again, has incorporated into the dominant class's state apparatus as ideological state apparatuses, so that it is, above all, the state ideology that is realized in these apparatuses. All this can be effortlessly understood. But it can just as easily be understood that the class struggle that has imposed these apparatuses, around which and in which part of the class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat is unfolding today, profoundly marks certain of their component parts, conferring, in particular, an exceptional position, within these apparatuses, legal forms themselves, on certain institutions of proletarian class struggle. Examples are provided by the proletariat's organization of political class struggle and its organization of trade union class struggle. An exceptional position is an antagonistic position, for the bourgeoisie did not, after the tumultuous events that we shall discuss in a moment, recognize the existence of reformist and then revolutionary workers' parties with joy and gladness. The same holds a fortiori for its recognition of the existence of trade union organizations of the economic class struggle. The bourgeoisie knows that what is at stake, behind these organizations, legal forms of existence, goes infinitely beyond those legal forms themselves. It is given proof of this whenever a crisis that is at all serious brings into the broad light of day the reality that the legal existence of these organizations expresses but also obscures the fact that the class struggle is not confined, and for good reason, to this or that communist party's oppositional activity in parliament, or this or that trade union confederation's negotiations with the bosses or the government. The fact that an extremely violent class struggle is waged without let-up in every domain of the practice of production and also well beyond production, although it is silent and, observed from the outside, invisible, since it does not find sanction in existing legality. This exceptional position both reflects and betrays a position that is in principle antagonistic, except when the organizations in question lapse into class collaboration. We are thus confronted with the following paradox: within an ideological state apparatus such as the apparatus of the political system, there can exist a proletarian party, as is already the case in a number of countries, whose ideology is, albeit radically antagonistic to the state ideology, realized in the forms and practices of the ideological state apparatus in which that proletarian party figures. The fact remains that this antagonism unfolds in the very forms imposed by the state ideology, for example, bourgeois democracy, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie in the forms of a parliamentary or presidential democratic apparatus. This singularly complicates the proletarian party's task. However, as Lenin has shown, this complicated task is not therefore impossible, on the absolute condition that certain imperative conditions are met. The first of them is that the proletarian party should not sink into parliamentary cretinism, or bourgeois democratic cretinism, and, a fortiori, that it should not allow its ideology of proletarian class struggle to be sapped by the state ideology, the ideology of the dominant class. It must, rather, know how to make use of the political ideological state apparatus, including some of its forms and certain elements of its ideology, for example, certain democratic slogans, in order to foster, by way of elections and also from the high tribune of the bourgeois parliament, the development of the class struggle, which basically unfolds outside these legal, bourgeois democratic forms. The same holds a fortiori for workers' trade union activity. If things are very clear in this regard, we can set out on our analysis of the political and associative ideological state apparatuses to provide, straight away, a classic point of reference for my thesis. I shall refer to a well-known text of Lenin's, drawn from a speech he delivered On December 30, 1920, the trade unions, the present situation and Trotsky's mistakes, which one would do well to read in its entirety, and also supplement with a second text, a speech delivered shortly after the first, once again on the trade union. Lenin is here talking about trade unions under the dictatorship of the proletariat, and thus about their existence in the framework of the proletarian state, which is a state in a strong sense, under the control of the Bolsheviks and their allies and endowed with the repressive and ideological apparatuses characteristic of any state. Lenin declares, trade unions have an extremely important part to play at every step of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but what is their part? I'll find that it is a most unusual one, as soon as I delve into this question, which is one of the most fundamental theoretically. On the one hand, the trade unions, which take in all industrial workers, are an organization of the ruling, dominant, governing class, which has now set up a dictatorship and is exercising coercion through the state. But it is not a state organization, nor is it one designed for coercion, but for education. It is an organization designed to draw in and to train. It is, in fact, a school of administration, a school of economic management, a school of communism. It is a very unusual type of school, because there are no teachers or pupils. This is an extremely unusual combination of what has necessarily come down to us from capitalism, and what comes from the ranks of the advanced revolutionary detachments, which you might call the revolutionary vanguard of the proletariat. A few pages later, Lenin adds these remarkable statements: Comrade Trotsky falls into error himself. He seems to say that in a workers' state it is not the business of the trade unions to stand up for the material and spiritual interests of the working class. We now have a state under which it is the business of the massively organized proletariat to protect itself. Why we, for our part, must use these workers' organizations to protect the workers from their state, and to get them to protect our state. Let us single out Lenin's central statement here. He says, in so many words, that the trade unions are an organization of the ruling, dominant, governing class, which has now set up a dictatorship and is exercising coercion through the state. But, he goes on, the Soviet trade union is not a state organization, nor is it one designed for coercion. It is, in fact, a school. When we look between the lines of a text about the trade unions of the proletarian state for an answer to the question about the status trade union organizations, we shall see which ones can have under the bourgeois state. It appears that Lenin's formulation almost exactly coincides with our own, inasmuch as it distinguishes the state's coercive action from Soviet trade unions' non-coercive action. For Lenin, proletarian unions have an ideological educational mission. They are to act as a school of communism, keeping things in proportion, that is, paying due attention to the obvious differences between proletarian and bourgeois ideological state apparatuses, and with the aforementioned reservations, we may regard the trade union and associative system as an ideological state apparatus, and discuss the political system in terms of the same concept. 11. The political ideological state apparatus. We shall begin with the political ideological state apparatus, for reasons that will appear: the communist parties and the political ideological state apparatus. Democracy for the people and socialist revolution. Of course, this does not at all mean that a political party such as the Communist Party, because of its topographical inscription in the system of the political ideological state apparatus, is necessarily reduced to the role of fulfilling the bourgeois state's wishes, or to the role of His Majesty's opposition. The latter role is played to perfection, with all the requisite tact, by the loyal managers of the capitalist system, known as the social democratic parties. They did not need to hear Leon Blum's marvelous phrase to understand that they had a vocation on course. The human scale I6, this famous human scale, does indeed offer a sizable advantage. It allows those who scale its rungs, that is, progressively attain the bourgeois honors, or even the honors of the nobility. Mr. Attlee was well and truly elevated to the dignified rank of Lord by Her Most Gracious English Majesty. Quite simply to rise above the small-minded class struggle standpoint in order to practice, in all serenity, proper class collaboration. Consider Mr. Wilson today. Lenin struggled hard enough, using vehement language ruthless enough, against the people who, even in the communists' ranks, might be tempted by these mirages. That is, the impossible miracles of purely parliamentary democratic activity, parliamentary cretinism, to dispel all conceivable ambiguity. Since, today, everyone is thinking about the transition to socialism, it must be recalled that there is no parliamentary road to socialism. Revolutions are made by the masses, not by parliamentary deputies. Even if the communists and their allies should fleetingly, by some miracle, attain a majority in the parliament, for the bourgeois state will never consent to be seized and destroyed, for it is a question of seizing the state, not of bringing down the government, or simply changing the regime by 450 parliamentary deputies armed with nothing but their bare hands, even if they come marching out of the Palais Bourbon sporting their tricolored sashes. It will never consent, that is, to be seized and destroyed by a simple parliamentary majority, except in some unprecedented situation conceivable, perhaps, once socialism has triumphed over 5/6 of the globe. In the present state of things, it is literally unimaginable. In the short or even the middle term, for the bourgeois state is something altogether different from the mere government. The state disposes of many ideological apparatuses besides its political ideological apparatus, in which the government has its place, which is, after all, just one apparatus among a multitude of others: the church, the schools, news and information, and so on. Furthermore, it has the day-to-day repressive apparatus at its beck and call: the police, specialized repressive units, riot police, mobile security forces, and so on, as well as its repressive apparatus Of last resort the army, an organization of hundreds of thousands of people marshaled in the infantry, armored divisions, air force, and navy, to say nothing of the armies of the fraternal imperialist states, which can cross borders, land or other borders, to help out at the right moment even. Ignoring these extreme cases, the simple experience of the Popular Front or the post-1945 three-party government proves that a simple government of Popular Democrat P is at the mercy of simple financial procedures, for example, the capital flight that sounded the knell of the Popular Front, or political procedures, the Socialist Remedia's 1947 dismissal of the Communist ministers, unless the popular masses intervene directly and forcefully on the political stage to stymie or foil the maneuvers of the capitalist class struggle and force the parliament to take radical measures which, in that case, change the course of history, lending existing democracy, class character and setting it on an irreversible course in the form of actions that ultimately culminate in the socialist revolution properly so-called. Lenin said that one had to know how to anticipate, accept and practice transitional periods in order to reach the revolution. He himself practiced this theory at the head of the Bolshevik Party between February and October 1917. This was the period in which Kerensky presided over a bourgeois and petty bourgeois parliamentary majority that had been democratically elected after the February 1917 events, which had overthrown the Tsarist regime without overthrowing the feudal capitalist Russian state, even if its state apparatuses, beginning with the army, had been severely undermined. This very peculiar period of democratic transition, during which the Bolsheviks, albeit a tiny minority in the parliament, were able to win over the masses, mobilize them, and rally them to their leadership in a few months thanks to their correct line and correct actions, was truly a period of transition towards socialist revolution, not, after big electoral successes and even very big victories of popular mass struggles, a period of transition towards the restoration of democracy against the people, that is, reactionary bourgeois democracy culminating in Petain's fascism. If the Communist Party and its allies should, one day in our future, win a majority in legislative elections, and if the bourgeoisie were to allow them to assume the responsibilities of government in the framework of existing bourgeois legality, one must be aware, 1. That they would thereby open up the prospect of democracy for the people, popular democracy or new democracy. 2. But that, for as long as the bourgeois state remained in place, with its repressive apparatus intact, and with its ideological state apparatuses, including the bourgeois political ideological state apparatus, the actions of the popular masses, assuming that they are educated, mobilized and committed to a struggle based on a correct line, would determine the nature of the transitional period thus initiated. 3. That, depending on the balance of power and the political line that the popular masses were mobilized to follow by the Communist Party, this transitional period could lead to either a victorious bourgeois reaction, after a few popular successes, or the triumph of the socialist revolution. 4. That without the seizure of state power, without a dismantling of the repressive state apparatus what Marx and Lenin called smashing the machine of the bourgeois state, without a long struggle to smash the bourgeois ideological state apparatuses, revolution is unthinkable, or can only triumph for a time, as was seen in Central Europe in the 1920s. Thus, for us, no parliamentary transition to socialism is even conceivable, for such a transition is impossible, nor is it conceivable that the transition to socialism can be brought about by combining mass political action whose sole objective is to isolate the bourgeoisie, in general, and the action of an electoral majority that professes socialism, or even wants socialism if it is supposed that bourgeois dictatorship can be overcome by isolating the bourgeoisie, without seizing state power, without smashing the bourgeois state apparatuses. The bourgeoisie, even if it is isolated, will know, whatever the tendency of the government in power, how to use the existing state apparatuses, first and foremost the police and army. And it will find itself a chief of state capable of commanding the still intact state apparatus if need be, by means of a coup d'état such as that of 13 May or of some other kind if the masses do not decisively intervene, not to isolate the bourgeoisie, but to dismantle the repressive state apparatus. The transitional period initiated by an electoral victory promising democracy for the people will be, rather than a transition towards socialism, a transition towards bourgeois reaction in, without a doubt, its most violent form, openly dictatorial and tendentially fascist. In that case, the repressive state apparatus and ideological state apparatuses, the political state apparatus included, will be put to full use, by a bourgeoisie that will have dropped its mask, with the requisite massacres as well as the mass arrests that have become classic in a reaction of this type, perfected by the bourgeoisie in the century and a half or more in which it has ruled France, the Maide, 1815, June 1848, the Commune, Daladier, Laval Pétain. What ultimately comes into being after such events obviously is not just the bourgeoisie's creature. But we know that there are massacres and overtly dictatorial regimes, whether they are called fascist or neo-fascist, that can crush the mass movement. For years again, Lenin issued enough warnings, in terms categorical enough, to all unconditional partisans of the push and even the insurrection, to the effect that it was not just foolish, but even criminal not to utilize all forms of struggle, not just all legal forms, but also all parliamentary democratic, and thus electoral, forms in such a way that whatever parliamentary democratic action is undertaken by the Communist Party in the framework of the bourgeois political ideological state apparatus is something other than class collaboration. Lenin insisted, however, that the absolute condition for this was that such action be one form of struggle among others, subordinate to the system of mass class struggles led by the Communist Party. If we interpret these well-known theses of Lenin's in the light of our distinction between the repressive state apparatus and ideological state apparatuses, and if we take into account the fact that a democratic system, in which a parliament elected by universal suffrage in a political contest among different parties designates a government representing the parliamentary majority, is part of the political ideological state apparatus, we will, I think, better understand the real but narrow limits on the Parliamentary democratic activity of the Communist Party. When the party is in the opposition, its parliamentary activity is always confined to the framework of democratic legality prevailing in the political ideological state apparatus at a particular moment in history. That activity does not directly impact, or does not affect at all, the state's other ideological apparatuses. Despite all the bills the party may propose, its activity has virtually no effect on the news and information apparatus. No one can claim that democracy extends to the regime of radio, TV, or the press, the publishing apparatus, the 13 religious apparatus, the scholastic apparatus, and so on. What is more, this is the most serious limit on the party's activity. The absolute limit it obviously puts not the least dent in the repressive apparatus, and if a democratic government in which the party participates is able to exact obedience from the radio TV regime and a part of the administration, it is with many reservations, and on condition that it remain within the confines of a politics ensuring, at the very least, the defense of the national currency, and other national interests. It is a different story as far as the police and, a fortiori, the army are concerned. They obey when they want to, and know how to blow the whistle when they judge that the situation threatens to reach the critical point for bourgeois class domination. The army then steps in directly, as was seen with the Algiers putsch that brought de Gaulle to power, although the existence of the bourgeois state was not even in jeopardy, only the unity of the dominant class, the unity of a bourgeoisie divided by the Algerian people's struggle for national liberation. What would have happened if the bourgeois class state itself had been threatened by the French popular masses? The distinction between the repressive state apparatus on the one hand and the ideological state apparatuses on the other, as well as the thesis that the latter include the political ideological state apparatus, within which the struggles of parliamentary democracy take place, thus grounds and illustrates Leninist principles concerning the distinction between the communists' activity in a parliament or even a parliamentary government, where the existence of the state is not in question, and the masses' revolutionary activity for the conquest of the bourgeois state by way of, first, the destruction of its repressive state apparatus and, subsequently, its ideological state apparatuses. To grasp these fine points it suffices to consider 1. The seemingly paradoxical validity of our classification of the political system of bourgeois democracy, including, consequently, the political parties that bourgeois democracy encompasses and, therefore, the party of the working class as way 14. Under the concept of the political ideological state apparatus. 2. The possibility that a revolutionary party such as the Communist Party can and should find its place in the play of the system of the ideological state apparatus comprised by the political apparatus, a place circumscribed by very narrow objective limits, to be sure, and pursue objectively revolutionary politics there, on the absolute condition that the party's parliamentary politics in the forms of bourgeois democracy be subordinated to its overall politics, which can only consist in mobilizing the proletarian masses and their natural allies. 15. For the purpose of seizing bourgeois state power and transforming it into 16. The power of a socialist state. The possibility, for the party of the working class, to intervene in revolutionary, non-reformist, fashion in the play of the system of the political ideological state apparatus, rests on the possibility of circumventing the law even while respecting it very precisely. In the case of the parliamentary struggle in bourgeois democracy, it is a question, for the party of the working class, of invoking the constitutional law recognized by the bourgeoisie itself so as to make it produce effects of agitation and propaganda favoring overt struggle against the bourgeoisie's politics. In other words, it is a question of taking bourgeois democracy at its word in order to help, only to help, for one must steer clear of all forms of parliamentary cretinism, the masses to engage ever more deeply in a course of action that will ultimately overturn bourgeois democracy in favor of the socialist democracy in which, during the dictatorship of the proletariat, the dictatorship of the working class and its allies will be exercised over their class enemies. Stalin happened to utter a historic phrase when he declared that the communist parties should pick up the banner of democratic freedoms that the bourgeoisie had dropped. However, he spoke a little too quickly. For history has shown that even a man like de Gaulle, who is contemptuous of those freedoms, also knows how to wave the flag of democratic freedoms in skillful speeches that, as election results prove, still have a certain effect. De Gaulle can find successors to wave the same flag. Stalin's remark likewise betrays his failure to see that, as Lenin has shown, there is democracy, and that the question of the nature of democracy is, in the last instance, a class matter. The same holds for Stalin's other historic phrase about the banner of national independence, abandoned by the bourgeoisie, which the party of the working class was supposed to pick up. Here too, he spoke a little too soon, for de Gaulle, who is not in the least contemptuous of national independence, has proven that he knows very well as the electoral results prove here too how to wave the flag of national independence, to the appropriate kind of anti-American music. Stalin's remark also betrays his failure to see that, as Lenin has shown, there are nations and nations, and that the nature of a nation is, in the last instance, a class matter. Under no circumstances should we forget that the themes of democratic freedoms and national independence are, first and foremost, integral parts of the bourgeois state ideology, especially in periods when the Communist Party can rightfully invoke them against bourgeois policies. Thus the reader will permit me to take for granted, or, at any rate, to treat as well-supported hypotheses, the propositions advanced in the preceding discussion, namely, that there exists a specifically political ideological state apparatus, and that it is constituted, in the French capitalist social formation, by the realization of the bourgeois state ideology, here liberal democratic nationalist ideology, in the system comprising the electoral system, political parties, parliament, and so on. 111. The associative ideological state apparatus. The same demonstration applies to the associative ideological state apparatus, which falls under the same theory, but with an important difference that leads us to make a new remark as early as 1791. As everyone knows, the 1789 bourgeois revolution strictly outlawed, with the Le Chapelet Act, associations of laborers, the former journeymen who were soon to become the new workers. That is, proletarians. The Civil Code clearly recognized the right to use and abuse all material goods. As for the good of association for journeymen and workers, a law was required expressly to prohibit the free use of it. The working class conquered the right to association in a long, fierce, bitter, bloody struggle. Notwithstanding the individualistic civil code, that right was enshrined in the labor code recently created to that end. Even civil servants employed in the administration of various ideological state apparatuses, such as the scholastic state apparatus or the news and state information apparatus, eventually saw their right to association enshrined in the 1946 Constitution, a circumstance that will give us some idea of the lag affecting this branch of the law. This should remind us of a parallel phenomenon, parliamentary democracy, in which suffrage was initially based, under the Constituent Assembly, on tax-based qualifications, went through a jolting series of ups and downs in the course of the 19th century before finally gaining general acceptance with the misunderstanding that led to the proclamation of the Third Republic, which would doubtless have become a monarchy again for some time if had it not been for the stupidity of Macmahon and his friends. This proves that the ideological state apparatus is a very sensitive in nature and made of very sensitive stuff, since it takes so much time and so many struggles to replace old ones with new ones and establish them in their apparently definitive function. This also proves that they can be highly vulnerable as soon as they are shaken up by the conjuncture. In that respect, they differ from the repressive state apparatus, which displays superb continuity and constancy, inasmuch as it has not changed for centuries, which have nevertheless seen many different regimes, class regimes, or we can make the same demonstration, then, for the associative ideological state apparatus. We must, however, introduce a new stipulation when we talk about political parties. We know that they extend from the right to the far left. The existence of parties of the right, center and left, and the fact that they have loyally shown up at all the major historical occasions of the capitalist class struggle to shield the bourgeois state with their bodies plainly shows that there is a connection of some kind between the political parties and the system of parliamentary democracy on the one hand, and, on the other, the dictatorship of the bourgeois state. We need only take one more step to understand Lenin's formula: bourgeois democracy is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. When we talk about unions, however, things are not as self-evident. The word makes everyone think first of trade unions, and of the most combative of them, the CGT and, for a few years now, the CFDT. We tend to forget that workers' unions are not the only kind of unions in existence. There are also unions of civil servants employed by either the repressive state apparatus, tax inspectors, union, and so on, and even a police union, or the ideological state apparatuses, unions of primary school, secondary school, and 20 college teachers, and so on. Yet there also exist unions of supervisory personnel and syndicates of small and middle-sized businesses. Above all, there exist very powerful professional associations of employers, crowned by the most powerful of them all, the National Confederation of French Employers, CNPF. To make our thesis about the existence of an associative ideological state apparatus very clear, we would do well to look at things from the other end, beginning, not with the class struggle workers' union, the CGT, the only trade union to include this definition in its statutes, but with the CNPF, and proceeding back down the ladder. When we do, we discover that there exist an unbelievable number of employers, syndicates or interest groups charged with defending the interests of a profession. The system made up of these organizations forms an apparatus that realizes an ideology of defense of the interests of a profession. Naturally, this ideology goes hand in hand with an ideology of the inestimable services that the profession in question renders the public and the national interest. It thereby realizes one of the grand themes of the state ideology, that of the general and national interest in freedom of enterprise and the defense of lofty moral values. Defense of the profession is, for associations of middle employers and big employers, a fig leaf hiding their class objective that a workers' union waging an economic class struggle was able, at the price of battles lasting more than a century, to win recognition in such company, and that it can, moreover, wage a genuine class struggle in the margins of the very recent juridical legality 22 of the Labour Code, is the fruit of a kind of heroism. The heroism, precisely, of the working class. History proves that this trade union has been the constant target of indescribable pressure and repression, shameless blackmail, dismissal of activists, as well as corruption and payoffs. Pure and simple 23FO, as is now official, was created with CIA money. And it has been a victim of the concomitant splits, not to mention the standing temptation to lapse into the economism of the 1906 Charter of Aliens. No politics in trade unionsal, or into anarcho-syndicalism. 24. This, however, merely provides additional empirical evidence for our thesis about the existence of an associative ideological state apparatus. Better, this allows us to make a remark that may seem rather paradoxical when one considers the Marxist tradition. It is often said that, according to Marx and Lenin, the workers' movement is capable of organizing, by itself, without the help of Marxist theory, organizations of trade union struggle capable, after weathering the trying ordeals of their apprenticeship, of leading fights that go beyond the merely local level or corporatist limits, to attain the national level. On the other hand, the argument goes, things are infinitely harder when it comes to making the transition to political organization. And there is a tendency to add that this is only natural, since the workers who daily experience the economic exploitation whose victims they are not equally familiar with the mechanisms of political class struggle, and thus of political oppression and the ideological subjection exercised by the capitalist state. There exists, consequently, a tendency, at least on the part of some proletarian political leaders who are not of proletarian origin, and, a fortiori, among people, especially intellectuals, of petty bourgeois origin, to consider the economic struggle as, in some sort, natural, but subordinate, and to believe that the political struggle is much harder to set in motion. It is, however, not certain that the reality of the matter corresponds point for point with this judgment. That is why we chose to begin by discussing the political ideological state apparatus, before going on to discuss the associative ideological state apparatus. The reason is simple. The terribly hasty promulgation of the Le Chapelet Act can put us on the right track. The reason is that the same bourgeoisie which demanded the benefit of the freedom to organize politically, and which thus imposed at a very early stage, by means of its own class struggle, in which it did not turn up its nose, at support from the people, its own political ideological state apparatus in opposition to the feudal aristocracies, the same bourgeoisie took great pains, from the word go, to repress by means of law and the worst sort of violence the slightest inclination to organize or to wage economic struggle on the part of those it exploited, the proletarians. For the class struggle of the popular classes inside the political ideological state apparatus and outside it, it must be understood that the bourgeoisie discovered that it was incapable of preventing the popular masses for the good reason that it could not do without them, from taking part in the bourgeois political class struggles against, first, the feudal class in 1789-93, and then against the landed aristocracy throughout much of the 19th century. Above all, the first half of it was the French bourgeoisie's historical bad luck, that it had to do with the nobility and feudal church that were particularly tenacious, hard-headed, and even dumb. The proto-Poujadist revolt of the petty aristocracy in the year 1770-80 really spoiled everything. The result is well known, the violent revolt of the peasantry, peace to the huts, war on the castle, with the castles in question going up in smoke all over the place, for the peasants went about their business with a vengeance, the repetition of the journeys revolutionaires, in the cities, the reign of the plebeians in the streets and over Paris, the Committee of Public Safety and the terror meeting the challenge of the frankly counter-revolutionary war that had been unleashed by the fraternal feudal states at the appeal of the highest-ranking French aristocracy, with the king and queen heading the list, prior to their execution, without the decisive support of the popular masses, including the horrid, ominous Fourth Estate. 26. The bourgeoisie of the third Matthias has described, estate would have been able neither to overturn feudal relations of production and exchange, nor to take power and destroy the feudal state of the absolute monarchy in order to create its state apparatuses, nor finally, to exercise power in order to establish its own relations of production and its law. Engels says somewhere that France is an exemplary country in that, to be sure, class struggles are carried to an extreme there, with utter clarity. It is exemplary for the proletariat, but not at all for the bourgeoisie. From the bourgeois standpoint, the 1789 revolution was, in comparison with the English Revolution, a dirty revolution, that, politically, exacted infinitely too high a price from the bourgeoisie. The damage it caused had to be repaired as best it could be, under the worst of conditions. Above all, those unspeakable popular masses, peasant masses that were becoming increasingly urban and plebeian, had to be put back in their places. They had of course been vitally necessary for the bourgeoisie, but they were definitely a little too confident, and how was one supposed to prevent that? That their day had come, a few good mass shootings, the Mida, the White Terror and, finally, Bonaparte the Saviour, the de Gaulle of his day, crowned emperor in exchange for the civil code and the French bourgeoisie's pre-imperialist wars throughout Europe, settled matters. But at what a price? A twofold price. At least first, the bourgeoisie had to pay the price represented by Napoleon Bonaparte. It thus inaugurated an original tradition, the typically French tradition of Bonapartism, disagreeable but rational and indispensable bourgeois solution designed to put the plebeian masses back in their place, in 1798 and again in 1852, a tradition pursued down to 1958, with de Gaulle's May 13.27. This was a solution, certainly, but a costly one, for it showed one and all that bourgeois political liberalism could take the overt form, to the advantage of the bourgeoisie itself, of a non-democratic or non-parliamentary personal dictatorship that, while serenely grounding itself on the grand parliamentary democratic principles of 1789, betrays whenever its class domination is threatened the contempt in which it holds those principles. Second, the bourgeoisie had to pay the price for setting the popular masses a bad example, that might prove contagious and, worse, be repeated. For, in its class struggle against the aristocratic reaction of the Restoration, Louis XVIII, Charles X, the bourgeoisie did not turn up its nose at the workers and common people of Paris who, side by side with the petty bourgeoisie, did the work, on the Trois Glorieuses in July 28, 1830. Once again, then, journeys revolutionaires, on which the people poured into the streets and invented both the barricades and the art of fighting 29 on them. Nor did the bourgeoisie turn up its nose at the proletariat's help in 1848, when, for the first time the proletariat as such, in its first organizations, marched out to battle, launching an assault on the Orleanist monarchy alongside the petty bourgeoisie. And glimpsed, hopefully, albeit still from a very great distance, something that spoke of socialism, even if it had to be discerned through the disavowals of a Louis Blanc and the sham of the national workshops. Every time, the bourgeoisie had to resign itself to the idea of armed intervention. By the popular masses, by the petty bourgeoisie, to be sure, but also by craftsmen, journeymen and, finally, in 1848, the proletarians themselves, in their first-class organizations. Every time, it had to resign itself to the paradoxical fact that its own bourgeois class struggle was educating the proletariat and preparing it for violent political class struggle, which it would one day wage in its own interests. Need we as well say something about the Commune? At stake this time was the empire, which had become an encumbrance for the bourgeoisie in view of its inappropriate authoritarianism and the catastrophic consequences of its annexationist, adventurist foreign policy. This time too, the help of the popular masses, proletarians who were increasingly well organized and politically conscious, despite their ideological divisions, partisans of Proudhon, of Blanqui, and so on, proved necessary, although it was making the bourgeoisie increasingly uneasy, to bring down the empire and proclaim the republic. To top things off, the defeat also did its part. The defeat? But what then becomes of nationalism, a key component of the bourgeois state ideology? This is where the French bourgeoisie found its cross, in the encounter between a military defeat and a popular revolution. Think of 1917 Russia. The national resistance that the people of Paris put up against the Prussian occupier, the appeal to the popular masses to liberate the nation from foreign armed forces, was no longer the work of the patriotic petty bourgeoisie or, obviously, the big bourgeoisie of Mr. Thiers in Versailles, which was colluding with the victorious Prussians. It originated in a fact without precedent. It was the work of the Parisian proletariat, which, for the first time in history, assumed the leadership of the patriotic resistance and the revolution. The consequence was the Commune, a transition from the popular national struggle against the occupier to the first socialist revolution in history, that reckless, unheard of, excessive, inconceivable, mad, but formidable experiment, a source of practical inventions and theoretical discoveries without precedent, which changed the entire course of the international workers' movement in a phenomenal way. For this time, it was not one or another government or form of bourgeois state that was at issue, but the bourgeois state as such, in its apparatuses. It was from the Paris Commune that Marx derived the irrefutable empirical confirmation of his theses on the necessity of seizing state power, destroying the state apparatuses, and establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat. The head of a new state, a proletarian state, fitted out 30 with new proletarian state apparatuses. Everyone knows how the bourgeoisie went about rewarding the common people of Paris for their decisive help in 1830, by confiscating the Trois Glorieuses for Louis Philippe's benefit. It rewarded the proletariat for its decisive help in February 1848 by massacring proletarians in June 1848 and then pursuing the repression with the sentences of December 2, death sentences, prison terms, mass deportations. Everyone knows how the bourgeoisie responded to the Paris Commune's patriotic resistance and revolutionary audacity, by murdering tens of thousands of men and women who were murdered in broad daylight with everyone's full knowledge. They were stood up against Parisian walls in plain view of the beautiful ladies whom these comforting massacres helped to get over their dreadful fright, unforgettable and unforgotten even today however one assesses these terrible events. The bourgeoisie, once it had basically secured its political victory over the aristocracy, once it felt strong enough to tolerate its existence, that is, to control or even assimilate it, found itself unable to prevent the creation of workers' political parties, in the 1860s and 1870s in Germany, and later, in the 1880s, in France, because its constitutional law formally authorized them. A workers' political party, even a socialist party, need not be dangerous, if it plays the democratic game. The proof is that the German Social Democratic Party's huge electoral successes, and the real, if more modest, successes of the Parti Ouvrier Français and, later, the Section Française d'Internationale Ouvrière, culminated, as is well known, in the two unions secrets, the one that the German Social Democratic Party concluded with the German imperialist state and the one that the French Socialist Party concluded with the French imperialist state, with Guesde serving as minister without portfolio in the first war cabinet, after Jars was assassinated. This shows that what has, since Lenin, been known as imperialism always has the last word about even the most spectacular electoral successes of the workers' parties. Marxist parties not accepted. The bourgeoisie is very adept at maneuvering within its political ideological state apparatus, not only by utilizing the right electoral techniques to put more deputies in parliament the fewer votes it has in the country, but, above all, by dividing the working class forces. Thus it tolerated the Communist Party in France after the First World War, while imprisoning its leaders every now and then, but alongside the Socialist Party, and constantly used the Socialist Party against the Communist Party. It knows the score and is not as stupid as Mr. Guy Mollet once had the audacity to say. The audacity? Rather, the complicity, to create. The impression that the French bourgeoisie is stupid is also a way of deceiving the workers as to its real strength once again, and thus of once again serving the bourgeoisie. The division of the workers' political parties went hand in hand with the division of the workers' trade union organizations. Such is the bourgeoisie's constant tactic. This is irrefutable proof that what the bourgeoisie fears above all things is, listed in order of increasing importance, 1. Political unity between the workers' parties. 2. Trade union unity between the workers' union. 3. And, above all, unity between these two forms of unity, that is, the fusion, behind a unified line and a unified leadership, of the mass trade union activity and mass political activity of the working class and its natural allies. These stages may be regarded as absolute thresholds and touchstones. Hence we must advance the following thesis: the bourgeois class struggle reaches the level state of alert, with the first event, political unity between the workers' parties. It reaches the level state of emergency, with the second event, trade union unity between the workers' union. It reaches the level martial law, with the third event, unity of the economic and political class struggles of the masses of workers and their allies. For, at that point, one stage following another, it is the bourgeois state itself that is directly at issue. The bourgeoisie can tolerate a great deal, including an active communist party, active trade unions, a general strike, even if it is relatively politicized, as in May 1968, and the simultaneous ideological revolt of the young people in school in one segment of the scholastic ideological state apparatus. But under no circumstances can it tolerate the mortal threat against the state itself, state power. The state apparatus is taken as a whole, with the repressive state apparatus that forms their core, represented by the irresistible popular power that looms up behind the unity of the workers' parties and the unity of the labor unions, that is, the real fusion of the economic and political struggles of the popular masses in the cities and countryside. May 1968, albeit miles from achieving this fusion, warned the bourgeoisie that it had to exercise extreme vigilance in the face of this mortal threat. The bourgeoisie is not at all stupid. It does everything it can to fend off this mortal threat. And, as a good Cartesian, it divides up difficulties, that is, applies a strategic, patient, tenacious, shrewd policy of dividing, first, the political workers' movement, second, the trade union movement, and, finally, the relations between them. To do this, it need only rely on the social democratic parties and the class collaborationist trade unions against the communist parties and the trade unions of economic class struggle. History verifies this empirically, beyond all question. It is up to communists, first of all, and then up to proletarians and their natural allies, to learn the lesson that this history has to teach. It is a vitally important lesson for the cause of the period of transition to socialist revolution and the socialist revolution itself via the economic class struggle in the associative ideological state apparatus. We have now made many observations on familiar topics of the workers' parties' struggle in the framework of the political ideological state apparatus. It is time to say a word about the specificity of the struggle of workers' organizations in the framework of the associative ideological state apparatus. Since politics is in the foreground, and since the political struggle always represents a higher level of consciousness than trade union struggle does, there is a tendency, as I have pointed out, to regard trade union struggle as both easier and less important, when it is not considered a secondary, if not, indeed, somewhat contemptible business. It is enough, for example, to read through the literature that has been turned out for years by 31 handful of revolutionary theorists of the UNF, 32 but also of certain splinter groups and the PSU, 33 not to mention ideologues such as Serge Mallet and others, or the organs in which they publish, La Nouvelle Observateur, in order to learn about a great revelation from them, namely, that quantitative demands must be clearly distinguished from qualitative demands. The former, the quantitative demands, which have to do with the defense of the material interests of wage earners and coincide with or comprise the major objectives of the economic class struggle of the workers' trade union organization, the CGT, are considered to be basely materialistic and without horizon or global strategic revolutionary perspective, to use these theorists' jargon. They are therefore treated as somewhat contemptible. The other demands, in contrast, the qualitative demands, are noble and worthy of universal history, that is, of the interest that these theoreticians bestow on them in order to elaborate their global strategy of world revolution, in which the proletariat had better hold on to its hat, that is, hold to the position they assign it. If I mention these errors or asininities, it is because they wreak havoc, not only among intellectuals, students and others, 34 but also in other strata of the petty bourgeoisie, supervisory personnel and engineers, progressive members of both categories included, and even in certain working class strata. The CFDT's slogans themselves often echo the distinction between quantitative and qualitative demands, to the advantage of the latter, of course, since the distinction was invented to that end in sum. Only politics is noble and worthy of being practiced, since it is revolutionary, whereas material trade union demands are basely materialistic and non-revolutionary. It is all they can do not to dispatch someone to tell the workers they should be ashamed of themselves for demanding money with which to buy fridges, tellies, or even a car, since we know, as the good bourgeois theory of consumer society has it, that these things are, in and of themselves, alienating for the class struggle, because they corrupt the souls of their owners. The counter-argument leaps to the eye, as everyone knows, the handful of theorists, CFDT, PSU, or intellectuals, a few students included, who graciously share with us the revelation that has been bestowed on them, all go without fridges, tellies and cars themselves, not to mention vacations on the Balearic Islands, the Riviera, or in Greece, so that they will not be alienated or corrupted, and can continue to be the pure thinkers, if not leaders, of the proletarian revolution. They are, inasmuch as they have themselves decreed that they are its thinkers and leaders. 55. If, however, we abandon the global perspective adopted by these theorists, and simply pay a little attention to the trade union struggle, its history displays a crucially important feature. We have stated the reasons that ultimately compelled the bourgeoisie to concede that the workers' political parties, even the Communist Party, have a legal right, which is, to be sure, at the mercy of the first band to come along, to exist, at least for the time being. The same reasons have produced a completely different result in the domain of the workers' trade union struggle, which comes under the associative ideological state apparatus. The workers' economic class struggle organizations have not benefited, unlike the workers' political class struggle organizations, from the events of the long, spectacular class struggle between bourgeoisie and feudal aristocracy in the 18th and 19th centuries. Thus they have not benefited from the instructive bourgeois precedents and examples of the political class struggle, or the occasional articles of liberal, egalitarian, bourgeois constitutional law, the grand principles of which were laid down from 1789 on. For the bourgeoisie not only had no need for assistance from the workers' economic class struggle. On the contrary, it had everything to fear from it, since this economic class struggle, which targeted capitalist exploitation, in fact targeted, directly, the material basis for the existence of capitalism and thus for bourgeois society and the bourgeoisie's political domination. The Bourgeoisie could therefore risk no political compromise whatsoever with the workers' economic class struggle, because it lives exclusively on the exploitation of workers. That is perfectly logical. However, the immediate conjuncture requires that we dot the one S here, since people are currently peddling old mistakes which, albeit long since refuted, are still dangerous. Let us here recall a fundamental classic thesis, the material basis, the infrastructure, as Marx says, or the base, for the existence of every capitalist social formation is economic exploitation, not repression. Marx, Engels and Lenin, particularly in their relentless struggle against anarchism, which claimed the opposite, and still does in the persons of its petty bourgeois theorists of the avant-garde, that is, of the historical rear-guard, always carefully distinguished exploitation from repression, in other words, the economic base on the one hand, in which the economic relations of production of capitalist exploitation hold sway, and, on the other, the political superstructure, in which, in the last resort, the repressive power of the capitalist state holds sway. It is here that the metaphor of the edifice, base or infrastructure and superstructure, or upper floor resting on the base, renders absolutely decisive theoretical and political service to working class activists. It can even render important, salutary service to a number of those who, rather than letting themselves be intimidated by the authoritarian methods of ideological leadership utilized by a handful of intellectuals, the self-appointed theorists and leaders of the revolutionary movement, agree to reconsider the question, seriously, scientifically, calmly and honestly, for the distinction between base and superstructure, as well as the thesis that the superstructure, and thus all forms of repression, all of which depend on the state apparatuses, are determined in the last instance by the base, that is, by the material exploitation of the proletariat and other workers working in relations of production that are relations of capitalist exploitation and nothing else. This distinction puts things definitively back in place. This is an elementary truth of Marxism. Those who today call it into question are nothing other, in this respect, 36th and pure and simple revisionists, for what is determinant in the last instance, and thus primary, is exploitation, not repression. What is determinant in the last instance are the relations of capitalist production, which are simultaneously relations of capitalist exploitation. What is determined, and thus secondary, is repression, namely, the state, which is repression's ultimate center, from which all forms of repression emanate, both the repression that is exercised by the repressive state apparatus, physical repression, both direct, the police, army, courts, and so on, and indirect, the administration, of ideological subjection due to the ideological state apparatuses, and if, as we have tried to show, if not, indeed, to prove, the superstructure's effective function is to ensure the reproduction of the conditions of production through the system of the various forms of repression and ideologization, all of which are ascribable to the capitalist state, it follows that reproduction is merely the condition for the continuing existence of production. This means that it is in production, and in production alone, not in reproduction, that exploitation is carried out, the material condition of existence for the capitalist mode of production. If the state is, as Engels puts it, a concentrate of society, it is such only in consequence of its rolling reproduction, and because we can, on that grounds, discover in it the significance of the political class struggles of which it is the object and objective. But these political class struggles are not materially grounded in the existence of the state, they are grounded in the existence of irreconcilable antagonistic classes, whose existence as antagonistic classes is grounded in, and determined by, the material conditions of class economic exploitation. On the one side stands the class of exploiters because they have the means of production in their hands. On the other stands the class of the exploited and all forms, because they have no means of production and are forced to sell their labor power as if it were an ordinary commodity. Even in our supposed consumer society, therein resides the essential, albeit paradoxical, difference distinguishing the working class's economic class struggle from the, more or less officially recognized or tolerated, forms of its political class struggle. The paradox is that, in order to destroy the class relations of capitalist exploitation, the working class must seize bourgeois state power, destroy the state apparatus, and so on, because the state is the key to the reproduction of capitalist relations of production. To overthrow the infrastructure of exploitation, therefore, the proletariat and its allies must take state power and destroy the state machine. This proposition is perfectly correct from the standpoint of the proletarian class war, which must direct the political attack against the state, because the state is that which guarantees the conditions of reproduction of the system of exploitation. Or, in short, that which maintains the capitalist system upright, by perpetuating it. However, as every soldier knows very well, a country's last military defense, this or that strategic battlefield, is not the country itself. Nor does the battle for this ultimate bastion sum up the whole of the war that preceded it. The same applies to the class war between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. What decides it is whether state power remains in the hands of the bourgeoisie or is seized by the proletariat. That, however, is the culminating point of a very long battle, an incessant, daily, extraordinarily difficult battle, a sort of interminable trench warfare that can never be abandoned and is usually masked by the spectacular political battles in the foreground. This silent, obscure, interminable, bloody trench warfare is the economic class struggle. In this war, the bourgeoisie gives, in principle, no quarter. From 1791 on, it has been waging preventive battle, outlawing, with the Le Chapelet Act, all associations of journeymen and craftsmen and, later, workers. One must read the stupefying history, 37 of the workers, as recounted by honest historians, economic class struggle associations. banned, they had initially to be organized behind the screen provided by various unlikely associations, relief associations, associations of mutual aid, correspondence societies, or even associations for the fight against alcoholism, generally in legal gray zones, when they were not purely and simply illegal with, on the one hand, all the obscure heroism, incessant sacrifice, tenacity, imagination and subterfuge, and, on the other, the pitiless condemnations or, quite simply, mass killings. 38, for me, to cite just one bloody example, that this entailed, since these practices were, at the time, expressly prohibited by repressive bourgeois law. Simply to take the measure of this difference, let us simply note that it was infinitely harder for workers' unions to secure recognition of their legal, concrete existence and rights in the associative ideological state apparatus than it was for workers' political parties to gain recognition in their ideological state apparatus. The workers' unions had to assert their de facto existence in the face of the most cynical sorts of bourgeois legality and repression, in heroic, protracted battles, before they were formally recognized. In 1884, and actually recognized only under the Popular Front, in 19,361. It was only in 1946, after the resistance, that French civil servants' right to organize unions 39 was recognized. It was at Grenelle, in May 1968, that shop committees were granted a legal right to exist in companies employing more than 200 workers. Is there any point in adding that, since the law is the law, and since applying it consists in respecting it while circumventing it, the bourgeoisie did not and still does not hesitate to make use of all the procedures in its power against union activists, by subjecting them to sanctions or, quite simply, firing them? Or that labor inspectors either collude with employers or are quite simply helpless in the face of the procedures employers use? Or that some employers write off, as overhead expenses, the fines they are condemned to pay by the labor courts for unfair dismissal of people with bad attitudes, who are just a little too politicized? Is there any need to add, on top of everything else, that the bourgeoisie is a past master at exploiting the divisions between trade union organizations, which it carefully cultivates, divisions between the CGT, CFDT, CFTC, 40CGC, and FO, to say nothing of company unions, such as those at Simca or Citroën. Thus it is no wonder, to take 1969 France as our example, that it is often easier to be a member of the Communist Party in France, that is to say, for certain activists, to carry a party card in their pockets, hold occasional meetings outside the firm, distribute leaflets or the party sell newspaper by mail or in some other discreet way than to be a genuine trade union activist. For trade union activity can only be carried on in the firm, in the broad light of day, collectively, it is true, but also individually, under the constant, terribly vigilant surveillance of engineers, supervisors and foremen who in the overwhelming majority of cases are the direct agents, in forms that are sometimes brutal, but sometimes infinitely subtle, of the bosses, exploitation and repression. The thesis that I am advancing by way of these empirical remarks is simple and classic in the workers' movement. It has been defined in very clear terms by 41 Lenin and the Red International of Labor Unions. It runs as follows: the economic class struggle, which cannot by itself determine the outcome of the decisive battle for the socialist revolution, that is, the battle for state power, is not a secondary or subordinate struggle. It is the material basis for the political struggle itself. Without bitter, uninterrupted, day-to-day economic struggle, the political class struggle is impossible or vain. There can be no concrete political class struggle capable of carrying the day that is not deeply rooted in the economic class struggle, and in it alone, because the economic class struggle is, to hazard a somewhat metaphorical expression, the base, determinant in the last instance, of the political struggle itself, which is for its part, for such is its function, the only one that can lead the popular masses, decisive battle. Primacy of the political class struggle, then. But this primacy will remain a hollow phrase if the basis for political struggle, the economic class struggle, is not waged daily, indefatigably, profoundly, and on the basis of a correct line. Obviously, this thesis pulverizes those of petty bourgeois theorists about the primacy of qualitative over quantitative struggles, and also Marxist pseudo-theses about the trade unionist 42, limits on the workers' class struggle when it is left to itself. The latter theses are ascribed to Lenin when he is read a little too hastily, for Lenin by no means says that the working class, when left to itself, can wage only an economic class struggle. The trade unionism of which Lenin speaks is a political struggle, but one waged on the basis of an incorrect political line, a reformist line, which confines itself to calling on the bourgeois state and bourgeois government to make reforms, without ever calling the existence of the bourgeois class state into question. Trade unionism is the utilization and perversion of the struggle of workers, trade union organizations for the benefit of a reformist political line, that is, a class collaborationist political line. In this case too, there exists a close relationship between trade unions and party. What would labor in England do without the trade union? We can even grant that there exists a certain implantation of labor in the big British trade union. We must, however, immediately add that the major trade union leaders, the Bevins, Wilsons, and so on, once they are in power, that is, at the head of Her Gracious Imperialist Majesty's government, are never slow to cut themselves off from their roots in the trade union struggle, and then to contain that struggle, before overtly combating it. This is always what happens when one is a government socialist, that is, a flunky of the bourgeois state. It is, therefore, completely wrong to interpret Lenin's statement that trade unionism is the furthest limit that the workers' movement can attain on its own power as if it referred to the spontaneous economic class struggle of the workers' movement. It refers to something completely different, the absolute limit of the spontaneous political struggle of the workers' movement, which trade unionism pushes into the reformist trap of class collaboration. At the limit, trade unionism can set out to conquer the government but never the capitalist state. The result is that it becomes the loyal manager of the capitalist regime. 6. The political class struggle must be deeply rooted in the economic class struggle. We must, then, establish the facts again. And, because the trade union struggle is today under attack from certain avant-garde theoreticians, and is also, in effect, treated as secondary by certain communists, who, be it added, cultivate for that reason an equally false notion of their role in the political struggle, we must also emphatically rehabilitate the trade union struggle, which takes on the character of a direct economic class struggle when big workers, union federations, such as the miners, metal workers, rail workers, construction workers, and so on, are involved. In civil servants, unions, for example, the relationship to economic class struggle is not direct. We must establish the facts again, and understand why no communist political class struggle is possible unless it is deeply implanted in the masses, economic class struggle, and unless the communists take up a correct position and carry out correct actions in the economic class struggle, that is, in the struggle for bread and butter demands. We have brought out the principle that ultimately justifies this thesis, because the whole capitalist regime rests in the last instance on direct economic exploitation of the working class and other wage earners who are not workers, both urban and rural. The anti-capitalist struggle inevitably takes the path of a direct struggle against direct exploitation. It also takes the path, secondarily, of a struggle against indirect forms of 43 exploitation. Because this struggle can be led as a mass struggle, it is led by mass organizations, which are by nature distinct, by virtue of their statutes, operating rules, the broadest possible trade union democracy and practices, from the communist parties. It is plainly a question of the masses, for exploitation affects all workers and laborers without exception. It is their daily lot, they experience it directly every day. Thus it is by way of the struggle for material demands that the masses can be rallied to objective actions against the capitalist system. The masses, not just the vanguard of the proletariat, not just the proletariat, but also the non-proletarian wage workers in town and country, poor peasants, small peasants in the process of becoming proletarians, and all those, including many civil servants working in the ideological state apparatuses, teachers, for instance, or even certain repressive state apparatuses, for example, some categories of civil servants in the administration, who are objectively victims of capitalist exploitation. It is the masses who make history. But if the masses can lead history to the victory of the socialist revolution only in the political class struggle and under the leadership of the political organization of the vanguard of the proletariat, it is clear and correct that the masses, when they go into motion, will not accept the party's political leadership unless they have long since been unified and mobilized in the struggle against the economic exploitation of the capitalist regime by a long, hard, heroic, tenacious, unspectacular, trade union struggle for bread and butter demands on the basis of a correct line. This is an unmistakable sign. If a communist party disappears, as a party, from the enterprises, that is proof that its line and practice were not correct with respect to its own political function and its function vis-à-vis the trade union. If, in the enterprises, the party cell hides behind the trade union, a fortiori, if it purely and simply disappears, leaving it to the trade union, which can on no grounds assume this function, to stand in for the party. If the party contents itself with supporting workers' struggles, read, trade union struggles, instead of leading them, which is its role. In short, if, at the national level, the party finds itself, in its non-electoral practice, objectively lagging behind the activity and initiatives of the organization of economic class struggle, this is, in all cases, a sign that something is wrong somewhere, for the party must be ahead of the masses by, not 10 miles or 1,000 miles, as the famous revolutionary avant-garde theorists, about whom I have already said a word, would have it, speaking on behalf of their organization, which exists only in their imaginations, but, as Lenin's formula has it, by one step, and one step only. What holds at the national level holds a fortiori at the level of each enterprise. This presupposes correct definition of the communists' political line vis-à-vis the shop committee, as well as correct practice of it. To forge ties with the masses in the enterprise, the communists have to concern themselves, down to the details, with concrete trade union demands and questions, without, however, substituting themselves for the trade union. They have to carry out the work that is theirs, the work of political explanation, propaganda, agitation and organization. This presupposes, as its absolute condition, that the party exists in the enterprise, that it makes its presence felt there in actual fact and as such with its own initiatives, its cell, newspaper, and so on. It presupposes that everyone in the enterprise knows and appreciates it, that it has a correct line there and occupies the position it should vis-à-vis the masses organized in the trade union, one step ahead of the masses, and thus one step ahead of the trade union organizations. 4. To go back to what we have said about the union between the mass economic struggle and mass political struggle, in short, to discuss this fusion again, which is a deadly terror because it is, objectively, a mortal threat to the very existence of the capitalist system, this politically revolutionary fusion will never come about in forms capable of ensuring its victory if one does not begin to forge it, far in advance, at the very heart of the enterprises. But the material basis for this fusion is the implantation of the political class struggle in the economic class struggle, which is, I repeat, determinant in the last instance. In more concrete terms, it is the implantation of the activity of the communists who are members of the shop cell in the activity carried out by the members of the shop committee to win concrete material demands. This is the basic principle of the communists' political practice with respect to the trade union. The old militants who were formed in France by the CGTU and the Leninism of Maurice Thorez have not forgotten it. They know it. They have to teach it to the many young 44 militants who have flocked or will flock to the CGT. And then the party. This is not, be it added, their personal affair. It is the number one task of political education, which the whole party should take in hand, assuming responsibility for it and carrying it through to the end. I am well aware, we are all well aware, that this is no easy task. That is especially true in the present conjuncture, in which bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideology, which always has an influence on the working class, because it is and remains the dominant ideology, never ceases to suggest two deviations to the workers' movement, the economistic deviation on the one hand and the hyper-political, revolutionary deviation on 45 the other, whether anarcho-syndicalist or anarchist. It is especially true in the present conjuncture, in which imperialism's death agony also assigns a high priority to the task of forming activists for the anti-imperialist struggle in France itself, 46 and in particularly delicate conditions at that, the split in the international communist movement and the resulting enfeeblement 47 of proletarian internationalism. In any case, this educational task remains the number one task of political education, and must be carried out to implant the political class struggle as deeply as possible in the economic class struggle, in the trade union struggle for the masses, material demands, such is the golden rule of the revolutionary struggle. The workers' movement, in its fusion with Marxist theory, learned this golden rule in the course of struggles which cost the international working class unimaginable sacrifices. The workers' movement owes its great historical victories, the 1917 Russian Revolution, the 1949 Chinese Revolution, to its respect for this golden rule. Its great historical defeats, for example, that of the German social democracy before and after 1914, the defeats of the Central European revolutions in the 1920s, and so on, occurred because it 48 forgot it or disdained it. It is clear that, even if this golden rule is neglected, the popular masses can still, in such and such a critical conjuncture, mobilize, or even launch a very powerful movement, capable, if the situation happens to be revolutionary, of taking state power by assault. However, if by accident or for any other reason, the party has not forged profound ties with those masses through a very long practice of implanting the political class struggle in the economic class struggle, the movement of the popular masses can either fail to lead to the seizure of state power or, even if it should have the good fortune to take state power, risks not being able to keep it, for one has to go that far to give concrete content to the Marxist-Leninist thesis that it is the masses who make history. Since the history that interests us is the history of the revolution, the masses must be mobilized and led towards truly revolutionary objectives. Only the party of the vanguard of the proletariat can do that. But the party can assume this leadership role, which presupposes that it explains things to the masses, and mobilize and organize them, only if it has forged deep ties with them, if it is at one with them. Nothing but the deep, irreversible implantation of the political class struggle in the economic class struggle, and thus in bread and butter trade union demands, can guarantee that it will be able to establish such ties. This classical thesis restores the trade union struggle as such, which is determinant in the last instance, to its true place. It does so at a time when some consider that struggle to be secondary, if not contemptible, while others would like to transform it into a pure and simple political struggle. I'll appeal to the activists of goodwill to whom I am alluding here. There are many 149 among those whom people call far leftists without making the necessary distinctions, especially among lycée and college students as well as young intellectual workers, to think about the content of this classical thesis, about the fact that this classical thesis is the tried and tested result of a century of class struggle by the workers' movement across the globe, and about the fact that this result has cost hundreds of thousands of anonymous worker militants an unheard of price, paid in dedication, sacrifice and blood. Simply, they remained at their post in a combat infinitely harsher, riskier and more dangerous than the one facing the younger generations of today, thanks to the sometimes tragic sacrifices of their elders, whether they perished or survived. 7. There is one repressive state apparatus, but there are several ideological state apparatuses. Let us briefly return to our thesis about the distinction between the repressive state apparatus and the ideological state apparatuses, for there is another difference, apart from the one between repression and ideologization, between the repressive state apparatus and the ideological state apparatuses. It is that while there is one repressive state apparatus, there are several ideological state apparatuses. This difference is important. The state apparatus that we are identifying as repressive presents itself as an organic whole. More precisely, as a centralized core that is consciously and directly led from a single center. It must be borne in mind that this repressive apparatus, a specialized component, of which we singled out in discussing the physical, and other, sanctions imposed by the law, has a centralized organic dispositive that is particularly conspicuous in France, whose chief of state has announced that he is not interested in inaugurating chrysanthemums. At the head of the repressive state apparatus, then, is the real chief of state. Under 50 his direct orders is the government. Under his or their orders are the administration, the army, the police, the judiciary. The story goes that it is independent, the courts, the prisons, and so on. When it comes to repression, of course, there is a division of labor among these different corps, which 51 are merely members, and repression is exercised in different or even very different forms by them. A civil servant in the central administration does not, even if he is a tax inspector, use the same methods as a policeman. A customs officer does not use the same methods as an army officer, and so on, but the fact remains that all of these members belong to one and the same core of repressive agents under the orders of those who hold state power, the political representatives of the dominant class, who implement its class politics. In France today, this dominant class is the imperialist French bourgeoisie. We may therefore say that the repressive state apparatus comprises an organic whole, because it is organized unified under a single leadership, that of the political representatives of the class in power it is a different story with the ideological state apparatuses. They exist in the plural and have a relatively independent material existence. The church is, despite the schools it still has, its chaplains in the public schools, and its ideological representatives in the state school system, an ideological state apparatus that can no longer, in 1969, be conflated with the school. That is the result of a ferocious class struggle which opposed, throughout the 19th century, the landed aristocracy allied with the church on the one hand, and, on the other, the capitalist bourgeoisie that emerged from the French Revolution in alliance with the petty bourgeoisie. It was a very dearly purchased result that, today, is established fact. Similarly, although the church has its publishing houses and shows, masses, processions, pilgrimages, and so on, as well as ideological representatives in the other apparatuses, it cannot be identified with the ideological state apparatuses comprising publishing, the cultural apparatus, spectacles of all kinds, or the news and information apparatus. The same may be said of all the ideological state apparatuses, the political apparatus included. Despite the inevitable overlaps between them, they are objectively distinct, relatively autonomous, and do not form an organized, centralized core with a single, conscious leadership. For example, there is no longer a ministry of religion in France, and de Gaulle, in spite of his highness, does not command Archbishop Monti's ideological state apparatus, his complicity. With Monti notwithstanding, the way he commands Edgar Fay's ideological state apparatus or the news and information ideological state apparatus, the most effective part of which, the RTF, has been presided over by Mr. Dormeson, in complete independence and 152 objectivity. If these ideological state apparatuses are distinct, relatively autonomous, more or less malleable, and under more or less direct state control, even when they are state institutions, like the schools or radio, they are not all equally malleable, at least not in certain periods. They even grate on certain occasions, terribly, what makes them ideological state apparatuses. Above all, the ideology that is realized in them. This ideology, being the dominant ideology, is that of the dominant class, the class that holds state power and directly and imperiously commands the repressive state apparatus. At this point, we need to return to Marx's and Lenin's theses on the state and the ideology of the dominant class. We can now better evaluate their import and scope. To put things in a nutshell, 1. Marx's and Lenin's theory holds that the state is the concentrate and the machine of the dominant class's domination. If we take Marx and Lenin at their word, this means that the superstructure is centered, concentered, on the state, as a class superstructure. This thesis thus allows us to rectify the useful, but overly cut and dry, distinctions of the topography on which we insisted only recently, especially those between the legal, political and ideological superstructures. The distinction remains correct, but on condition that we stipulate, from now on, that the difference between these superstructures exists and exists only under the domination of an absolutely determinate unity. That of the state, of state power and the state apparatuses, repressive and ideological too. Marx's and Lenin's theory holds, consequently, that the dominant ideology, that of the dominant class, is also, despite its internal variations and the differences between the apparatuses in which it exists, arrayed around, and concentrated in the form of, the ideology of the dominant class, the class holding state power. Hence it is concentrated in the form of an ideological unity which, despite the contradictions internal to this unity, can and should be called the ideology of the class state in question. Thus what makes for the unity of the various ideological state apparatuses is the fact that they realize, each in its own domain and each in its proper modality, an ideology that, notwithstanding its differences or even its internal contradictions, is the state ideology definition. The state is therefore, under the power of the state. 7. The repressive state apparatus, and 2. The ideological state apparatuses. The unity of the state apparatus and the ideological state apparatuses is ensured by the class politics of those who hold state power, acting directly in the class struggle by means of the repressive state apparatus and indirectly by means of the realization of the state ideology in the ideological state apparatuses. What is the state ideology? We will discuss it at greater length in Volume 2. Suffice it to say, for the moment, that the state ideology brings together a certain number of major themes, borrowed from various ideological regions, religious, legal, moral, political, and so on, in a system that sums up the essential values which the domination of the class holding state power needs in order to make the exploited and the agents of exploitation and repression, as well as the agents of ideologization, go. That which it needs, therefore, in order to ensure the reproduction of the relations of production. As far as the bourgeois state is concerned, the essential themes brought together in the state ideology seem to me to be the following. 1. Nationalism, the theme of France's world role, of the mission and grandeur of France. France becomes, as need dictates, the eldest daughter of the Church. 2. Liberalism, the theme of free enterprise above all, and the theme of freedom in general, of the defense of freedom in the world, of the free world, and so on. 3. Economism, the theme of interest, not only the national interest, see above, but also the theme of the defense of the interests that one and all have in the general progress of the sciences and technologies, and the national economy. Appendix, the ideology of work. 55.4. Humanism, the obligatory counterpoint to the theme of economic interest. It forges the synthesis between nationalism and France's mission, man's freedom, and so on. Every ideological state apparatus accommodates, in its fashion, some or all of these themes, their component parts and their resonances. 1. Tn. See Chapter 7, n. 1. Tn. See Chapter 7, n. 2.3 Vladimir Lenin, The Trade Unions, The Present Situation and Trotsky's Mistakes in Lenin, Collected Works, Moscow, Progress Publishers, 1965, Volume 32, p20 I. Althusser's emphasis. Point 4 Ibid, p24.5 b. It recalled that the class struggle goes infinitely beyond those of its effects which are inscribed in the forms of the ideological state apparatuses. Here we are analyzing those effects alone, to the exclusion of all other. 6. Tn. The Human Scale, L'échelle humaine, was the title of a book Bloom published in 1945. It features a polemical account of the differences between the communists, in human socialism, and the socialist socialism on a human scale. Échelle also means ladder. Tn. For the first 18 months of the existence of the post-war French Fourth Republic, with the exception of a brief interlude from December 1946 to January 1947, successive French governments were formed by the PCF, the socialists of the Section Française d'Internationale Ouvrière, and the conservative movement Républicain Populaire. 18 Marxist doctrine, a democracy can only be characterized by its class nature, bourgeois democracy, petty bourgeois democracy is appendage and fig leaf, or popular democracy, democracy for the people. 9 A correct line does. 12 Although the government is elected by parliament, which is part of the political ideological state apparatus, the government is part. Shortly after his interests of the nation, imperialism with the non-parliamentary demo. 35 By what miracle do some intellectuals and the concessions made to the labor movement? Think of Henri Martin, and the concessions made to the labor movement, although rejected by much of the rank and file as insufficient, were subsequently institutionalized. 40. Tn. The CGC. Think of Henri Martin, and so on. Tn. Martin, a communist sailor, was imprisoned for treason in 52. Tn. The French equivalent of highness is hauteur, which also means haughtiness and tallness. De Gaulle. The reproduction of the relations of production. Only here and only now can we at last answer our central question, which has been left in suspense for many pages: how is the reproduction of the relations of production ensured? In topographical terms, base, superstructure, we can say that it is ensured by the superstructure, by the legal political superstructure and the ideological superstructure. However, since we have argued that it is imperative to go beyond this still descriptive terminology, we shall say, it is ensured by the exercise of state power in the state apparatuses, the repressive state apparatus on the one hand and the ideological state apparatuses on the other. Let us also take what was said earlier into account. It can be assembled under the following 3 points. 1. All the state apparatuses function both repression and ideology. The difference is that the repressive state apparatus functions in overwhelmingly preponderant fashion on repression, whereas the ideological state apparatuses function in overwhelmingly preponderant fashion on ideology, with all the requisite nuances in each case too, whereas the repressive state apparatus constitutes an organized whole whose various components are centralized under a commanding unity, that of the class struggle politics applied by the political representatives of the dominant classes holding state power. The ideological state apparatuses are multiple, distinct, relatively autonomous, and prone to providing an objective field to contradictions which express, in forms that are as a rule limited, but in some cases extreme, the effects of the clashes between the capitalist class struggle and the proletarian class struggle, as well as their subordinate forms, for instance, the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the landed aristocracy in the first 2/3 of the 19th century, or the struggle between the big and the petty bourgeoisie, and so on. 3. Whereas the unity of the repressive state apparatus is ensured by the fact that it is organized in centralized, unified fashion under the leadership of representatives of the classes in power who carry out those classes, class struggle politics. The unity of the various ideological state apparatuses is ensured by the dominant ideology, that of the dominant class. To account for its effects, we have to call it the state ideology, i.e. a certain division of labor, in the reproduction of the relations of production. If we agree to take these characteristics into account, we can represent the reproduction of the relations of production in the following way. Along the lines of a kind of division of labor, the role of the repressive state apparatus, insofar as it is a repressive apparatus, consists essentially in guaranteeing by force, physical or not, the political conditions for the reproduction of the relations of production. The state apparatus not only has a very large part in its own reproduction, it also, and above all, guarantees the general political conditions for the operation of the ideological state apparatuses by means of repression, from the most brutal physical force to simple administrative orders and prohibitions, open or tacit censorship, and so on. For the ideological state apparatuses, by definition, ensure the reproduction, as such, of the relations of production, behind the shield of the repressive state apparatus. It is here that the state ideology comes massively into play, the ideology of the dominant class holding state power. It is by way of the dominant ideology, the state ideology, that the, sometimes grating, harmony between the repressive state apparatus and the ideological state apparatuses is ensured, as well as that among the different ideological state apparatuses. We are thus led to envisage the following hypothesis: as a consequence precisely, of the diversity of the ideological state apparatuses in their single, because shared, role of reproducing the relations of production. We have listed relatively large number of ideological state apparatuses in contemporary capitalist social formations: the religious apparatus, scholastic apparatus, familial apparatus, political apparatus, associative apparatus, news and information apparatus, publishing apparatus, cultural apparatus, including sport, and so on. In contrast, in the social formations dominated by the mode of production based on serfdom, commonly called feudal, we observe that, while there existed a single repressive state apparatus which, not only in the absolute monarchy, but, indeed, in the earliest known states of antiquity, was formerly very similar to the one we know today, the number of ideological state apparatuses was smaller, and they were individualized differently. For instance, we observe that the church, the religious ideological state apparatus, combined a number of functions which have today devolved upon several distinct ideological state apparatuses that are new with respect to the past we are evoking here. Alongside the church, there existed a familial ideological state apparatus, which played an incomparably bigger role than it does in capitalist social formations. The church and family were not, despite appearances, the only ideological state apparatuses. There also existed a political ideological state apparatus, the Estates General, the Parliament, various political factions and leagues, the ancestors of modern political parties, and the whole political system of the free commons and then the vills. There also existed a powerful proto-associative ideological state apparatus, if we may hazard that necessarily anachronistic expression, the powerful merchants, and bankers, guilds as well as journeymen's and other associations. Even publishing as well as news and information undeniably underwent development, as did entertainment. Initially integral parts of the church, they became more and more independent of it. 11. There is one dominant ideological state apparatus today, the school system. In the pre-capitalist historical period that we are examining in very broad outline, there patently existed dominant ideological state apparatus, the church, which concentrated within itself not just religious, but also educational functions, and a very large part of the functions of information, culture and publishing as well. The absolutely dominant position of the religious ideological state apparatus explains why all ideological struggle from the 16th to the 18th century, beginning with the first shocks of the Reformation, was concentrated in anti-clerical, anti-religious struggle. The main objective and result of the French Revolution was not just to transfer state power from the feudal aristocracy to the mercantile capitalist bourgeoisie, destroy part of the old repressive state apparatus, and put a new one in its place, for example, the National Popular Army, but also to attack the number one ideological state apparatus, the church. Hence the civil constitution of the clergy, the confiscation of church property, and the creation of new ideological state apparatuses to replace the religious ideological state apparatus in its dominant role. Naturally, things did not happen all by themselves. Witness the Concordat, the Restoration, and, throughout the 19th century, the long class struggle that the industrial bourgeoisie waged against the aristocracy to establish bourgeois hegemony over functions earlier fulfilled by the church. We can say that the bourgeoisie relied on the new political, parliamentary democratic ideological state apparatus, established in the first years of the revolution and restored, after long, violent struggles, for a few months in 1848 and for decades after the fall of the Second Empire, in order to conduct its struggle against the church and wrest its ideological functions from it. In a word, in order to ensure not only its political hegemony, but also its ideological hegemony, essential for reproducing capitalist relations of production. That is why we believe we are justified in advancing the following thesis: with all the risks it involves, we think that the ideological state apparatus that has been elevated to the dominant position in mature capitalist formations, at the end of a violent political and ideological class struggle against the old ideological state apparatus, is the scholastic ideological apparatus. This thesis may seem paradoxical, since it plainly seems to everyone according, that is, to the ideological representation that the bourgeoisie was at pains to forge for both itself and the classes it exploited, that the ideological state apparatus dominant in capitalist social formations is not the school, but the political ideological state apparatus, that is, the parliamentary democratic regime, accompanied by universal suffrage and struggles between parties. Yet history, even recent history, shows that the bourgeoisie has been and is still easily capable of accommodating highly variegated forms of its political ideological state apparatus, other than parliamentary democracy, the First and Second Empires, the constitutional monarchy based on the Charter, Louis XVLLL and Charles X, parliamentary monarchy, Louis Philippe, or presidential democracy, de Gaulle, to consider only France. Matters are even clearer in England. There, the revolution was especially successful from the bourgeois standpoint. For, in contrast to what happened in France, where the bourgeoisie, thanks, be it noted, to the petty aristocracy's stupidity, had to consent to be brought to power by peasant and plebeian journeys revolutionaries for which it had to pay dearly, the English bourgeoisie was able to strike, more or less adroitly, a compromise with the aristocracy, sharing possession of state power and the state apparatus with it for a very long time. Peace to all men of goodwill in the dominant classes. In Germany, things were even more striking. Here, the imperialist bourgeoisie made its sounding entrance onto the stage of history behind a political ideological state apparatus in which the imperial Junkers, Symbol, Bismarck, their army, and their police provided it with a shield and leading personnel, before it put itself in the hands of the very national, very socialist, but not particularly democratic political apparatus known as Nazism. Thus we believe we have solid reasons for thinking that, behind the theatre of the political struggles which the bourgeoisie has offered the popular masses, as a spectacle, or imposed on them as an ordeal. What it has established as its number one, that is, its dominant, ideological state apparatus is the scholastic apparatus, which has in fact replaced the previously dominant ideological state apparatus, the church, in its function. We may even say that the school family dyad has replaced the church family dyad. Why is the scholastic apparatus the dominant ideological state apparatus in capitalist social formations, and how does it function? We shall explain that in a forthcoming book 3. For the moment, suffice it to say that, 1. All ideological state apparatuses without exception contribute to the same end, the reproduction of the relations of production, that is, of capitalist relations of exploitation. 2. Each of them contributes to this single end in its own way. The political apparatus does so by subjecting individuals to the political state ideology, indirect, parliamentary, or direct, plebiscitary or fascist, democratic ideology. The news and information apparatus does so by stuffing every citizen with his daily doses of nationalism, chauvinism, liberalism, moralism, and so on, by means of the press, radio and television. The same goes for the cultural apparatus. The role of sport in fostering chauvinism is of the first importance, and so on. The religious apparatus does so by reminding us, in sermons, the grand ceremonies of birth, marriage and death, and so on, that man is only ashes unless he loves his neighbor enough to turn the other cheek to the neighbor who smites him on the first. The scholastic apparatus does so. We shall soon see in detail how. The familial apparatus leave it at that, but let us 3. This concert is dominated by a single score, in which we hear a few false notes, among others, those of the proletarians and their organizations, which are terribly discordant, and those of petty bourgeois dissidents or revolutionaries as well. The score of the state ideology, the ideology of the current dominant class, which knows very well how to integrate into its music the great themes of the humanism of the great ancestors, who wrought the miracle of Greece before Christianity, and, thereafter, the grandeur of Rome, the eternal city. As well as the themes of interest, particular and general, as is only proper. Nationalism, moralism and economism. Pétain said, more cynically, work, family, fatherland. For, in this concert, nevertheless, one ideological state apparatus well and truly plays the dominant role, although no one, or almost no one, lends an ear to its music, it is so hard to hear. This is the school from nursery school on. The school takes children from all social classes and, from nursery school on and for years thereafter, the years when children are most vulnerable, stuck fast as they are between the scholastic and familial ideological state apparatuses, pumps them full, with old methods and new, of certain kinds of know-how, French, arithmetic, natural history, science, literature, packaged in the dominant ideology, or, simply, of the dominant ideology in the pure state, ethics, civics, philosophy. Somewhere around the age of 14, an enormous mass of children are dumped into production to become workers or small peasants. Another segment of the school-age population sticks with it and somehow manages to go a bit further, only to fall by the wayside and find jobs as lower level supervisory personnel or junior managers, white-collar workers, minor or middle-level civil servants, and petty bourgeois of all kinds. A last group makes it to the summit either to sink into intellectual underemployment or semi-unemployment, or to fill the posts of agents of exploitation or agents of repression, professional ideologues, priests of all kinds, most of whom are convinced secularists, and also agents of scientific practice. Every mass that falls by the way is by and large, a few errors and miscarriages aside, practically provided with the ideology that suits the role it is to play in class society, the role of the exploited, with a highly developed professional moral, civic, national and apolitical conscience. The role of agent of exploitation, knowing how to order workers around and talk to them, agent of repression knowing how to issue orders and exact obedience without discussion, or how to put the demagogy of political leaders, rhetoric to work, or professional ideologue, knowing how to treat conscience with the appropriate respect, that is, the appropriate contempt, threats and demagogy, couched in the accents of morality, virtue, transcendence, the nation, France's world role, and so on. Of course, many of these contrasting virtues, modesty, resignation and submissiveness on the one hand, and cynicism, contempt, confidence, self-importance and arrogance, even smooth talk and suavity on the other, are also acquired in families, in the church, in the army, from good books, from films, and even in the stadiums. No other ideological state apparatus, however, has a captive audience of all the children of the capitalist social formation at its beck and call, and this is the least it can do at no cost to them, for as many years as the schools do, 8 hours a day, 6 days out of 7. The relations of production of a capitalist social formation, that is, the relations of exploited to exploiters and exploiters to exploited, are primarily reproduced in this process of acquiring what comes down, in the end, to a handful of limited types of know-how, accompanied by massive inculcation of the ideology of the dominant class. I here anticipate demonstrations that we shall soon be providing when I say that the mechanisms that produce this result, vital for the capitalist regime, are of course covered up and concealed by a universally reigning ideology of the school, since it is one of the essential forms of the dominant bourgeois ideology, an ideology which depicts the school as a neutral environment free of ideology, because it is not religious, where teachers respectful of the conscience and freedom of the children entrusted to them, in complete confidence, by their parents, who are free in their turn, that is, are the owners of their children, set them on the path to adult freedom, morality and responsibility by their own example, and provide them access to learning, literature, and the well-known emancipatory virtues of literary or scientific humanism. I beg the pardon of those teachers who, in impossible or appalling conditions, are striving to turn the scientific and political weapons that they manage to find in the history and knowledge that they teach back against the ideology and the system and practices in which they are trapped. They are heroes of a kind, but they are very rare. How many others, the immense majority, do not even begin to suspect the work that the system, which overwhelms and crushes them, forces them to do, or, worse, put their whole heart and all their ingenuity into performing it with extreme conscientiousness, the celebrated new methods. In, say, the pilot classes of nursery school and elementary school, secondary school and trade school, so little do they suspect it that they are helping, by their very devotion, to sustain and cultivate this ideological representation of the school, which makes the school today as natural and useful, indispensable, or even beneficial for our contemporaries as the church was natural, indispensable and generous for our ancestors of a few centuries ago. The fact is that the church has today been replaced by the school. It has succeeded it and occupies its dominant sector, even if there are certain limitations on that sector, because the school system is carefully flanked by the church, which is not mandatory, and by the army, which is mandatory and free, like school. It is true that the school can count on help from the family, despite the snags that are troubling the family's previous functioning, ever since the manifesto announced its disintegration, as an ideological state apparatus. That functioning was once sure. It no longer is. Since May, bourgeois families of the highest rank themselves know something about that something irreversible that is shaking them up, and, often, even has them trembling. One, just as there once existed hereditary monarchical dynasties, there exist, in the capitalist state, dynasties of politicians and dynasties of military men. Consider the naval officers who are traditionally recruited, like the reproduction of the relations of production.